At the Tomb of the Star, everyone began to take off, everyone having their tasks in mind of what to do. Yuji, Todo, and Nanako all heading to Tokyo Colony number 1 to see if they could find anyone with over 100 points. Yuta and Kotsu heading to Sendai Colony in order to investigate what was happening there. Kamo, Tanzo, and Maki all heading towards the Sakurajima Colony, after Maki was going to get the weapons from the Zenins. And finally, Nobara, Megami, Sanzo, and Shoso all began to head out in order to try and recruit Akari to their side. But this left quite the hefty force to guard over Tengen. That force being Yuki Tsukumo, the special grade sorcerer, Nanami Kento, a first grade sorcerer, Choso, a death painting that had surpassed the level of a grade 1 sorcerer, Esso and Kechizu, who were able to do somewhat well against semi-grade 1 level threats, Naranjo the 4th brother, Kotsuzo the 8th brother, and Shouoso the 9th brother. And finally Mimiko. All of them were preparing just in case Kenjaku decided to arrive. Though out of all of the siblings, one of them was right now thinking on how they could even be of any help to them whatsoever. This was the weakest of the death paintings, Shouoso. He was about the same level as a grade 2 to semi-grade 2 sorcerer, and he didn't get lucky in terms of the body picked for him. After all, his body is similar to that in structure of a slug. Of course he was around the same size as a normal human, but he looked a lot more like a slug. Sure, he was given one small portion of the blood manipulation abilities, but it wouldn't be enough. He didn't feel like he was going to be able to do anything. Maybe he just hadn't been training hard enough. Maybe he did have some more potential than what he was giving himself credit for. After all, he was born the same as all his other brothers. He was a death painting just like them. He was only the youngest between them. All 9 of the brothers were based on some aspect of blood manipulation, with Choso getting by far the most purest variation of it. The rest of them were only able to access some portions of blood manipulation to more unstable degrees. However, several of the brothers had things they specialized in, such as Kotsuzo, whose blood armor reached unnaturally hard levels. Shouoso's variation of blood manipulation was based on the blood manipulation's user to increase the body temperature of their own blood. However, Shouoso was not capable of the same application that his brother Tanzo was capable of, where Tanzo was capable of releasing that heated up blood as a steam in order to cloak his appearance as well as burn whoever is stuck inside. Shouoso was not granted such luck. However, in exchange for that, Shouoso was able to massively heat up his own blood, going far beyond that of boiling points. However, for his ability to activate, it would require him entering into close quarters combat with anybody, and being able to hold on to them for long periods of time, which now was most certainly a risk against most fighters, especially considering he physically wasn't all that. Little did he know someone else was already here watching them right now, that person being Nanami Kento. They were able to recognize that look of weakness that was present on them, that look of uselessness that they seemed to be feeling. Nanami felt that he could at least help with that a little bit later. He wanted to go over the plan they had in store once Kenjaku did arrive. After all, they were pretty certain by this point that Kenjaku was going to find this place. The information that they had on Kenjaku was frighteningly little, but what they did know was also terrifying. They knew Kenjaku likely had over thousands of cursed spirits completely under their control, which would include Jogo, the lava cursed spirit. After all, they were damaged during the battle against Kenjaku in Shibuya, it wasn't enough to truly put Jogo down. Out of all of them, if they were being honest, the only one who really did stand a chance against Kenjaku right now would be Yuki Tsukumo. After all, it would be Kenjaku alongside Jogo. Though Yuki was rather confident that she could at least take out Jogo. After all, she knew she had more than the physical force to take that thing down. But the real problem here was they didn't know that much about Kenjaku. They were still lacking so much details and information, as Tengen brought up the possibility that Kenjaku might have even more cursed techniques. After all, they were a rather old sorcerer and many details on their technique wasn't really known. That was when both Choso and Nanami volunteered at the same time in order to try their best to hold off Kenjaku and try and get as much information from him as possible in battle. Their brothers gave Choso and Nanami a worried look. After all, this would guarantee their death. They were pretty certain of it considering how well Kenjaku did in Shibuya. However, Yuki shook her head as she told them that the second that she saw that either of them were going to be close to death, then she would interfere. And while Choso and Nanami were both going to try and debate against it, Yuki told them that this wasn't up for debate. Especially because Yuki did want to talk more of Choso when this was all done. And she looked over to Nanami and told him that he survived one of the most catastrophic events in Jujutsu history, being the Shibuya incident. No way is she letting him die here. In fact, she was determined to make sure that not a single person was going to die here. After all of them had people they care about that they were going to return to, and Yuki was going to make sure that that was going to happen. This was when Shouoso decided to suggest something. If Shouoso was able to get close to Kenjaku, he might be able to cling on to him and burn out his blood. Basically, he was planning to use his own superheated blood and superheated body to make sure Kenjaku's blood would evaporate. However, that would require him to cling on to Kenjaku for a long period of time, especially considering the fact they were pretty certain that Kenjaku had access to reverse curse technique. Kotsuzo, Naranjo, Esso, Kechizu, and Choso all looked towards Shouoso with a face of worry. After all, this was going to be a massive risk to them. However, Yuki gave them a thumbs up, as she told them that she was going to make an opening for him. She looked towards the other and told them that Shouoso wasn't going to be in so much danger. After all, Shouoso wasn't going to be so alone in the battlefield. If they could weaken Kenjaku enough, they would be able to land this opening on them and take them out, which was what Mimiko volunteered right after. Her cursing allowed her to make voodoo puppets of people. Of course, it wasn't going to be that strong against someone like Kenjaku, but she could at least delay his movements slightly. And against a special grade fighter like this, even the smallest of delays was going to be useful. Then Yuki made a suggestion to Kotsuzo, as she asked him if it was possible for him to create blood armor for the other people here. Kotsuzo's blood manipulation ability allowed him to harden his own blood without getting risk of thrombosis. But in exchange, he wasn't able to activate the other blood manipulation abilities. And once Kotsuzo heard that suggestion, he thought he might as well try it. He wasn't too certain if he was able to do something like that, but it was definitely going to be worth trying. Especially because that would majorly upgrade the defensive ability of everybody here, and against someone like Kenjaku with that many numbers, defense was going to be necessary. Eso, Kechizu, Naranzo, and Choso were each going to be on the main offense alongside Nanami. Of course, I was assuming Choso and Nanami would still be able to fight after they were done trying to draw some technique out from Kenjaku. Though there was something else that they were worried about as well. After all, Tengen had by this point warned them about the domain expansion of Kenjaku. Kenjaku's domain was incredibly powerful. He was the second best barrier user right behind Tengen. So Tengen had to warn them to make sure not to enter into a domain clash with Kenjaku, leaving it up to Sunyata barrier in order to deal with Kenjaku's barrier. They were each going to need to prepare in order to make sure they could stand as good as a chance against Kenjaku as possible, and a determination filled Choso's eyes. Up to this point, he was the second strongest brother. Sure, he was stronger than all of his other brothers and was able to do somewhat well in help in combat, but he wasn't anything in comparison to his little brother Yuji. But his strength was his brother's, and that was what was going to guide him. He needed to rely on the strength of his brothers to guide him to become as strong as possible. He knew he had some of that same potential that Yuji had. They had the same technique, and they came from the same experiment. Or at least he thought that they did come from the same experiment. Either way, he was going to need to pull this off. Even if they were different, he was going to need to prove why he was the older brother, and prove that he could protect them. Nanami was in a similar boat. He had known he had reached his physical limit of his potential, but at the same time it was his job as an older sorcerer in order to guide the way for the new sorcerer next generation. So the best thing that he could do, at least right now, was making sure that this old sorcerer and old curse from the past is dead. Whether both of them died or not, they were going to make sure that they at least could offer some little bit of information. Determination filled everybody in the room, whether it was for a desire for revenge or a desire to make sure the next generation were going to be safe, or a mixture of both. Everybody here was filled to the brim with determination that would push them to new heights. This also led to Yuki taking Choso aside in order to talk to him for a little bit. Where in this conversation, you ended up learning a bit more about him, about the fact that Choso was doing this mainly to give his brothers a better society they could live in. In particular for Yuji. After all, Yuji was already a human. Sure, his other brothers had some chance of fitting in within Jujutsu society, but Yuji could fit in within human society. But that led to Yuki telling them they were only cursed in biology. By this point, they were completely human. Their souls were human, and their personality was human. Their biology only matters so much, and she was certain of this, that after everything was done, they would definitely have a place in the new society that was building up. That was something that she was going to make sure of. The others began to work fast and hastily, experimenting like they never had before. After all, they had a limited amount of time until when Kenjaku could ever arrive. After all, any day Kenjaku could arrive. For all they knew, Kenjaku could have arrived the very day they were making this plan. So they each got to work. It took some time for Kotsuzo to properly figure it out, but on the third day, he was able to figure out how to make blood armor for everybody. Primarily focusing on Nanami's blood armor. After all, Nanami was a close-range combatant, so he was going to need as much protection as he could get. He also did some for Choso as well. While Choso could harden his own blood, that was going to have risk of thrombosis for him. But for Kotsuzo, there was no such risk. Furthermore, during this time, they had also created several blood bags, containing several of the blood of the death paintings combined. After all, they realized that Choso was capable of manipulating blood of others as well, so long as it was not in their own body, which could be used for some useful combination moves, as well as potentially making Choso's blood even stronger with that much amounts of blood on them. So Choso was now carrying a large amount of blood in blood bags prepared. This was also out of advice from Kamo. Sure, Choso was capable of creating his own blood, but this would allow him to at least not waste some time and maybe even potentially create stronger attacks. Eventually, after several days more had passed, where they had time to relax, time to rest, and time to train, someone arrived. That someone being Kenjaku. In front of Kenjaku, two people were standing off against them, Nanami and Choso. The Nanami seemed to be wearing some type of hardened blood armor. Something that caught Kenjaku a little bit by surprise. As Kenjaku then said, "I guess when you put the brain of so many failures together, it ends up resulting in something that could be entertaining. Though, are you two really the only people who are going to stand against me, or do you guys have someone else? Please tell me you have someone else. I don't want to be bored." Everyone else was currently watching what was about to happen in another room, preparing to enter in the second they got the chance, but for now they wanted to rely on Choso and Nanami to be able to get some move out of Kenjaku. As Choso then responded, "I'm not sure if it's going to solve your boredom, but I'm going to make sure you're dead." Which caused Asai to exit out from Kenjaku before he then said, "Where's Tengen? You two and all the people who are allying with you don't really need to die. The calling game has already served its purpose. All I really need now is Tengen." After all, the preparations for the merger of all the non-sorcerers of Japan have already been completed. This caused a look of worry to rise on Nanami and Choso. After all, this meant that something might have happened to the others, though Choso could reassure them that they weren't dead. After all, if they were dead, if any of his brothers had died, he'd be able to tell them. As Kenjaku then said, "Let me show you one possible conclusion to this affair," as suddenly the barriers began to alter, catching both Nanami as well as Choso completely off guard, changing into that of oddly a movie theater, with both Nanami and Choso sitting down, before the screen changed, showing a picture of Yuki Tsukumo. In Shibuya, Tsukumo Yuki explained that merging with Tengen, which I'd prefer to call optimizing curse energy, means becoming a sorcerer. But if you ask me, that's just a step before the merger, a verification check on the coming game essentially. I've said before that unlike her, what I want isn't a world without cursed spirits, but I was surprised when she even worried about the Japanese being used as curse energy resources. No, that's not accurate. What I should be saying is, it made me happy. The way she thinks is close to my own. Anyways, I've gotten off topic. From the beginning, I've even considered the potential of cursed spirits as an option alongside sorcerers. Perhaps a new form of cursed energy could be born, advancing cursed spirits to a higher level. Because of that, I had high hopes for a half-breed between cursed spirits and humans like you. Which, at first, you death-pointings disappointed me. Most of you couldn't even go beyond the level of a grade 1 sorcerer. You all were just so ordinary, but I didn't give up hope. I gained new inspiration from you. I wondered what would happen if we combined them in a different way, a more surgical way, which led to the creation of what I like to call the more pure breeds. And a total of 4 of them stood out, with each of them having potential to reach the levels of the disaster curses that you saw in Shibuya, and 2 of them in particular having potential to even surpass it. Jin, a man who's only humanoid in shape, but has access to fire abilities. Kyoda, a hybrid between a shadow curse spirit as well as a human that I found. Kotake, a unique hybrid between water and human, one that was made the most recent besides one other, which is why Dagon was such a baby. And finally, the most unique case of them all, Itadori, made through a total of 10 things being infused into him, parts of all 9 of the death paintings, and 1 finger of Ryomen Sukuna. And while these 4 had significantly more potential than all of you death paintings did, they still weren't able to achieve the heights that would truly interest me. And while Choso did definitely want to kill Kenjaku right now, Nanami placed a hand on his shoulder, shaking his head, basically telling him to stop. After all, Kenjaku was telling them a lot of information right now, effectively telling him to control himself. Though this did also manage to catch Choso a little bit off guard, because of something else that this definitely implied. While he was already aware Yuji wasn't made for the same method that the death paintings were made, he was actually a little bit surprised to hear that there were still other people made for that same method even before Yuji, and that were still alive. Kenjaku smirked a little bit upon seeing that as he decided to continue, as he then said, "After evolving, Tengen will be more like a cursed spirit than a human, so if all the non-sorcerers in Japan merge with Tengen, I think it'll become a cursed spirit bearing the cursed energy of 100 million people. Maybe it'll be like Uzumaki and capable of extracting something too." I really do wonder what it will look like while the TV screen changed, showing an image of what looked like a giant monster filled to the brim with legs, able to rival that of massive buildings. As Kenjaku then said, "Right now I feel like a kid holding a crayon in front of a blank piece of paper." Such a thought of a creature like that, it made it clear for both Choso and Nanami, there is no way they could let the merger ever come. That thing would be the death of Japan, the death of everybody, and there was no way they could accept that. Which led to Nanami immediately asking, why? Why are you doing all this? What does this give you? While the movie theater faded, turning back to normal as Kenjaku smirked and said, "I'm fascinated. I want to know what would happen. I want to know what the endgame result of this will be. So I think it'll be curious. Like, imagine if it ends up having a clown face. It would be hilarious, the destroyer of Japan having the face of a clown." As Nanami and Choso both focused, there was no more time for words. The battle begun now. Choso made the first move, immediately launching a piercing blood right towards Kenjaku. And right as the piercing blood was flying, suddenly Choso quickly said 3 words. Iron, Tailwind, Spirit. For each chance in order to amplify the power and speed of the piercing blood. In particular, amplifying the speed. Such a sudden speed increase ended up catching Kenjaku off guard, leading to a scratch landing on his cheek. Under normal circumstances, Kenjaku would be able to dodge even a chance amp piercing blood from Choso, but at the same time he had low expectations from his son, so he wasn't expecting him to pull out some chance. As Kenjaku said, "Oh, I see, Narutoshi ended up having some benefits for you as well." before Choso tried to direct the piercing blood down, trying to aim it down and slash at Kenjaku, but Kenjaku was able to dodge with relative ease. However, suddenly when Kenjaku was launching out a wave of cursed spirits right towards Choso, Nanami went for his back. And right as Nanami attempted to land a slash on Kenjaku, Kenjaku was quick to turn around and redirect it. At the same time, while the cursed centipedes were flying at Choso, Choso flinged out a supernova, having it explode and activate on all the cursed spirits, killing all of them in one single blow. However, he had a new projectile being launched at him, that projectile being Nanami himself, as Choso quickly moved in order to catch him. As Choso then slowly put down Nanami and asked what his plan was for Yuji Itadori. With Kenjaku tapping his chin for a little bit, he was still taking them rather casually, as he said, "I guess if I had to say, then he's just a vessel. That role's finished now though. Itadori Yuji was merely the smoke signal that set things off. As long as that thing continues to coexist with Sukuna, the cycle of curses will never end. He will become the eye of the storm for the new era." And hearing that angered Choso, but it also angered Nanami. After all, how dare Kenjaku put all this chaos in Yuji? It was his fault. It was Kenjaku who was responsible for everything. As Choso began to chant at a faster speed than he had ever done before, releasing another piercing blood right towards Kenjaku's direction, while at the same time Nanami began to rush towards Kenjaku, pushing his body to the limit. With a smirk rising on Kenjaku while he created a cursed spirit in order to shield himself, at the same time moving out the way of the piercing blood, as he then said, I was expecting a reaction of rage out of Choso, but not you, Nanami. So how is that rage treating you? Do you feel more curse energy flaring in your body?" As Kenjaku then lifted up his hand, releasing a large wave of centipede curses right towards Nanami's direction. At the same time, several centipedes began to wrap around Choso's leg from the floor. Nanami, in a quick burst movement, was able to cut through each of the centipedes coming towards him that Kenjaku had released, as he quickly closed the distance between himself and Kenjaku, a focus entering into Nanami's eyes. But right before Kenjaku could close the distance between himself and Choso, suddenly had to lift up his hand in order to block a blow from Nanami. But this one was in particular hard. After all, it wasn't just some ordinary blow or even a ratio blow. No, it was one amplified by the power of the Black Flash, which sent Kenjaku skidding back by a couple of feet, as Nanami yelled, saying, "Don't let your rage overwhelm you. That's exactly what he wants. Use it as a tool and control it. Don't let it control you." Before Nanami rushed towards Kenjaku again, as Kenjaku said, "Ooh, you landed a Black Flash. Good job. The last time you did that was all the way back during the 100 Night Parade demon thing. Sorry, that event from Ghetto was really stupid and boring to me. But no need to coach that failure of mine. Truly, you're a little bit more of a spectacle than him, at least in my eyes. After all, you were able to achieve this completely on your own. He had every advantage and he still ended up being a failure." As Kenjaku then lifted up his hands again, releasing another wave of cursed spirits, but this time was a little bit different. Instead, it was several birds stacking on top of each other, each of them launching right towards Nanami. A focus entering into Nanami's eyes, one he hadn't felt since the Night Parade of 100 Demons. As Nanami then sliced right through the massive combination of curses that Kenjaku had launched at him, slicing through and landing another Black Flash. Kenjaku clapped a bit as he said, good job! Now tell me, can you slice through another combination of 50 grade 3 curses? I want to see how far we can go with this." As Kenjaku then released another wave and another wave of cursed spirits that shaped together to look like a bird, stacking on top of each other in that impact. Looked like a massive conglomeration of different faces with black liquid holding them together. Kenjaku knew Nanami's limit with the Black Flash was 4. That was the highest he'd ever hit, so he was a little bit curious to see if he could surpass that record today. Not that it would really matter in his head. After all, he knew these guys were only the appetizers. He wouldn't even need to use higher end cursed spirits, let alone his other techniques on them. As Kenjaku had one message he was trying to get across to the both of them. No matter how far they pushed themselves, no matter how many Black Flashes they landed, no matter what they did, their efforts would amount to nothing. As Kenjaku then launched both of them towards Nanami, but Nanami was able to activate the Black Flash again and again, slicing through both of them and achieving his record. He could feel his curse energy flowing like never before. His curse energy control was through the roof right now. He had only felt that peak once in his life, but he was up against an opponent where this just wasn't going to be enough. As Kenjaku clapped for him before he said, good, you managed to achieve your peak. Now, let's see if we can break it." As behind Kenjaku, he began to release several cursed spirit, 10s of them, each of them preparing to take shape into combinations of curses. All the while, Kenjaku began to approach Choso. As Choso activated flowing red scale stack, pushing himself to the limit while he began to rush right towards Kenjaku, attempting to land a blow on him, but Kenjaku was able to redirect it before landing a punch on his gut, before sweeping him by the leg and punching him into the ground hard. As Kenjaku then began to speak, telling them, "I'm aware that you both are the Vanguard. Your goal is to push me, to try and make me use something else in order to give your real fighters an advantage against me. try and reveal some other part of my arsenal, but you both ultimately failed at that. You haven't even gotten me to use some of my special grade cursed spirits, let alone anything else. As another one of the cursed conglomeration birds began to fly right at Nanami, and Nanami focused. He had to push himself like he had never done so before. But fortunately, fate had smiled upon him once more, allowing him to land a 5th black flash. In particular, using it with ratio collapse this time, using it to cause a massive amount of damage amplified by the black flash and taking out all the cursed spirit conglomerations that Kenjaku had launched at him. Which that caused a bit of a smirk to rise on Kenjaku as he said, "Nice job! You managed to break your own record, impressive!" Not to mention, if I remember correctly, that was the record for the modern era of black flashes landed consecutively. But I'll get to you in a minute. Trust me, I am much more impressed with you, Nanami. I have to discipline my son first. Before Kenjaku released another massive wave of grade 3 cursed spirits right towards him, each of them flying right towards Nanami. As Kenjaku looked down to Choso once more and said, "Even though you two had completely broken your limits, you're still just ultimately failures. A grade 1 who managed to push himself to achieve that many black flashes, as well as a death painting, the supposed strongest out of all of them, but the strongest out of a bunch of trash is still trash." And Choso began to shake with anger as his body began to heat up. But even though his body began to heat up, instead Kenjaku moved his foot right onto his face, pushing him down into the ground. As Kenjaku then said, "Oh, sorry, did I hurt your feelings? I looked forward to you so much, and yet you disappointed me so. Maybe you can be proud of yourself for making me talk this much. Who knows, I've already confirmed to them that I have more cursed techniques than just cursed spirit manipulation with my dialogue, so maybe you gave them that advantage." Before suddenly a sound echoed throughout the entire area. Choso's heartbeat, it was increasing. And with this amplification of strength, Choso grabbed onto Kenjaku's leg and threw him to the side, throwing him right off of him. He was now using the flowing red scale burst. But as Kenjaku was being launched away, he launched out a massive wave of cursed spirit centipedes right towards Choso's direction. As Kenjaku then spoke, "Wow, all you can do is impersonate your little brother's technique. How pathetic." As a cursed spirit rammed right into Choso and launched him hard into the ground. Kenjaku then said, "Nanami, do you know what it means to be a special grade sorcerer? Same with you, Choso. It's rather simple. Someone who can overthrow a country single-handedly. Gojo obviously qualifies. I mean, what country could stop him? Geto too, because cursed spirit manipulation can produce an entire army of monsters, more than enough to overwhelm an entire country. After all, even if they're just a low-grade cursed spirits, after enhancing with my cursed energy, swarming them and giving them orders, they can even take out grade 1 sorcerers on your level." Even though Nani was trying his best to push back against it. Using ratio collapse to take out as many cursed spirits as possible, it was simply too much, as he was overwhelmed by the swarm, landing on the wall. Meanwhile, Yuki was watching the battle alongside all of the other brothers, as they were each getting a bit more antsy. Even Mimiko was preparing to use her cursing by this point, but Yuki stopped them. Yuki was telling them that Choso and Nanami weren't done yet. And thoughts were going through both Choso and Nanami's head. Choso's thoughts about how he failed as an older brother, how he couldn't give his other brothers the help necessary in order to take something like this on, how he was so weak in comparison to his youngest brother Yuji that he didn't even need his protection. His role was to be a role model. That was his role as an older brother. His younger brothers gave him strength, and yet he was still so pathetic. How could he not take down Kenjaku? Nanami was going down a similar boat right now, cursing his strength, cursing his lack of potential and ability. He was meant to guide the next generation, and yet he wasn't able to do anything at all against Kenjaku. He couldn't even force out a special grade curse. Before both Choso and Nanami snapped, as a massive wave of blood erupted right from Choso, destroying the cursed spirits that were on top of him. His shirt was now completely destroyed, his heartbeat continuing to echo throughout the area, as Choso yelled out to his brothers to give him strength. Meanwhile, Nanami had placed a binding vow on himself, as a massive wave of curse energy erupted off of his body, completely destroying all the centipedes on top of him. The binding vow that Nanami had just cast was rather simple. In exchange for 10 years of his lifespan, he would amplify his curse energy greatly within this battle. As the smirk rose onto Kenjaku, he had to admit he wasn't expecting this level of pushing themselves to come out from the both of them, but he more than gladly welcomed it, as he lifted up his hand before saying, "Let's see what you can do now." He had to admit, while his interest wasn't peaked, it was a little bit higher now in comparison to what it was before. Kenjaku was now faced off against both Nanami Kento as well as Choso, both of them in their awakened state, Nanami having used a binding vow in order to amplify his curse energy by sacrificing 10 years of his lifespan, while Choso was now relying on the strength of his brothers, trying to utilize their techniques in his own body. While he wouldn't max the same level of proficiency as his brothers had, he knew he could at least combine them and try his best to push himself. Choso and Nanami both had a mission, and that was to push Kenjaku to use something else, something other than cursed spirit manipulation. Even if it meant burning away at their very lives, they needed to give Yuki as much of an advantage as they could possibly give. As Choso quickly did his chant of the piercing blood before firing one right out towards Kenjaku. This one was even more powerful than it was before, mixed in with chanting as well as the rage that Choso was feeling, all of it compressed down into power. As it fired right towards Kenjaku, but Kenjaku was narrowly able to dodge, though Ed Tsumidi was impressed by its speed, as Nanami quickly closed the gap and attempted to slam his ratio cleaver right into Kenjaku's head. At the same time, Choso aimed the piercing blood down in order to try and hit Kenjaku, which is the Kenjaku summoning some of his cursed spirits in order to block the blow of the piercing blood, while at the same time lifting up his hand to block Nanami's strike. However, even though he managed to block Nanami's strike, he was sent flying backwards a couple of feet. At the same time, several blood vectors were launched right towards Kenjaku, as Esso immediately realized what this technique was. This was his own technique, or at least an imitation of it. It wasn't as good as when he would have used it, but Choso being a better blood manipulation user and stronger more than made up for it. But Kenjaku was able to dodge it with relative ease as he moved out of the way of it until he looked up to see a blood steam begin to cover the entire area. But a smirk rose onto Kenjaku as he said, "You're good, but you're not as good as Tanzo. I can see you. It's faint, but I can still slightly sense you. Unfortunately, you're only just going to be slightly worse versions of your brothers, which those people wouldn't even be able to interest me on their own. Sure, you might be able to mimic all of their abilities, but you won't be anywhere near as good at them." Suddenly a hand rocketed right towards Kenjaku, one using blood in order to propel it. Kaichizu was able to recognize that this was based on his technique. And this did catch Kenjaku slightly off guard, but more importantly, when that hand landed, it immediately started to burn him. Choso had massively increased the heat within his own blood, using Shouoso's technique, before throwing Kenjaku, trying to get him completely off of his feet. Kenjaku blinked a bit as he lifted up his hand, sending several cursed spirits right towards Choso as an attack. But a smirk rose onto Choso as Nanami quickly took advantage of this chance, slamming the ratio cleaver right into Kenjaku's back, causing Kenjaku to cough up some blood, being slightly surprised by that before he smirked a bit, as another wave of curses was launched right towards Nanami in order to launch him away, as Kenjaku then said, "All of that effort just for that small amount of damage," while Kenjaku landed on his feet more proper and got himself balanced. But Choso wasn't done yet, as he lifted up his finger, and around Kenjaku, tens of supernovas began to rise up all around him. The blood steam in all of those attacks had been a distraction, using it in order to hide the supernovas that he had been creating. All of this was the perfect trap they had lured Kenjaku into, something they exchanged without even needing to speak words towards each other. But each of the blood orbs were then slammed onto the ground by Kenjaku using anti-gravity, using it in order to avoid the supernovas hitting him head-on. Choso at first was confused. He thought that maybe they ended up not working. Maybe Kenjaku had access to blood manipulation, but then he realized something else. This wasn't blood manipulation, this was another ability, mainly because he looked at the ground. But also because the cursed spirits that were attacking Nanami as well as Choso from before were now fading away. You could only use one curse technique at a time, which that was when somebody else came out, that other person being Yuki Tsukumo. She had to admit she was impressed with both, and told them that she was going to handle it from here, as Nanami and Choso both stepped away in order to let Yuki handle the 1 versus 1. And the battle between Yuki and Kenjaku really showed the difference between a battle between a special grade and first grades and 2 special grades fighting. Yuki through a curse technique was able to one-shot special grade curses, something that both Nanami and Choso would struggle with even now. And in a single punch he was able to output even more effort than what Nanami was able to do, shattering both of Kenjaku's arms in that blow. But Kenjaku was able to effortlessly use reverse curse technique in order to heal back his arms. Learning what the curse technique of Yuki Tsukumo was, the technique known as Mass, the ability to imbue herself as well as Garuda with virtual mass in order to physically amplify her blows massively, making her a pretty good counter to someone like Jogo as well. After all, someone like Yuki Tsukumo would be able to one-shot Jogo if they could land a single hit. Not to mention all the damage that Yuki could cause in those blows would be a good counter to all the AoE that Jogo could cause. Those are thoughts going through Kenjaku's head right now, as he decided the best way to counter Yuki would be using his domain expansion. After all, it was pretty clear that Yuki didn't want him to use it, or else Yuki would have used hers by this point. As Kenjaku activated his domain expansion, leading to Tengen using the barriers to counter. However, they had all miscalculated in one thing. Kenjaku's domain was not one with a barrier, as its skill had far surpassed that. Kenjaku wielded an open barrier domain, and this was making everyone in there antsy. After all, Yuki had to take a domain face forward. A bunch of them had wanted to go in order to help, but Nanami told them to wait. They had to give Yuki one more chance. That, and so long as the domain was active, them going in would just cause their own death. But as Kenjaku attempted to walk past Yuki in order to leave, suddenly Garuda attempted to slam its tail right into Kenjaku, with Kenjaku narrowly dodging out the way, leading to Yuki landing a blow right on Kenjaku after. But Kenjaku was able to block the kick coming right towards him with relative ease, before Yuki began her assault right on Kenjaku, landing blow after blow on him, though with each one Kenjaku was able to block. Until suddenly Garuda caught him off guard and wrapped around his waist, as Yuki was about to go in for another blow, but at the same time Kenjaku suddenly felt himself start to choke. Mimiko saw her chance and she was taking it now. This was the opening they had been waiting for. Kenjaku's curse sneak was on cooldown, which meant now was the time for everybody to release hell right on Kenjaku, with Nanami coming out from the other side in order to try and land a hit right on Kenjaku's head. On the other side, Yuki attempted to land a blow right on Kenjaku. However, both Nanami and Yuki were quite tired at their current moment, Yuki from having to take on a full domain and Nanami from having to battle against Kenjaku for as long as he did. So even with Garuda wrapped around him, he was able to move himself just narrowly out of the way of both attacks. But he could feel himself gasping for air. It was hard right now for him to breathe. Mimiko was now on the field as well. She was keeping herself a bit hidden right now, but she would have to get closer in order to use Curse Sneak at full potency. But Kenjaku had several things to worry about right now before they could just worry about her, such as several blood vector lines coming right down towards his direction. At the same time when he landed, he saw Choso with his hands clapped right together in order to fire a piercing blood right in his face. Kenjaku needed to think on how he was going to dodge this, though thinking was rather hard right now, especially because he was also going to need to find a way to dodge the blood vector lines coming towards him. But he didn't have time to dodge both, so he chose to spin around the cap within his brain, using it to spin around the piercing blood coming towards him to avoid it, though it did lead to the blood vector lines cutting in several parts of his body. But while Kenjaku was moving, Eso suddenly opened up their mouth, firing a massive wave of blood right towards them, causing Kenjaku to have to jump in order to move out the way. But as he was midair, Kotsudo suddenly appeared behind him, using the hardened blood around his own body like armor, but also managing to activate Flowing Red Scale, something that he had figured out during the time they were preparing, as he landed a punch right on the back of Kenjaku's head. And right as Kenjaku was landing, Shouso suddenly clung right to Kenjaku's side as he began to burn away at his blood, using Shouso's massively normal body heat in order to continue to start burning. All the while, Mimiko was making it hard for him to focus by continuing to choke him using her curse technique. Yuki, Nanami, and Kotsudo all took this as their chance as they began to rush right towards Kenjaku. At the same time, Choso, Eso, and Kaiju were each preparing. They were preparing to combine all three of their blood in order to fire an incredibly powerful piercing blood right towards Kenjaku. If Kenjaku didn't figure out a way around this, he was going to be dead. That was something he could be certain about. But his brain was still on cooldown. His curse technique was still on cooldown. He just had to survive for a few more seconds, then he'd be able to win. But he didn't know if he had those few seconds to spare. So Kenjaku decided to do something risky. Something that would be risky to even someone like him. But at that moment, he realized that this was going to be absolutely necessary, and he had to admit it had been a long time since he had this happen. A battle where he needed to push himself like this, a battle where he needed to risk his life, but there was also a part of him that enjoyed it for that. This had never been done before. It was only a theory that he had come up with a while ago and never really had the opportunity to try, but now would be a better time to try it than any, using reverse curtain on the brain in order to reconstruct it after using a domain expansion. More specifically, reconstructing the part of his brain that had been put on cooldown, and while it was difficult even for Kenjaku, he managed to pull it off. So as Yuki, Kotsudo, and Nanami were all rushing towards him, all the while Shouso was increasing the heat of their body, suddenly all four of them were slammed into the ground hard by using anti-gravity. To everyone's shock and surprise, he had been able to recover his curse technique. As Kenjaku felt a rather harsh burn on his side, if Shouso had managed to stay on him for a couple more seconds, that probably would have killed him. As he had to admit, he was rather impressed by their strategy. That was what Mimiko focused. She was determined to make sure Kenjaku died right here and now. She just needed more power, she just needed more curse energy, and so long as Kenjaku died, she didn't really care what would happen to her life. However, before she could activate a binding vow in order to sacrifice her life, suddenly she felt something appear behind her. But before she could realize what that was, it was too late, as Jogo lifted up his hand and launched out a massive burst of lava, hitting Mimiko's entire body and killing her. As Kenjaku finally felt his throat suddenly be free, he lost breath. He lost so much breath and was so close to choking. If she had managed to activate that binding vow to sacrifice her life, she definitely would have succeeded. As a wave of dread filled everybody in the room. After all, they had lost somebody, not to mention the fact that Kenjaku had managed to find a way around the one drawback. They had gotten so close to defeating them. But Kenjaku wasn't done yet either. But now Jogo was also on the field, and Kenjaku was ready to fight. Yuki was the quickest to recover, as she quickly attempted to rush for Kenjaku and try and land a punch on him, but Kenjaku was able to deflect it as he lifted up one of his hands. As he attempted to fire off a mini Uzumaki, but quickly Nanami moved in the way of it in order to block it for Yuki. After all, Nanami knew quite well, so long as Yuki stayed alive, they had a chance at this. And this mini Uzumaki was rather potent. It managed to destroy Nanami's arm entirely, launching Nanami right into one of the walls and knocking him out in the process. Choso by this point was also incredibly fatigued. He had pushed himself near his limit. Kotsudo, Kachizu, Eso, as well as Shouso were all pretty fine. Yuki had taken quite a sustainable amount of damage, as Kenjaku called Jogo right back to him. As Kenjaku then said, under normal circumstances, you would be able to kill Jogo with relative ease, Yuki. Or well, not relative ease, but so long as you could land a hit, you'd be able to kill him. But you're all now far too weak to be able to achieve that. None of you really need to die other than maybe Yuki. After all, dealing with a special grade sorcerer as an opponent would be annoying again. However, I'd recommend to you all taking this final chance to give up while I go look for Tengen. You all don't need to die, you all can still save your lives. All the while, Kenjaku chose to unsummon Jogo once more. He didn't really need Jogo for anything else. Behind Yuki Tsukumo, the biggest threat to his life had been Mimiko, and now Mimiko had been dealt with. And he wasn't going to need any cursed spirits to deal with these 5 sorcerers. Though Kenjaku was able to see the Senyata barrier begin to form around Nanami in order to carry him away in order for him to heal properly. But he saw no reason to stop that. After all, Nanami wasn't really a threat to him either way. He might have been able to use Nanami as a bargaining chip, but that really wasn't going to matter to him. As determination fueled all the opponents in front of him. Even Chosu was now exhausted by this point and was also fueled with determination. And Yuki looked over to her allies and told them if it comes down to it, she does have one final resort option to win. But that was going to be her final resort, and if she had to come down to using that, then she was going to tell the others to run. Choso and Kotuzo had both activated Flowing Red Scale Stack in preparation for this battle. While Eso and Kenjutsu took a step back, they wouldn't be that much help in close range, but they could definitely help in long range support. A sigh came out from Kenjaku as he realized they had made their choice. Before he lifted up his hand, Shouoso hopped right onto Choso's back as well. Shouoso knew if he could cling onto Kenjaku for long enough, he would be able to kill him, but he wouldn't have a good chance of doing that unless they could keep him distracted, as a massive curse spirit rose and was sent rocketing right towards all of them. But even in a weakened state like this, Yuki was able to punch through it with relative ease. And after Yuki punched through it, Kenjaku would be able to see a red mist begin to cover the entire area. While Poe, Kenjaku was still able to see the vague shapes of everybody inside of the mist. With weakness, you're getting sloppy, Choso. Kenjaku would taunt with a smirk rising onto him, as a large burst of blood came rushing right towards him from Kechizu. But Kenjaku quickly jumped out of the way, avoiding it until several blood vector lines began to rush right towards him. However, in order to counter that, he made one large cursed spirit rise in front of him to shield himself. This cursed spirit was in the shape of a serpent with wings, as Kenjaku amplified it with his own curse energy before sending it rocketing right towards Eso and Kechizu. And while Eso was just narrowly able to dodge out the way, Kechizu was slammed right into the wall hard, before being slammed through another wall, knocking Kechizu out completely before a cursed spirit began to turn around in order to face off against Eso. Meanwhile, Choso and Kotuzo began to take their assault, both of them trying to land blow after blow in hand-to-hand combat against Kenjaku. But Kenjaku was able to relatively easily deflect both of their blows, as Choso took a moment to step back and clamped his hands together, firing a piercing blood right at close range towards Kenjaku's direction. But suddenly underneath Choso, a cursed spirit rose up, launching him high up into the air, as a result of that forcing him to miss his piercing blood. That was when Kotuzo saw their chance, as he quickly moved behind Kenjaku before jumping in front of him and taking out his blade, attempting to slash at Kenjaku. Sho also tried to cling onto Kenjaku's side in order to start burning away at his very body. All the while, Yuki rushed right towards Kenjaku and attempted to land a punch right on his face. But as all 3 opponents tried to rush at Kenjaku, he activated anti-gravity once more and slammed all 3 of them into the ground hard, causing the cursed spirit that was fighting against Eso to fade away, as Kenjaku slowly began to approach Shouoso, moving his foot right onto his face. As Kenjaku then said, "Your heating ability certainly makes you an annoyance if you can get close to me, so I think I'm going to get rid of you right here and now." Before stomping hard right onto Shouoso's face, slamming him right into the ground, but that was when Choso took advantage of this chance, as he apologized to his brother before he clapped both of his hands together, chanting really quickly in order to fire off a piercing blood right towards Kenjaku's direction, forcing Kenjaku to jump out of the way as Yuki and Kotuzo got up, having some breathing room for themselves. At the same time, Eso was also still standing, but the barrier began to carry Shouoso away. He was knocked out from Kenjaku's blow. They were losing numbers and fast. Sure, they were still down to their strongest brothers, but even then, they were still losing ability. Until suddenly, a massive wave of cursed spirits erupted from Kenjaku, getting launched towards all 4 of them in order to separate them for a moment, leading to Yuki punching the ground hard in order to send a massive shockwave through it and disrupt a lot of the cursed spirits. But as she did that, suddenly she felt a hand right in front of her face, the hand of Jogo, as Jogo launched out a massive fire blast, launching Yuki away. And while it did some damage to Yuki, it was enough for her to heal, as several cursed spirits wrapped around Eso, slamming him hard into the ground and beginning to try and break his arms. Choso was narrowly able to avoid the blow. But in front of Kotuzo, Kenjaku suddenly rose out, as he said, "You will be first." As each of the cursed spirits in that wave began to get sucked right towards Kenjaku, combining into that of a mini Uzumaki. Of course, with the only one that was excused to that being Jogo himself. A mini Uzumaki that was totaling 250 cursed spirits. As Kenjaku said, "Out of all of the brothers, you are by far the best at defense, so I think this amount should suffice for you." Before launching the mini Uzumaki right towards Kotuzo's stomach. Through this entire point, his blood armor had only taken minor amounts of damage, but this blow ended up going right through his armor, and his stomach, making a hole form in his stomach. If he was human, this would have killed him, but this was just a lethal wound. As Kotsuzo was knocked out from that blow, launched towards one of the walls with the Senyata barrier carrying them away. Eso was slowly trying to force himself to get up, until suddenly Kenjaku opened a portal for cursed spirits right on top of him, and several dropped right onto his body. As Kenjaku then said, "As entertaining as you all have certainly proven to be by this very point, I'm sadly done playing these games with all of you. Be thankful that you entertained me enough for me to spare your lives." As the cursed spirits began to call right back towards Kenjaku, forming into another mini Uzumaki, the first time that Yuki Tsukumo and Choso had seen it. While that weight heavily damaged Eso, it didn't kill him. It was just enough to make sure that he would be knocked out, as the Senyata barrier also carried him away. Now all that was left on the field was Choso and Yuki, up against Kenjaku and Jogo, as well as the mini Uzumaki that they now had prepared. This wasn't looking good for them at all. They had failed their mission. Sure, they had gotten information, but they had failed. But Yuki shook her head, as she told them they weren't done yet. After all, both of them could still fight. As Kenjaku smirked a bit and told them, "Don't give the boy false hope. You have lost basically all of your reinforcements. I've killed some and I've spared some others, but you guys can barely fight. Look at Choso, he can barely stand anymore." And Kenjaku was absolutely right. Choso was at his limits by this point. So much so that Kenjaku didn't even feel that having Jogo on the field was necessary for these people. But a smirk rose onto Yuki as she told them that she had one more plan, one more trick, and she wasn't going to go down that easy. As Kenjaku smirked a bit and said, "What, your domain expansion? I can clash with you if you want." Yuki then apologized to Choso, as she quickly had Garuda wrap around Choso and carrying him out against his will and forcing him into one of the Senyata barriers for him to be carried. Which that confused Kenjaku, but at the same time he said, "Oh, so you're letting him live? Well, he wasn't the one I really cared about whether he lived or died anyway." But then Yuki began to rush towards Kenjaku, and Kenjaku closed the distance between the two of them, not expecting anything. As Kenjaku launched a mini Uzumaki right towards Yuki's face, doing a heavy amount of damage. But she didn't choose to heal. Instead, she chose to grip onto Kenjaku's hand and hard, as she mumbled that each of them must live on. Now they were no longer curses, they were human. As Kenjaku asked, "What exactly is your plan here?" But suddenly he felt heavier. He felt the world around him begin to shift. He was getting sucked right towards Yuki's direction. As Yuki explained, "The mass suggested by Bumbaye doesn't affect me, but only up to a certain density." And Kenjaku realized what Yuki was doing. She was making a black hole. As Yuki began to taunt him, saying, "You control gravity, but aren't you thinking too small?" Before she converted her full body into that of a black hole, one so powerful it destroyed the entire tomb of the star. As Kenjaku pushed some rubble off of his body, he had barely managed to survive it, though he didn't come out of it unscathed. He had lost the arm that Yuki was trying to hold back completely, not to mention the fact he was completely out of curse energy right now. Thanks to Yuki and Tengen's attempts to hold back the black hole, it didn't end up destroying the planet. However, Kenjaku used anti-gravity in order to reverse the effects, to make sure that he wasn't hit by the black hole. But even he couldn't fully neutralize it, as he ended up losing his arm. He had to admit to himself that that was quite fun. But now was the time to capture Tengen, to get the reward he won from winning this battle. At the same time, while the battle against Kenjaku was happening, Nanako was currently sitting down inside of her room, recovering. She didn't have any injuries on her, but she more so wanted to recover some stamina properly. Thankfully, Tokyo Clan No. 1 had been rather peaceful for the past few days. But suddenly, while Nanako was resting, she felt something off. She felt herself starting to get stronger. Not too much of a power increase, but it was definitely notable. However, more than that, a sadness began to fill her. After all, she knew what she was. She was a twin. In the world of Jujutsu, being a twin was a massive curse. She wasn't fully certain about this, and she was really hoping that her instincts were wrong right now, but she had a gut feeling, that her sister was now dead. All she could do was wait for now until he could communicate across colonies. And she chose to keep quiet about this for now, mainly because she didn't want to worry everybody. Plus, she didn't honestly know who she could really go to about this. Maybe Yuji, but Yuji had to deal with enough over the past couple of days, and she didn't feel like putting that pain on him. And she was really starting to realize how much she missed Geto, because she was thinking that maybe Geto would actually know what the right things to say right now would be. Little did Nanako know just how right her instinct actually was. On the 16th of November at noon, Maki's ending would arrive in order to pass the news they had gotten, meeting with Yuji, Megumi, Hana, Nanako, Jin, Kyoto, and Todo. Tengen had been captured by Kenjaku, and that especially was a shock to all of them. After all, with all the people they had there, Yuki Tsukumo, a special grade level fighter, 5 death paintings, a grade 1 sorcerer, and a child trained by Suguru Geto, and yet despite all of that power, Kenjaku was able to get through that and find a way. This proves to them that Kenjaku was someone who could only be taken down through non-ordinary means. Even Jin and Kyoto, who weren't that familiar with Kenjaku, knew who he was. After all, that was their creator. And to hear he was that formidable was certainly terrifying. But it was the next confirmation that really shattered Nanako. After all, it was confirmed to her that both Mimiko and Yuki Tsukumo were dead. Everyone else was heavily injured. The only one who wasn't truly that injured was Choso, and a shake went through Nanako's body as cursed energy began to emanate from her. She was feeling rage like she had only felt once before, when she had learned Suguru Geto had died. But now her sister, one of her family members, was gone from this world as well. And despite not saying anything, the look on her face told them all what they needed to hear. The fact that she was determined to make sure no matter what that Kenjaku would be dead. What was even more terrifying was the fact that Kenjaku still had the lava cursed spirit around named Jogo, something Yuji still blamed himself for. After all, if he was more intentional of his finish, if he went back to check if Jogo was dead, none of this would have happened. He wasn't too sure who could take out Jogo. He was certain he could do it himself by this point, as well as Maki. He had a feeling that Jin and Kyoto on their own would be able to take out Jogo, but it wasn't certain. If the two of them were fighting together, though, they could definitely take him out. But still, with that in mind, they knew they wouldn't be fighting Jogo alone. After all, Kenjaku was still a threat on the field. However, there's something else that Yuji, Megumi, Todo, and Nanako were all able to feel. A change in Maki's demeanor from how she was before. She seemed so cold now. It was bone-chilling. Even Nanako, who knew Maki the least, could feel it. On the other hand, Hana, Jin, and Kyoto kind of felt really creeped out by Maki, so they kind of took a step away from her. And this news was rather worrying to them. Hearing a special grade sorcerer with that much help wasn't enough to take on Kenjaku would put a worry down anyone's spine, but there wasn't much more they could do about it. After all, what had happened already. Still, they were confident. Now that they had found the angel, all they needed to do was free Satoru Gojo and everything could be back to normal. And while they weren't fully able to counter Kenjaku's plan with the military, they were at least able to save some of their lives. And as they were thinking, a question entered into Yuji's head. As he asked, why hasn't Kenjaku started the merger yet? He has Tengen, so isn't there really nothing that can stop him right now? And hearing his cue, that was when a man decided to step out. The man who had predicted the attack of the government, Reggie Starr, as he walked over to them before saying, it's more than likely because he can't rather than he doesn't want to. No point in trying to wring your heads around his reasons when we don't even know where he is to stop him. Megumi agreed with Reggie on that one as well, so now they swapped their plan over to Sumiki. The reason they had all entered the Culling Games in order to free them from the barrier, as well as the rules they were planning to add, which the 4 rules they had in mind were: Rule 1, transferring points, that rule had already been completed. Rule number 2, entry and exit of colonies. Rule 3, communication across colony barriers, and Rule 4, the ability to leave the Culling Games. Fortunately for them, they were no longer going to be at risk of anyone dying to technique lossage. After all, they could continue to constantly alter their points now through the swapping rule. And as they were discussing, this made them realize they were going to need to prioritize adding Rule 4. Rule 2 and Rule 3 might not be an issue with the Culling Games, but one of the barrier itself, as well as the fact that the Angel was able to leave the barrier alongside Maki Zenin. And after discussing coming to their choice, Megumi asked the Kogane to add a rule to the Culling Games to allow players to leave the Culling Games, but to everyone's surprise, the Kogane denied the rule. Denied. That conflicts with Rule 7, the Kogane would say. And while it did take some time in order for them to properly figure out a way, it eventually led to the Kogane offering a way to make this possible. A way that would be quite simple. A player could leave with a substitute in the game by sacrificing 100 points and swapping with a player to invite them in the Culling Games. This was not a rule addition that they liked, but at the same time they could tell they weren't going to be able to bargain with the Kogane any further. Besides, they had more than enough points to be able to add in their rules and to get Sumiki out of the Culling Games, and so long as they kept cycling points until they found a way out from the Culling Games aside from having to kill more players, things would be fine, so they ultimately agreed. 3 hours would pass. During this time, everyone had been placed on different parts of the map in order to separate so they'd be able to be prepared for when Sumiki landed. After all, they wouldn't be able to predict where she would land. Jin, Kyoto, and Maki were each at different parts of the city, on a different corner each. Reggie had Hazanoki, Nanako, and Todo with him, mainly because of them not being as big powerhouses in comparison to the others, so good to say in numbers. Takuba was also there. Finally, Yuji was with Megumi and Hana, waiting for them to arrive. Yuji had agreed to substitute for Sumiki, as Sumiki landed beside Yuji, catching the 3 of them off guard. Still, they were rather happy to see that things had gone well. In particular, Yuji was happy because of how well things had gone so far. Megumi was mixed. A part of him was really happy for how everything had gone. He had been able to rely on his friends. They had been able to get his sister out. But at the same time, Megumi felt incredibly useless. He couldn't even say he helped in getting Akari. After all, that was mainly Shoso and Nobara's doing. But that didn't matter. He was going to resolve himself to get stronger next time. He was going to make sure they could rely on him instead. So long as he got his sister back, things could finally return to normal. Though as they were talking, Yuji couldn't help but notice that their sibling relationship was definitely odd in comparison to his with his own brothers. After all, he was expecting Megumi to act a bit more happy since it was his sister, but at the same time, Megumi was just kind of indifferent, like even more different than normal. Though Yuji thought that was just his way of having a sibling relationship. Maybe he was just weird. But Megumi didn't want to wait. He wanted to immediately get on with this. After all, the longer they spent, the more and more risk Sumiki would have. So Megumi transferred over 100 points to Sumiki, but to all three of their surprise, suddenly Sumiki said, "Kogane, add a rule, allowing entry and exit across colony barriers." All three of their eyes widened. Yuji activated Flowing Red skill stack immediately, as Megumi asked who was this person, with them having a wide grin before telling them they were his big sister, before they lifted up their hands in a shrug and revealed they were joking, as in reality this was an ancient sorcerer from the Heian era, Yorozu. As Yorozu then said, "I haven't fought for 1,000 years, so I want to choose who and where I fight, and first I choose Sukuna," staring Yuji dead in the eyes, before Yuji quickly rushed towards them, closing the distance in a surprising burst of speed. And for most opponents this would definitely catch them off guard. However, Yorozu was not most opponents, as Yorozu created her own type of metallic butterfly wings, and quickly created liquid metal in order to block the blow, sending Yuji backwards. And Yorozu began to smirk a little bit wider for a moment as she stared Yuji in the eyes. After all, she realized something that even the angel didn't, but she didn't want to say that out loud. After all, she didn't want to potentially ruin Sukuna's plans here. But she was curious in which body was Sukuna going to fight her. Well, that was for her to discover later, as Yorozu quickly began to start flying away. However, from Yuji's back, blood wings began to grow. He was pretty confident he would at least be able to catch up to Yorozu, until suddenly a mouth rose out on Yuji's cheek, as the word Enchain was spoken, not by Yuji, but by Ryomen Sukuna. Moving significantly faster than Yuji was, Hana was suddenly knocked out, by Sukuna targeting the pressure points on her neck. And as Megumi was slowly starting to raise up his hands, suddenly Sukuna ripped off one of Yuji's fingers. As Sukuna began to laugh to himself, realizing that his binding vow and gamble worked. After all, Yuji didn't consider himself a person. He wasn't too sure if this would work, but he was more than happy that it did. And right as Megumi was 2/3 of the way of putting up his arms, he was far too late. Sukuna had force-fed the finger to Megumi. With both Sukuna's skill in reinforcement as well as his skill in blood manipulation, he was able to make Yuji's body get enhanced far beyond his natural limits. So much so that with just blood manipulation, he was able to rival the physical body of what he would be capable of with 20 fingers, despite only being at 16 fingers currently, leaving Megumi having no chance whatsoever to be able to stop this. As Sukuna swapped vessels while at the same time Yuji began to reawaken. As Yuji looked over to Megumi, not even having much time to react, as Sukuna said, "Remember when I said we'd see something interesting, boy? Now let's see if the perfect body for blood manipulation is capable of surviving this." As Yuji activated Flowing Red skill stack once more, trying to activate it as fast as possible. All the while, he was increasing his heartbeat. He was trying to make sure he could activate Flowing Red skill burst, to try and counterattack whatever Sukuna was about to do. But he had no way to predict what would happen next, as Sukuna quickly closed the distance between the two of them. As Yuji began to feel several slashes land across his body, while at the same time, Sukuna landed a punch hard on his stomach, sending Yuji flying through several buildings, while Sukuna lifted up his hand, beginning to launch out tens of slashes all at once at Yuji. This caught everyone's attention, in particular Jin and Kyoto and Todo. After all, the consensus was Yuji's curse energy, but at the same time they were now worried for him. What had happened? What went wrong? At the end, Yuji had been launched through a total of 10 buildings. He could also feel blood leaking out from the slashes. Even the black flashes that Mahito landed in his body back when they fought so long ago was nothing in comparison to this power. Sukuna also knew that Yuji had a reverse curse technique. He wasn't expecting him to die from this. And even if he did, that wouldn't really matter to him. That just meant that Yuji wasn't as worthy as a challenge as he really thought he was, leading to Maki, Todo, Kyoto, Jin, and Reggie all beginning to head over to that direction. At the same time, Nanako took out her phone, as she was preparing to try and take a picture of Sukuna. Her curse link had a lot better range, so she might be able to do something before any of the others could. But all of them felt this massive, overwhelming force of curse energy, filled to the brim with malice. That was what was causing Hazunoki to hesitate. But that massive wave of curse energy began to be focused, controlled, as Sukuna put his hand signs together and summoned a massive Nue, one with Orochi's symbol on its head, as well as a snake-like mouth on its tail. As a massive wave of lightning rained down from the sky, several bolts began to rush towards all of them. Reggie quickly took out one of his receipts before summoning a massive house, using that to shield himself and Nanako, giving them just barely enough time to move out of the way, but now the building they were standing on was collapsing. Maki and Jin were both forced to lift up their hands in order to block the massive wave of lightning. Takaba was forced to take it head-on. Todo was also forced to take the lightning bolts head-on, resulting in him taking quite a bit of damage. He wasn't knocked out, but he was in quite a bit of pain. Kyoto was the only one that was properly able to avoid this damage by going into the shadows, using that in order to properly avoid the lightning bolt, as Kyoto had to wonder to himself, what the hell was going on? But suddenly the entire sky ignited with a massive light, one of a symbol of Jacob's Ladder. As Hana began to quickly chant as fast as she could, she was trying to make sure Jacob's Ladder would be as strong as possible. This was their shot at killing Sukuna. It would just end up risking one person. It would risk killing Megumi, though that wasn't certain, right? She just needed to keep firing. She just needed to keep firing. But where the Angel underestimated Sukuna was not in their strength, no, it was in their malice and how far they were willing to go, as Ryomen Sukuna was the king of curses, not bound by any amount of honor. If it meant victory for him, then he would be willing to take it each and every single time, doing something despicable, impersonating Megumi, trying to pretend that he remembered Hana, and for the girl who wanted nothing more than to be with Megumi once more, it ended up working, as Sukuna embraced Hana before biting off her arm and throwing her off the building. However, before Hana could make impact with the ground, suddenly a dragon made out of shadows quickly caught her, leading Kyoto to look up towards Sukuna. A thought entered into his head. He was the only one right now that was still up. He was the only one that might be able to fight against him right now. As Kyoto began to focus, he was going to do his best to try and battle against Sukuna, until suddenly both of them heard the sound of a heartbeat, making a smirk rise on Kyoto, and a look of intrigue rise on Sukuna. As Yuji in a surprising quick burst of speed closed the distance between the two of them, using flowing red skill burst to boost his speed to the max, before clapping his hands together and firing out a piercing blood at close range, as Sukuna was forced to lift up one of his hands in order to block. However, that piercing blood was stronger than he expected, much stronger. As he was launched off the building, Yuji's 4 wings made out of blood rose out from his back as well, preparing to face off against his opponent, as he flew right after Sukuna, attempting to follow after him in order to continue the pressure. Even with how strong Yuji was, though, Kyoto knew for a fact he couldn't let him fight against Sukuna alone. But he did also see someone near him, Amai, as he then said, "Take Hana and watch over her for now. I gotta go. I have to back Yuji up." The two of them nodded to each other before Kyoto handed over Hana to Amai, and Kyoto rushed right after Yuji in order to back him up. He was hoping also that both Jin and Todo were okay. Sukuna began to turn his body around, using that in order to propel himself away from the piercing blood. That piercing blood went right through several buildings. However, it only continued to fire along on a straight path, which meant Yuji wasn't aiming it. As suddenly he saw Yuji right in front of him, his heartbeat increasing as he attempted to land a punch right on Sukuna's face, using the flowing red scale burst. And Sukuna moved in order to clash fists against Yuji Itadori. As the two were pushing fists against each other, Sukuna was impressed by how strong Yuji actually was right now. Now, of course, Sukuna was expecting Yuji to get angry and more powerful from that, but this strength was much more than he was expecting. Still, it was nothing that he couldn't handle. Fighting with rage filling you isn't going to help you, Yuji. Before Sukuna opened up his hand, releasing another wave of slashes right towards Yuji's direction, pushing Yuji away from himself. However, Yuji was rather quick to counter, as in both hands slicing exorcism discs began to form, with a massive amount of steam coming off of them, before he threw both of them right towards Sukuna's direction. However, before they could reach Sukuna, they suddenly turned around, going for Sukuna's right side and left side instead. All the while, Yuji went for a direct attack on Sukuna's face. Sukuna then opened up his hands once more, sending another wave of slashes right towards Yuji's direction, but Yuji continued to move on anyways, using reverse curse sneak to heal himself away while the two other slicing exorcisms rushed towards Sukuna. As Sukuna quickly jumped, spinning around midair in order to spin in between both the slicing exorcisms. Then he looked over to Yuji and saw another orb of convergence preparing. This was going to be another piercing blood. However, this one was different. It had a blood steam coming off of it. As Sukuna was realizing that Yuji was combining the blood manipulation's ability to control the temperature of the blood alongside the compression, making a significantly hotter piercing blood. And in Yuji's mind, due to Sukuna being up in the air right now, he shouldn't be able to dodge it, especially considering he doesn't have blood manipulation anymore, which means he shouldn't be able to fly. But to Yuji's surprise, Sukuna was able to jump off the very air itself, using that to deflect himself away from it. And while this did catch Yuji off guard for a moment, he didn't let that distract him, as all 4 of his blood wings expanded in size quite rapidly, before out from each of them a massive cascade of hardened blood arrows launched right towards Sukuna. An entire swarm, all of it rapid firing towards him, which caused Sukuna to smirk a slight bit as he said, "Do you really think that overwhelming me with attacks is going to do anything at all to me? I mean, you have memories from the battle against Mahito. You should know that'll do nothing whatsoever." And to follow that up, a massive wave of slashes was released around Sukuna's body, almost creating a bubble of slashes that Sukuna was currently standing inside of on air. But after finishing slicing them apart, he realized he could no longer see where Yuji was, as he began to look around. That wasn't made to be an attack, that was just made to cloak him. However, Yuji's curse energy signature he could sense, and he sensed it above himself. But when he looked up, he saw several blood vector lines rushing right towards his direction, leading Sukuna to quickly counter, as he began to attempt to punch away each of the blood vector lines, but that was mainly just made to be another distraction. Also, Yuji could rush down, the sound of his heartbeat increasing. At the same time, a massive amount of curse energy surrounded his fist. And at the same time that Yuji was rushing down towards him, suddenly something rose out from the shadows. Kyoto's Shadow Dragon Shikigami slammed right into Sukuna's back in order to time it out perfectly with Yuji's punch, trying to mess up Sukuna's timing even a little bit, leading to Yuji landing a proper blow on Sukuna's stomach. However, Sukuna wasn't done yet, as he had to admit he was impressed, though he was expecting Yuji to be able to do that on his own, but at the same time, now he at least had two people that he could fight. Under normal circumstances, he would not be as okay with it, but this was one of the people he was a little bit more interested in. After all, he was an experiment in the same lines that Yuji was. So who knows, he might have that same potential. As Sukuna launched himself away, a smile rising on his face, while at the same time he was staring at Yuji and Kyoto. As Sukuna then said, I wonder which shadow will be better. And at the same time fighting against a blood manipulation user. I wonder, did Kenjaku find any curses that have to do with space? Now we'd have the whole recreation of the big three families. Though I must admit, Kenjaku is far more twisted than I thought. And Yuji began to continue his next assault, with Kyoto taking a step backwards in order to continue playing background support. While neither of them came up with a game plan or game strategy, he was more confident that the two of them could figure it out on the fly, same with Yuji. But as Yuji was continuing his rush, he had to ask, why can't you just live without causing suffering? Leading Sukuna lifting up his hand in the motion of a finger gun, before launching out an incredibly powerful slash right towards Yuji. Rather than a wave of slashes, he launched out a singular one. That slash cutting through a large portion of the ground as well, but Yuji hardened the blood in his arms, causing him to cough a little bit. While he was able to mitigate some of the effects of hardening the blood in his own body, he wouldn't be able to do so forever. He had been feeling the effects getting stronger and stronger, but still that was more than enough power to be able to defend himself. As Yuji then focused the blood towards his own hand, before releasing it and turning it into a blade, using the blood edge technique, mainly using it to attempt to increase the range that he had on his blade and attempt to land a slash on Sukuna. At the same time, Kyoto launched out several hands made out of shadows towards Sukuna, trying to hold him in each direction and make sure he wouldn't be able to deflect this attack, as Sukuna thought to himself that he might as well try out some things while he's battling against these two, leading to him calling upon the ability of Maximum Elephant and firing out a massive wave of water underneath his feet, using that massive wave of water in order to deflect both of the attacks away from him, before he unsummoned Maximum Elephant and instead made a blade out of slashes, before he rushed right towards Yuji. To me, the real question is, why do you care so much for those weaklings? As his blade clashed with Yuji's own blood edge. Why do such weaklings cling so fiercely to life? And while he was pushing against Yuji's own blade, he lifted up his other hand, launching out a massive slash right towards Kyoto's direction. And while Kyoto couldn't see the slash itself, he could see Sukuna's finger movement. He could tell by the spark of curse energy he was about to get hit by a strong attack, leading to him at the last moment moving into the shadows in order to try and dodge, but even though he did partially dodge, it still managed to hit on his side. As Sukuna's focus then returned back to Yuji, before he opened up his hand again, and launched out a massive wave of slashes right towards Yuji's direction. All the while he continued, how can a creature that falls apart at a touch say that it always wants to be happy? The helpless have no choice but to swallow the suffering life gives them. Leading to Yuji being forced backwards away from Sukuna. However, even though he was forced backwards, Yuji was able to notice the power wasn't as strong as he was expecting. While the pain was certainly there, it wasn't as strong as it was before. Was Sukuna underestimating him? No, he didn't think that was the case, as Sukuna looked down to his own hand, noticing a small shake there. Not just had Yuji gotten massively stronger, Megumi was fighting back as well. As Yuji slowly began to get up, calling upon all the blood that he had lost in this battle, as the blood began to surround him, hardening and almost forming into claws around his hands. No, it continued, it went all the way up his arms. As curse energy and rage emanated off of Yuji's body, staring down to Sukuna. Yuji's heartbeat also began to increase, preparing to use another flowing red scale burst. As Yuji said, then let's see if you can swallow my suffering. As a smirk rose on Sukuna, he had to admit he was impressed. He was expecting Yuji to have gone down several times by this point, but no, he was surpassing his expectations. Yuji might become an interesting opponent later on. He wanted to master the 10 shadows first and then face off against Yuji later. Right now, it truly wasn't going to be a good fight. But first, it seemed he needed to make Yuji submit, leading to him opening up his hand and releasing a massive wave of slashes right towards Yuji's direction. But Yuji forced his way through it. He forced his way and made his way towards Sukuna, while at the same time several shadow hands wrapped around Sukuna's arms and legs, forcing them away in order to make sure they couldn't hit Yuji directly. Kyoto was right now holding his side, with blood coming out of it, but at the same time he wasn't out yet either. He needed to make sure he could do whatever he can to support Yuji. As Yuji landed a hard punch right on Sukuna's face, launching him right through one of the buildings, causing Sukuna to cough up some blood. Before he looked down to his hand, surprised to see it was shaking right now, realizing that Megumi was fighting back, as he slowly forced himself out from the building. Yuji was starting to take heavy breaths as well, mainly because he was still getting used to this new amount of power, making it that much more draining on him. Before Sukuna suddenly sensed something on his left side, a massive burst of blue fire coming right towards Sukuna's direction. As Sukuna was forced to jump high into the air in order to avoid it, Jin had now arrived in order to back them up. However, as Sukuna was jumping into the air, something caught him off guard. A heavy punch landed right on his back. as Maki landed down right next to Yuji, with Jin and Kyoto also getting up, as Kyoto's body began to shift. Due to Kyoto's weird nature and odd body, he had several capabilities, one of which was using the shadows to close wounds. Sure, it still hurt and was going to damage his output, but he'd definitely be able to manage. As a smirk rose onto Sukuna, as he thought to himself, Nue's attack didn't damage Maki whatsoever. However, it did do some damage to Jin. Impressive. Both of these people aren't any small fries either. Still, even with this weakened output, I should at least be able to get away from them, so long as Aoi Todo doesn't join into the battle, though I used a bit more lightning on him in particular to make sure he would be more stunned. Yuji had so much anger filling his eyes right now, as he told them, kill Sukuna, he's not going to die. After all, he knew better than anyone else the resilience that Sukuna had, and he knew better how to get Megami out of this. As Jin, Kyoto, and Maki each nodded in agreement, preparing themselves in order to battle against Sukuna. As Yuji and Maki both rushed right towards Sukuna, Yuji's heartbeat increasing again, he was starting to get a better hang on flowing red scale burst. As a memory entered into his head of something that Sukuna did during his battle against Mahito. While he wasn't able to use flowing red scale burst at full 100% output the entire fight, he was able to use it to a certain degree, and that was done via constantly using reverse curse technique on his heart. All the while, Jin and Kyoto stayed back, as Jin lifted up his hands before releasing several bursts of fire towards Sukuna. And right as Yuji and Maki were about to reach Sukuna, suddenly they both jumped to the side, allowing the burst of fire to rush right towards him, leading to Sukuna launching out a wave of slashes towards the burst of fire, slicing through each of them before they could reach him, but Maki and Yuji took their chance, as both of them attempted to land a punch on Sukuna, leading to Sukuna being a bit slow this time to react. After all, he was still dealing with the burst of fire coming at him. And while he was slightly able to move his body out the way, he wasn't able to do so fully, leading to both Yuji and Maki landing a punch on his side. And right as Sukuna was about to attempt to counterattack, suddenly he felt two shadows push his legs slightly, both the shadow hands being used in order to disrupt Sukuna's movements, giving both Yuji and Maki a bit more distance in order for them to move out the way, as both of them quickly spun before landing a punch right on Sukuna's chest at the same time, sending him flying backwards. And right as Sukuna was sent flying, Jin jumped into the air and launched a massive wave of fire right at Sukuna's direction. At the same time, Kyoto made two shadow hands wrap around Sukuna's legs, forcing him to get thrown right into the burst of fire, before Sukuna released a wave of slashes, slashing away both the fire and the shadows that was currently on him. As both Yuji and Maki rushed right towards Sukuna, the both of them moving at relatively equal speeds. No, Yuji was actually moving faster than Maki, however Maki's reaction speed was still significantly faster even with Yuji using flowing red scale burst, allowing the two of them to fight at a near even pace with each other. But in terms of physical strength, Yuji was actually quite a bit stronger than Maki. But while the two of them were moving, suddenly a bit of Yuji's blood actually went onto Maki's arms, reinforcing them even further by hardening, making temporary gauntlets for Maki to wear, as both Yuji and Maki went on an assault on Sukuna. Each punch was pushing Sukuna through several of the buildings, as Sukuna, Yuji, and Maki began to move through the air, Yuji for using his blood wings to fly, Maki and Sukuna both for hopping on air. As Yuji quickly jumped backwards, allowing Maki to take the direct assault, before Yuji flapped his wings, sending a massive cascade of blood arrows right towards Sukuna's direction, with Maki jumping out of the way, sensing it coming thanks to her advanced sensors. Sukuna lifted up his hand in order to release a massive wave of slashes in order to counter the wave of arrows coming towards him. That was when Jin and Kyoto rushed behind Sukuna, both of them landing a hard punch on his back, before Jin released a massive wave of fire at Sukuna at close range. The blood arrows was a distraction from Yuji for the two of them to make that move. And as Sukuna turned around about to launch out another wave of slashes towards them, Maki suddenly closed distance and punched Sukuna right in the face. And as Sukuna was being rocketed to the ground, suddenly he could see something out the corner of his eye. A blood orb rising right beside him. No, several rising right around them. As Yuji used the supernova right on Sukuna, which that attack caught Sukuna completely off guard, but it did do some damage towards him as Yuji began his next rush. As Sukuna thought to himself, when I'm about to hurt his friends, it looks like the rejection is stronger and he dampens the output of my curse technique. If that's the case... Before he slammed his hand on the ground and used Cleave's spiderweb, using it in such a massive area that it was able to hit all four of them at once, causing a massive explosion on the ground to knock all four of them away from him. And as Yuji, Kyoto, Jin, and Maki were each preparing to continue on their attack, suddenly they all felt a massive wave of curse energy. No, they felt two waves of curse energy. As two people landed down, Urame, who released a maximum frost calm right towards their direction, and on the other end was Kenjaku, which was the Jin taking the front, as he took a breath in and a breath out before releasing the largest wave of fire that he ever had released in his life, countering up against Urame's attack and equaling each other out. As Kenjaku said, seems you could use a hand, Sukuna. Jin and Kyoto could each feel it in their instincts. The man that was standing in front of them was their parent. That was Kenjaku. Their mother, now in the form of a male body. As Kenjaku smirked and said, "My oh my, to see my three children together fighting alongside each other, it truly does bring a tear to my soul. All that's missing is Kotoke and we would have had a perfect family reunion of the family I'm actually somewhat proud of." However, that was when Yuji had enough, as he began to rush right towards Kenjaku, Sukuna, and Urame, aiming in particular for Sukuna. But Urame stepped forward, releasing another burst of Maximum Frost Calm. While at the same time Kenjaku released a wave of cursed spirits, all of them rocketing towards the four of them, in particular Yuji. As Sukuna then said, "I'll see you around. Make sure you're stronger for our next encounter, because you're not going to be able to rely on Megami to save you next time." As a black liquid surrounded all three of them before they warped away. At the same time, Jin, Kyoto, and Maki all rushed forward in order to assist Yuji with dealing with this attack. But by the time they were done, it was too late. Sukuna had managed to escape, and he had taken Megami Fushiguro. Yuji closed his fist rather hard. The embers of rage was now ignited inside of him, one that was whirling around like a tornado. He was incredibly angry. Not just from Sukuna, but from Kenjaku as well. After all, that was the man who had insulted his brother. But more than that, they also had hurt his brother, not to mention his anger towards Sukuna as well. His anger towards Sukuna for him taking Megami's body, but most of all was his anger towards himself. After all, Yuji felt completely responsible for this. If he had done better, if he was a bit stronger, he would have been able to save him, but he wasn't. He was not able to save Megami. As Yuji released a scream in anger, cursed energy emanating off of his body, flaring up like a blue flame around him, but he made sure to promise one thing. No matter what, he was going to make sure that Sukuna was dead, and that Kenjaku was dead as well. But thankfully they weren't alone as well, as people began to approach them. Up first was Reggie, and with them was Nanako holding Todo up. Todo was injured from Sukuna's electricity, but they managed to help with his wounds. As Todo apologized, he felt awful for not being able to help. And finally was Amai carrying Hana. Her arm had been bandaged by this point to stop the bleeding, but still she was in quite a bit of pain. Thankfully she was knocked out, so she wasn't going to feel all of it right now. And all of them could see that look of determination and rage enter onto Yuji's face. And Todo was certain of one thing especially, that he was going to help hone that rage, help hone it into a strong weapon to make sure they could kill Sukuna. But for now, all of them are going to need to regroup. They are going to need to plan with the others in order to prepare the perfect plan to take out Sukuna. And with that, the Alliance all left the barrier, preparing themselves to plan for their next move. Sukuna, Urame, and Kenjaku would all begin to return back to the Zenin clan headquarters, making that their new base of operations. Sukuna was just placed for the bath ritual. The first step in suppressing Megami's soul had now been completed. However, this time Sukuna didn't immediately go to battle against Hirozu. After all, he did need to do a test drive. He never truly got to see the full potential of the 10 Shadows. He knew Megami had one superior Shikigami left, an incredibly powerful beast, the famed esteemed beast of the 10 Shadows. The legendary beast known as the Maharaga. Though before he did, he made an odd request to Urame, which was to get him several martial arts movies. The reason was mainly because of some curiosity. He knew Itadori watched some in the past, and he was able to pick up moves from them. That was where he got the Manji kick from after all. And with his capability to copy anything he had seen on the first try, he was curious to see what he could do. And once Urame heard the explanation, they understood. Of course Urame would do it either way. After all, they were Sukuna's loyalists. They were loyal to Sukuna no matter what, and do anything Sukuna asked whatsoever. And as Sukuna prepares to face off against Maharaga, we then return back to Jujutsu High. Currently, quite a lot of them were mingling, getting to know each other better. After all, there were a bunch of new faces here, and a bunch of old faces that Yuji recognized. A look of relief entered onto Yuji's face when he saw that some of his brothers were okay and currently still standing, though a few of them were still missing. Eso, Kachizu, Kotsuzo, and Shouso were still all resting after their battle. While their wounds from the Kenjaku battle had been healed up pretty well up to this point, they still wanted to take this final day to recover just in case. Choso had healed pretty well from that fight, though Nanami had lost his arm. He also saw others that he was happy was okay, such as Nobara. After all, while he did have confidence in Nobara getting stronger, he was still a bit worried for her. But that worry was for nothing. He could also see that all the Tokyo second years were also here, as well as that weird broom lady from Kyoto, and that blue hair swordswoman that he found pretty interesting. While he knew Kama was here somewhere, he wasn't in the room right now, so he'd have to catch up with his mentor later. However, there were also some faces that he most certainly didn't recognize here. Up was a man that looked like they should be in their late 20s. Next to a person with a lot of piercings, he figured that this must have been Hikari and Kirara. He also saw a man with long side hair standing against the wall looking out the window, who was wearing all white clothes. He didn't actually know who this guy was, but he could tell this might be an ally. Maybe, he wasn't too certain about that. And the final person that he didn't recognize was a girl with blue hair that had blue hands and blue legs. But other than that, they seemed to be mostly human, before he remembered a line that Kenjaku said during their battle. There was one more experiment along the same strand as himself, Jin, and Kyoto. And he realized in that moment that that person was most definitely that sibling. Though he also saw the other man that he didn't recognize at all kind of avoiding her like the plague. The only way he could really describe it was like a cat trying to avoid a bath. Currently they were talking with Choso, Shoso, Tanzo, and Sanzo. After all, they were technically her siblings as well, which made her even more curious about them. That was when Choso noticed Yuji with two other people next to him, one of them that looked like an odd furnace and the other looked like their entire body was covered in shadows. Choso could already tell they were going to fit along well with the other death paintings, as Choso called all three of them over, leading to the death paintings and Kotsuke meeting Yuji, Jin, and Kyoto and same the other way around. As Kotsuke had a realization and asked the question, "Am I the only sister you guys have?" with all the brothers nodding at the same time. And while Yuji definitely wanted to get to know his sister better, up first he did have to ask her a very important question. As Yuji said, "We're planning to fight against Ryoma and Sukuna, and we fully understand if you don't want to join in or help with that fight. But will you..." And before Yuji could finish that sentence, Kotsuke interrupted him. By putting a hand on his mouth, she said, "We're siblings. You have my back in this." And all the other siblings nodded in agreement to that as well. They were going to have each other's back no matter what. Even if they didn't know each other for that long, they were still connected to each other via blood. But it wasn't just that blood that connected them so deeply. No, it was them all experiencing that same pain that Kenjaku would cause them all. Them all having that same hatred towards Kenjaku for putting them through everything they did. And most of all, them desiring to be able to make a community where they could each be accepted. That was really what they were fighting for and what they were going to make sure would happen. As Choso then said, "Speaking of Sukuna, I think I might actually have some things that could help with this. I don't know too much about the soul, but I figured you might actually be able to do better with this than I could. I'd also recommend getting Todo to help with this as well. The Notes of Yuki Tsukumo. There might be something in that book that might be able to help reverse whatever's happened to Megumi," though he wasn't too sure himself. Yuji gladly accepted that book as he nodded. He was going to try and figure out this best way in order to free Megumi. He already had some ideas in mind from his experience with Sukuna so far, as well as his battle against Mahito, so this might be able to help him out. All of them, everybody here knew they were all going to need to get stronger. After all, they were up against the King of Curses. They were up against the strongest sorcerer in history, as well as Kenjaku, the most evil sorcerer in history. So they were each going to need to be on their A game and be able to learn from each other. But Kotsuke felt they had a pretty good chance at this. After all, they had several people who had exceeded the level of what a grade 1 sorcerer was, far surpassing that level. Such as Yuta Akotsu, who was a special grade, Hikari Kinji, who was supposedly Yuta Akotsu's equal, Hajime Kashimo, who was able to rival that same equal to Yuta, not to mention Yuji, Jin, Kyoto, and herself, as well as Maki Zenin, the one who had broken free from the chains of curse energy. On top of that, they had several sorcerers who had reached a grade 1 level and reached very deep into that grade 1 level like Nobara Kugasaki, like her now oldest brother Choso, and such as Todo. They would all definitely be able to figure out some way to surpass their limits and become strong enough to take on this sorcerer from the past. Which led to Kotsuke asking if she could spar with Yuji. After all, she could tell that Yuji was either the strongest person here or the second strongest person here. But she had already fought Yuta back in Sendai Colony. Now she wants to test Yuji's might, but more importantly, she wants to see what they could learn from each other. After all, both of them had curse Sydney said were based around manipulating a liquid, so she figured if she'd be able to learn from anybody, it would be Yuji. And while they all definitely wanted to spend some time getting to know each other better, they knew they had something more important to focus on right now, and that was their plan to take out Sukuna. But before they could even begin to properly plan, they did need to get one more thing. No, they needed to get one more ally. Which that left Kotsuke, Jin, and Kyoto quite confused. After all, they felt they had everybody here, didn't they? And Yuji shook his head no. After all, they needed to get the strongest sorcerer of the modern era, Satoru Gojo. Which that made Kotsuke's eyes widen a little bit as she looked between them with a clear surprise on her face. After all, she had no idea that they were actually allies with Satoru Gojo. Though the more and more she thought about it, the more she realized that kind of made sense. After all, there were a bunch of people who were monsters in terms of power here, and if they were allied with Satoru Gojo, yeah, it just all made sense. With Kyoto saying, "That's exactly what I said." And Yuji told him he was going to do anything he could in order to beat Sukuna. As then suddenly they were joined in by a couple of people, those people being Nobara Kugasaki and Aoi Todo. As Nobara then told Yuji, "Sorry about what happened in Tokyo. Really sorry that I couldn't have been there to help out against Sukuna." Normally Nobara's tone would be a lot more on the jokey side, but she was feeling this as much as Yuji was. After all, she couldn't help but wonder what would happen if she was there. How would this have gone if she was there to help? And if there was a chance that Sukuna wouldn't have been able to escape if she was there. But Yuji shook his head, as he told her that this was his fault. He was the one that made that deal with Sukuna so long ago and forgotten. He should have been able to do something, set up some precaution, but this just didn't work. However, before both Yuji and Nobara could continue the blame game, suddenly they were both chopped on the head by Kotsuke. As she told the both of them, it doesn't matter who was at fault for Sukuna taking over Megumi's body. All that matters now is the fact that it did happen. You guys can apologize to each other and feel guilt for it all you want, but that will only hinder you. Just get stronger and focus on bringing Megumi back. You can talk about who is to blame properly after you're done and get Megumi. And they all nodded in agreement to that, as Todo had something to add himself, as he said, as sorcerers we're all responsible and all can partially take some blame to this. But as sorcerers, it's also our job to take on the burden of the world, of cursed energy, of cursed spirits, and curses as a whole together. And that is what we will do. Not one single person can take that burden on alone. Because if a sorcerer dies alone, then sorcery as a whole is dead. And that did help both Yuji and Nobara's mental process a bit. After all, it gave them something new to focus on. That guilt was only going to hold them back, so they were going to need to focus on everything on getting Megami back from Sukuna. Some time would pass, leading them to changing locations. After all, there was no way they were going to unseal Gojo inside the sealed off place. They were going to need to unseal him somewhere a little bit more open, so they decided to use one of the training grounds. This led into Satoru Gojo being freed from the prison realm, and that interaction going pretty similar to how it went in canon. With Gojo returning and telling Jujutsu High that they had over a month to prepare, and that they were going to fight Sukuna on December 24th. They had a lot of time to train and a lot of time to figure things out. So, they were going to spend as much time as possible in order to get as strong as possible, to battle against Ryoma and Sukuna for that fateful day. However, before they did properly begin planning out their preparations, Gojo had to admit one thing. He was proud. He was proud to see how far all of his students had gotten. Though at the same time, he did have to admit he was sorry they all had to suffer so much. But at the same time, Nobara told him that it was fine. After all, that suffering made them a lot stronger. Still, Gojo didn't really feel that good about it, but at the same time, there was no point in feeling bad about it right now. After all, there was no change in the past, only making sure the future could be better, and that was something he was certainly going to do no matter what. Though Gojo could see a lot of people around them, a lot of people that he really didn't recognize, so he decided to go out of his way to begin meeting people. He was curious about all of them. Though a lot of them just seemed to be pretty similar to Yuji, but from the perspective of the Six Eyes, it was like their cursed energy was in some degree similar. Which led to Gojo finding out that Yuji had several siblings, a lot more than he thought. Sure, yes, he already knew beforehand that Yuji had 9 siblings that were death paintings, but seeing that Kenjaku did 3 more experiments that were a lot more similar to Yuji made him even more curious. But now that everybody here, they could probably talk about their plans in order to beat Sukuna. With Akari starting the conversation by saying that anyone who wants to go against Sukuna is going to need to have either a reverse curse technique or an anti-domain technique. Fortunately for them, they had a massive amount of people who could actually use reverse curse technique. In total, they had 8 people who were capable of using reverse curse technique to varying degrees and skills. Currently at the top of the skill when it came to self-healing was of course Gojo. Though when Akari was in Jackpot, his self-healing speed was significantly greater than Gojo. However, it was subconscious, so he couldn't control it. Up next was Yuta through his ability to heal others. Then up next was Yuji Itadori, who was getting constant experience with RCT ever since he had used the Flowing Red skill burst for the first time. Then Shoko, who was by far the most experienced when it came to healing other people. Then there was Kotake, Choso, as well as Hazanoki, who were each capable of using a reverse curse technique, though Choso was by far the worst at them currently since he only just recently figured out how to use it with Flowing Red skill burst. Which is when Choso mentioned that he would like to refine his reverse curse technique through switch training. That should still be more than enough considering all the amount of people that they were going to have on the field, and they were going to have a lot more attempts. A confused expression rose onto several people's faces here, mainly a lot of the people who were in Tokyo Colony number 1. After all, they had absolutely no idea what switch training actually was since they had missed that conversation. Leading to Uyui explaining what switch training was, how he was able to teleport people and swap their souls, and by extension he could give the person the experience of the other person's body. This would most certainly be rather helpful for Yuji, though he needed to debate with himself who he wanted to switch with himself. He knew that one of the switches was definitely going to have to be with Kusakabe. Having access to simple domain and the barrier skills offered through it was going to be rather crucial to this, especially because of the potential that it might lead into him creating a domain expansion for himself. After all, he definitely had the curse technique experience and skill by this point, he just didn't have the experience when it came to making barriers. Which also led into Yuji learning about something else rather interesting for him. Something he already figured out partially, but he hadn't figured out fully up to this point, which is the fact that his body remembered everything that Sukuna had done and it would make him stronger. If that was the case, Yuji had to wonder if he could use all the techniques that Sukuna performed with blood manipulation in his body. He was already starting to perform some of them after doing some training with his brothers, so maybe he could perform them even better. Maybe he could even refine his curse energy to be equal to what Sukuna was without him using blood manipulation. And even when he was thinking on the people who might need to use reverse curse technique, they definitely had enough people who could teach it. While he didn't see it likely that Gojo was going to participate in switch training since that would hold them back, they still had 7 people here who could help with reverse curse technique. Not to mention the fact that while Choso's reverse curse technique did need some work, he could definitely work with somebody on it and still have enough to do another swap with somebody. Yuji was also able to see that the one that was going to swap with Choso was going to be Kotake. After all, Kotake had some things that she could benefit from Choso. Her cursing centered around manipulating water, and while they were definitely different liquids, they were still liquids at the end of the day, so maybe some of the techniques could transfer between the two of them. Maybe he could do a swap with Esso to help him get reverse curse technique. He wasn't expecting all of his brothers to be on the field. Most of them were support types, however maybe the top 3 of Esso, Kajizu, and Choso could be on the field with them. However, that did lead Choso to something else, he told Yuji that wouldn't be necessary. which that made Yuji blink a little bit in surprise. After all, he knew they didn't have access to reverse curse technique, and he asked why that was the case. But Choso shook his head, as he knew this was going to be quite a bit to explain, so he decided to take Yuji aside in order to explain it properly. As Choso said to Yuji, "We always knew that it would be inevitable that we would get separated from our bodies, at least in some way, shape, or form. After all, these bodies don't belong to us." And that was a truth that Yuji knew. After all, he did feel bad for the people that those bodies originally took, but he always just assumed it was impossible for them to get their lives back. But when he thought about it more, he realized that it might not be impossible. After all, Sukuna was able to transfer bodies. Maybe Baito's technique works a little bit differently, but there was no reason to assume that. He also remembered Hana's technique was able to separate the vessels from the players as well. So they now had one guaranteed avenue as well as a potential avenue through Yuki's book of how to remove themselves from their bodies. And Choso allowed Yuji to take in that information properly for a second before he nodded. As Choso then said, "When our brothers fought against Kenjaku, they realized in that fight they were going to die, but not just that, they were going to take their bodies down with them. Not to mention our other brothers, while they've been enjoying their lives, they at the same time couldn't help but feel guilty about that, me included. However, we have been thinking and there might be a better way for us to be able to help, while at the same time not using the switch training. We are at this point used to existing in only a mental plane, and now with Sukuna gone, this is completely possible." And Yuji knew exactly where they were going with this. They want to live on inside of Yuji and give Yuji their strength. After all, while Yuji was skilled and strong with blood manipulation, he was still lacking in some skill when it came to comparison to his brothers. Sure, he more than made up with it for power, but he didn't have the same skill they had. And while Yuji thought about it for a couple of seconds, he decided to nod in agreement. He was more than okay with that. After all, this was the best way they could all continue living. This would give the people's bodies back, as well as allow them to continue living on through him, but most of all, it will allow Yuji's brothers to always be with him. Though Choso told him that he wasn't going to quite separate yet. After all, he was strong enough to fight on the field and he was only going to get stronger. However, once this battle was done, then he was going to separate and go into Yuji's body. It would just be the other 8 siblings for now. Yuji wished that there was a better way to keep them around. After all, he did like having them physically be around rather than just being in his head all the time, but at the same time, this wasn't going to be a bad arrangement. It would just be returning to how things were in the past. Still, Yuji told him that once they found a way, he would do it. Though now this caused a new complication of him not knowing who to do his second version of switch training with. After all, by this point, he felt he could just refine all the abilities that he wanted to on his own. Though he figured he'd come up with a second person later. After all, he did have some time to wait and spare. He was going to do some swap training with Kusakabe first in order to get Simple Domain down, and maybe if he asked around for some advice on who he should switch with, he might be able to find the person. No point stressing over it, really. They then head back to a theater in order to properly discuss with the others what their plan would be if Gojo loses. Though Gojo wouldn't be in the room presently, he had begun his training in order to prepare himself to battle against someone who had the face of Megami. After all, that was still his technical son, so he needed to make sure that wouldn't hold him back and that emotional connection wouldn't make him fumble. This would lead into them coming up with the same Higuruma plan. After all, that was their absolute best chance of taking out Sukuna. That was of course if Gojo and Kashimo failed, though they were pretty certain if Gojo was going to fail, Kashimo would fail. Which that pissed off Kashimo for a moment, though when Kashimo was about to try and challenge people, Kotsuke ended up stepping up and told him to sit down. And because Kashimo did not want to fight a water user, he just sat down. Yuji told him that he might have a way to make sure that Higuruma would be able to get the death penalty on Sukuna. After all, from what he remembered from the Higuruma battle, he was able to do retrials. And Higuruma thinks he knows where Yuji is going with that. They just simply have to continue the trial. Then after, they can have everybody join in order to offer some support for Higuruma to land the Executioner Blade on Sukuna. While at the same time, Yuta, Kotsu, and Takaba will be sent out in order to deal with Kenjaku. And that was a pretty good primary plan, though they were definitely going to need to come up with a secondary plan later. However, they'd likely have to come up with that after doing some more studying. But now they got their primary plan out of the way, now is their time to begin training properly. They agreed to check in after a week in order to see what they could properly come up with. Though some sparring matches were beginning in order to test people's powers properly. Toto had challenged Jin to a sparring match a while back, and now the two of them were going to spar. While Toto knew that Jin had better firepower than him, he at the same time thought that he might have better mobility, so he might be able to take advantage of that. Up next was going to be a sparring match between Kotsuke versus Kamo and Choso. While Kotsuke did want to learn a bit more about blood manipulation, she felt combat would be the best way for her to learn it, and she felt that she might be a bit too strong for Choso to take on solo. However, she was also interested about Kamo, since Kamo was a natural blood manipulation user unlike Choso who was a death painting. But the final matchup was going to be a rather interesting one, as it was one between mentor and students. Satoru Gojo had heard how well Nobara and especially Yuji Itadori had done. Yuji was able to fight against Yuta Kotsu, kill Mayuto after he dove deep into the wells of his potential, defeated Jogo and even fought against Sukuna for a bit, and then there was Nobara, who while not as impressive as Yuji was able to help fight against Hajime Kashimo. So he decided he was going to spar against the both of them. He wanted to see how well his students were doing. Though he did tell them he wasn't going to use Infinity against them. After all, he did want to see how far they were going, and he felt it would be pretty useless to see how far they were going if he just was blocking all of their attacks through Infinity. Though they did decide they were going to go in order of challenges. After all, they did want to see how well everybody was doing, leading to a pretty large group heading out to the field in order to watch the sparring match. Not everybody was here, but they had a pretty large amount of people here, as Aoi Todo prepared to fight against Kyoto. The sparks of battle were now beginning, though this one was different from all of the other ones that they had been experiencing and all of the ones that they were likely going to have to experience in the future. It was a friendly sparring session between fellow sorcerers. A way to test each other before they'd have the battle of their lives against Ryoma and Sukuna, the strongest sorcerer in history, as well as the most evil sorcerer in history, Kenjaku. Currently, 3 sparring matches were brewing, though they decided they were going to go in order of them. After all, everybody did want to watch how everybody was going to fight. The first sparring match would be between Jin Monzo and Aoi Todo, an experiment of Kenjaku up against one of the strongest Grade 1 sorcerers of the modern era. Second was going to be Kosuke Arena fighting against Choso as well as Kamo Noritoshi, 2 children of Kenjaku facing off against each other, as well as an exiled member of the Kamo clan. And the final sparring match was going to be between master and students. Yuji Itadori and Nobara Kugisaki were going to battle up against Gojo Satoru, the strongest of the modern era. And while most of the raid squad was here and present, not all of them were. Yuta, Maki, Kusakabe, as well as Momo were not here and present. Even Kashimo had actually decided to come. After all, even though he didn't know any of these sorcerers, he wanted to know what he was working with, especially Yuji Itadori. After all, he was the previous vessel of Sukuna. Inumaki and Pando were also not present, so seeing what his original body might be capable of would be rather interesting. Mei was also recording this as she was rather interested to see what she could get footage-wise. Maybe she could even sell this later to others. Granted, she had no plans to actually tell them they were recording, but that was beside the point. What they didn't know wouldn't hurt them, as both Aoi Todo and Jin Monzo entered into a stance, both of them preparing to face off against each other. Kyoto and Kosuke were both rooting for Jin. After all, that was their sibling. They also noticed surprisingly quite a lot of people were actually voting for Jin right now, as Kyoto then said,
"Wow, your friend is really not liked. I'm not going to lie, even I feel a little bit bad now."
Though thankfully Todo did have a couple of supporters. Reggie, Remy, Nanako, as well as Hazunoki were all rooting for Todo. This was mainly because they just knew Todo and they didn't really know Jin that well, or like at all. But Nanako had also just gotten used to Todo and kinda liked his vibe by this point, so she was gonna go with him. Gojo was also rooting for Todo, mainly because Todo was the only person he knew. He didn't actually know Jin. Finally, Akari and Kirara were also voting for Todo, mainly because Todo kinda reminded Kirara of Akari, and Akari saw a lot of himself in Todo, and he liked himself, so obviously he was gonna root for him. The only 2 that were left conflicted were Yuji and Choso, though Choso to a much lesser extent, who was leaning closer towards rooting for Jin. After all, they both considered them their brothers. Now that Yuji's getting another idea. Instead of cheering on one or the other, he was going to try his best to cheer on both. And that was when Mei called for them to begin, as Jin made the first move, lifting up both of his hands and releasing a rapid burst of fire, one so large that it tripled over his own body. Jin was more so doing that as the opening move, wanting to see what Todo would do in order to counter that. And were most likely to expect Todo to teleport out the way, he instead just chose to jump over the burst of flame before he began to rush right towards Jin. Todo's goal was to force Jin into hand-to-hand combat. He could tell that Jin wasn't a hand-to-hand type like he was, as Todo quickly rushed in order to try and close the distance between them, attempting to land a kick right on Jin's head, but Jin lifted up both of his arms, using it to block the kick. Todo was able to feel immediately that Jin's body was much hotter, leading to him realizing that grappling against Jin was not an option. After all, he could rapidly increase the heat of his body, which meant as long as he was holding on to him, he was going to take even more damage. But he didn't have much time to focus as Jin opened up his other hand, before firing out a burst of fire right towards him. This one was on the smaller end, but Todo quickly reinforced his body with cursed energy, using that to lessen the damage as he was launched backwards. As Jin then began to rapidly punch the air, using each punch to launch out a big fireball right towards Todo's direction. And this actually kind of reminded Todo of when he battled against Jogo so long ago. Though Todo had to admit, dodging his fire was actually a bit harder than dodging Jogo's fire. But Todo knew he'd need to get adjusted to this. After all, Sukuna was someone who could rapidly launch out attacks. But Todo had a way around this. He actually wasn't too focused on the fire coming towards him. Instead, Todo was focused on the cursed energy surrounding his arm. Anytime that cursed energy moved even slightly, it was a signifier that fire was about to start moving, and for Todo to prepare himself to move. Leading to Todo being able to duck and start moving around several of the bursts of fire, using that trick to predict what Jin was doing even before the fire was launched out. While it was standard practice for sorcerers to use cursed energy reinforcement to predict moves, this was something entirely different. After all, this was a step above that. It was using cursed energy reinforcement to predict cursed technique usage. And this was actually something that Gojo in particular explained to Yuji, telling him that he should try his best to figure out some way to replicate what Todo is doing. And right as another blast of fire was being fired out, Todo suddenly clapped his hands, using that to swap places with that fire, before landing a punch right on Jin's gut, catching Jin completely off guard. But Aoi Todo wasn't done yet. He was going to take full advantage of the fact he closed the distance now, as he then uppercutted Jin on the chin, and he released a rapid flurry of blows on Jin all at once, each one of them connecting and landing on his body, ending with a hard kick to the chest. And Jin had to admit, he was surprised that each of these blows were as heavy as they were. He hadn't expected Aoi Todo to hit with such force. After all, he was a non-enhanced sorcerer like the rest of them, and he wasn't a special grade either. But Jin was realizing that he underestimated Todo in quite a bit, and he apologized for doing so. As Jin then said, "I apologize for holding back my firepower. I think I'm going to go all out from here." And as Todo was attempting to close the distance between them, Jin suddenly lifted up his hand, and it ignited, releasing a massive stream of fire right towards Todo's direction. But this one was different. The previous fire that Jin was using was red in color, but this was blue, showing the heat difference between the two fires. And Todo, seeing that heat difference, immediately led to him clapping and swapping places with one of the fire blasts that had hit a wall earlier, using that to just narrowly avoid that massive wave of flames. Todo, though, was in a good spot when fighting against someone like Jin. After all, Jin's technique made a lot of things swappable for him, considering how much fire and by extension curse energy was spread all over the place. But Todo could also feel that Jin's firepower was immense. He most definitely did not want to get hit by one of those attacks. If Todo was being honest, he was kinda happy they were on their side. But still, this was a sparring match. Todo was going to need to find another way around this. As Jin then lifted up both of his hands, before he started to rapidly spin around, turning himself into a cyclone of flames, constantly producing flames as streams. This is a pretty good counter to Todo's technique. After all, Todo couldn't really swap places with that fire stream. Even if he did, he'd just be hit by the next part of the stream. But still, Todo was starting to analyze. He was starting to look through and try and find any cracks he could. But there was one decent crack in his armor. Jin had one pretty big weakness. He knew he could only fire flames out through 3 spots, through both of Jin's arms as well as his mouth. Of course, he also knew that Jin could propel himself with fire, but it didn't seem like he could use those as attacks. As Todo then got an idea. While he was running around in order to try and avoid the stream of fire, he suddenly focused even more curse energy towards his legs, using that in order to make several cracks within the ground. And as parts of the rubble flew out from that force, he ended up catching the rubble, doing this completely unnoticed by Jin. As Todo then threw several pieces of the rubble, throwing one of it through the fire, while at the same time he threw one of them near Jin's leg. As Todo then clapped, appearing behind the stream of fire as he began to rush right towards Jin. When Jin saw Todo's move, he clapped both of his hands together, firing out a massive stream of fire that took up half of the entire battlefield, all in an attempt to make a move that Todo wouldn't be able to dodge. But then a clap could be heard, as Todo swapped places again with one of the rocks he had thrown earlier, specifically swapping places with the rock that he had thrown near Jin's leg, as he focused a large amount of curse energy right towards his leg, before landing a kick right on the back of Jin's head. That blow caused Jin to feel like his entire head was ringing, but he was quick to shake it off, as he quickly looked behind him and focused fire right towards his fist. Jin's entire fist was suddenly ignited with a blue flame, focusing it down towards his fist to increase the power even more, launching out using the fire to propel his own fist, landing a hard punch right on Todo's chest before releasing that burst of fire in order to launch Todo backwards. Or at least that was the intention, as he suddenly felt an arm grab onto him, and out from the blue fire Todo rose out, using curse energy to reinforce his body entirely. This most certainly hurt. He was certainly not going to be able to take another hit like that, as he then used Jin's arm to pull him in and landed a punch right on his face, sending Jin rocketing backwards before he clapped and swapped places again, swapping places with some of the fire that Jin had produced earlier. And he grabbed Jin by the back of his head from behind, before slamming him hard into the ground. And with that, Aoi Todo was announced as the winner of that match, before he quickly went over to Shoko in order to get healed. After all, Todo did just take quite a bit of burns, and he knew if he didn't get healed now, that would hurt a lot. But Jin gave him a thumbs up. He was definitely impressed. This did also answer something else for Jin. If this wasn't the sparring match, he most certainly would have won that fight. But he felt both him and Todo definitely had some potential to work together quite well, especially with a curse technique like that as well as the brain of Aoi Todo. That was his real weapon, Todo's massive amount of IQ and intelligence. No wonder Yuji liked him so much. Though Todo told Jin that he needed to work a little bit more on his close range and hand-to-hand combat. After all, that seemed to be a little bit of a weakness that he had right now, something the two of them would definitely be able to work with each other over this month. And the crowd absolutely enjoyed the fight, though some of them weren't really happy with the outcome because they did actually want Todo to lose, but at the same time others were happy with it. It was a pretty good fight. As Kotsuke, Kamo, and Choso all entered into the training ground, they were all pretty hyped up from watching Todo and Jin's fight. As Kotsuke then raised up her hand, manipulating a large wave of water in order to wash over a lot of the flame, before calling it back to herself, making a small ring of water around her body, compacting all of that water they had just used. Kamo and Choso both knew they were going to be at a disadvantage. Not just was Kotsuke much stronger than the both of them, but they also had access to a water curse technique, the perfect counter to any blood manipulation user. It was why Kamo didn't even bother bringing out a Shikigami. not to mention the fact they both knew that she was competent enough to at least challenge Yuta Akotsu. But it was a 2-on-1, they felt they did have a pretty good chance against her. And while Kotsuke was tempted to summon a Shikigami for a moment, she chose not to. She was curious to see how well she could do in a 2v1. As both Kamo and Choso begun, Choso stepping backwards in order to make some distance, while at the same time Kamo rushed right towards them, Kamo's blood arms immediately beginning to make hand signs, as he activated flowing red scale stack, also using his hand signs in order to give himself a boost of speed temporarily. While at the same time Choso was now starting to chant, as Kamo attempted to land a punch right on Kotsuke's face, but at the last moment Kotsuke was able to lift up the water in order to block the blow. As she blinked, she was caught off guard by how fast that blood manipulation had just made them. Her mind started to race. She wondered if there was some way for her to do that for herself as well. As Kamo quickly jumped into the air, before Choso fired out a piercing blood right towards her direction. And this piercing blood was insanely fast, far faster than the ones he used in Shibuya, leading to Kotsuke being forced to reinforce her shoulder where it would have landed. She had no time to block this piercing blood whatsoever, but she had to admit this: compression of blood was significantly more powerful than she was expecting, especially with those chants infused into it. So there was definitely a way for her to replicate that move. After all, it was in liquid form. But still, she was pushed back quite a bit by that blow, as Kamo's blood arms finished making another batch of hand signs, before he threw down 2 slicing exorcism discs right towards Kotsuke. But this was much easier for her to counter, as the water wing launched out several pellets right towards the slicing exorcisms, coagulating the blood rather fast and messing up its form. Kamo then realized in that moment he was only going to be able to go close range against Kotsuke. After all, he wasn't like Choso or Yuji where he could use reverse curse technique to heal himself and make more blood. But he still had another advantage in the way he could fight. After all, he was able to see that Kotsuke was only barely able to react to him amplifying himself with chants using flowing red scale stack. This meant Kamo definitely had some advantages on her when it came to physical body. His role was going to be rather simple: make some openings so Choso would be able to land ranged attacks. As Kotsuke raised up her hand, having the water ring launch out several tentacles of water right towards Kamo's direction, while at the same time she looked over to Choso, as she lifted up her other hand, launching a large burst of water right towards Choso's direction, which is the Choso's chance being interrupted and forcing him to move out the way. But Kamo was also quick to counter, as he made a small blood platform underneath himself and used it to push himself out of the way of the burst of water coming towards him, landing on his feet, while at the same time his blood arms finished making their hand signs once more, telling Kamo that he was prepared to rush at her again, as this time he was moving at full speed, attempting to land a punch on her gut. And while Kotsuke was fast enough to reinforce her curse energy to take the blow, she wasn't fast enough this time to block with her water, leading to Kotsuke being pushed backwards as Kamo began his own assault. Or at least Kamo tried to, but Kotsuke lifted up both of her hands, sending water towards him like whips, leading to Kamo having to be forced to dodge. However, with the hand signs amping him, it was much harder to dodge it in comparison with it. But that was something Kotsuke took advantage of. After all, she was no slouch in hand-to-hand herself, as she quickly attempted to close the distance between herself and Kamo, palm striking him straight in the gut. And while it did definitely wind Kamo a bit, it didn't stop him from attacking, which was kicking her in the side, launching her back by a couple of feet. As Kamo began to rush after her, the two of them exchanging several blows in hand-to-hand. Though Kamo had several distinct advantages in this hand-to-hand clash, one of the big ones was the fact that he did have 4 arms. And while he was mainly focused on making them make hand signs, he was still able to use that in order to cause some blows when he saw some openings. But more importantly, he just had significantly more formal training in comparison to Kotsuke, leading to him having a lot more hand-to-hand advantages and experience. But Kotsuke was somewhat making up for it, both using water in order to substitute as well as her own reinforcement which was superior to Kamo's. She was somewhat able to keep up, as during one of the moves she quickly moved her head out of the way, using it in order to avoid one of Kamo's blows, elegantly spinning around the blow as she moved her hand onto Kamo's side before releasing a compressed wave of water right on his body. As she then surrounded her fist in water, preparing to follow that up with another attack, until suddenly she felt a disturbance in the air, as several, no, tens of blood arrows began to rain down on her all at once. Kotsuke then raised up 2 of her fingers, as out from her finger a large burst of water rose out, before it shaped into a bubble around her body, using it in order to catch several of the arrows. This was a new application that she had recently come to, one she was still working on after her battle with Yuta Akotsu in Sendai. As Kotsuke then said, "Here, you can have these back," before the bubble then popped, releasing the arrows all around her instead, launching them as an AoE attack towards both Choso and Kamo, stacked as well with her own potent levels of water control, and it made the arrows go even faster than they were before. Both Kamo and Choso were quick to counter via using their own variations of slicing exorcisms. And that was when Kotsuke raised up her hand, as all of the water she shot out during this battle began to fly back to her, forming into 2 rather large arrows before they compressed down, as she then raised both of her arms up like finger guns. And the arrows quickly launched towards both Kamo and Choso. These attacks were significantly stronger than any of the water attacks that Kotsuke had performed so far, as Kamo at the last moment had his blood arms do some hand signs. He even began to chant himself. Choso was in a similar boat where he was also chanting, but suddenly the sound of a heartbeat could be heard echoing all throughout the area, and it was a rather familiar one to most of them. Choso utilizing flowing red scale burst. while at the same time Choso hardened his own blood, while Kamo lifted up the other 2 blood arms, and both of them blocked the water arrow. But even though they were capable of blocking it, it did significant amounts of damage, even with all the reinforcement they put in to make sure it wouldn't. Which was when Kotsuke then said, "I'd recommend we call it here. After all, it took everything you guys had to block those arrows, and no offense to you guys, I can make more of those. But it was a lot of fun to spar against you." As much as she did want to see more, she kinda knew this was the best place to call it off. Furthermore, she also knew that she couldn't really fight against them going all out, mainly because she did have a massive advantage against them when it came to preventing a lot of their ranged options. And in truth, it just didn't feel that fair for her. She wanted this to be a learning experience for her, though it definitely succeeded in that as well. And she was just happy that she was able to test out that brand new move she had been working on, though she knew she had to work on that a bit more. In particular, Kamo had given her some ideas. After all, having additional arms in order to make hand signs for you was a really good idea. Not to mention what piercing blood was also a good move. And with that, the 3 of them stepped off the battlefield, leading us to our final group of people to spar. Gojo Satoru will be battling against Nobara Kugasaki and Yuji Itadori. As Gojo told them, "I won't be having Infinity protect me, by the way. I don't feel like you guys would improve that much if I just had a barrier around me that doesn't let me get hit." His 6 eyes staring down both Nobara and Yuji, he had been able to tell they had both improved massively. Yuji by this point was in the same level of heavy hitters like Yuta, Akotsu, and Akari Kinji at full power. Gojo was pretty certain that if the 3 of them were to fight without their domain expansions, Yuji would definitely win. Since, well, Yuji didn't have a domain expansion yet. But still, he had a feeling that once Yuji did awaken his domain expansion, he was likely to be the strongest of his students, at least right now. Though he had a feeling Yuta would be able to catch up to him pretty soon. However, what was even more intriguing to them was Nobara. While Nobara wasn't on the level of a special grade sorcerer, she might actually have that potential to reach it in the future. Right now, Nobara was stronger than most of the people Gojo would classify as a grade 1, other than Aoi Todo as well as Kamo, though both of them had sort of already surpassed level of grade 1. The only other person who's a grade 1 that he could think of that's stronger than Nobara would of course be Naobito. And maybe Naoya, but he wasn't too sure about that one. Furthermore, someone else was also watching with intrigue, that person being Kashimo. Sure, he had no intention nor plan to cheer for Nobara, but at the same time he did see some of Nobara's growth. He saw what Nobara was capable of when they fought, so he was curious to see what she would be capable of now. Yuji and Nobara both knew what their plan was going to be. Yuji was going to be on the front while Nobara acted as support, as Yuji began to activate Flowing Red Scale Stack. But then everyone began to hear something else, what sounded like a drum beating, though it was a lot more faint than usual. What Yuji was doing right now was a lessened version of Flowing Red Scale Burst, an in-between state between Flowing Red Scale Stack and Flowing Red Scale Burst, one he could keep active for significantly longer periods of time. Something he unlocked during his battle against Sukuna. After all, he had taken some inspiration from Sukuna in order to perform this. Though Gojo was also able to notice something else a little bit faint in Yuji's cursed energy. It was something he was going to bring up later, but it was rather interesting to him, as Gojo raised his own arms, preparing to face off against both of them. This time though, Yuji and Nobara actually had a noticeable amount of the crowd completely cheering for them. Granted, a lot of the crowd didn't really like Gojo, and the ones that did like Gojo liked Yuji and Nobara more. The second they were allowed to begin, suddenly Yuji closed the distance between himself and Gojo, a dust cloud following right behind Yuji's movements. As he attempted to start this battle off by trying to land a punch right on his face, but Gojo was able to redirect the blow, using it in order to redirect Yuji away from himself. And while this did catch Yuji off guard, he was quick to readjust himself, before Gojo then lifted up his hand, signaling for Yuji to come at him again and try his best. All the while Nobara was beginning her own setup move. She was starting to move all across the entire battlefield, planting down nails all across. Those little trap that she had in mind was going to take a little bit of time, so she was going to need to rely on Yuji for a little bit for this to work. Yuji was able to see that, so he decided he was going to make the distraction, as a total of 4 blood wings rose out from his back. A part of him was tempted to make a wave of steam, but he knew Gojo would be able to see through it with his 6 eyes. That was the little details Gojo was capable of seeing. And Gojo blinked. He had no idea that Yuji could even make blood wings before now, let alone 4 of them. Before Yuji's blood wings then flapped, releasing a massive wave of blood arrows right towards Gojo's direction, while Yuji followed right after them. Each of the blood arrows had a steam coming off of it as well, showing just how hot they actually were. But Gojo slightly raised his finger up, causing part of the ground to be surrounded by his Limitless, before it lifted up, using that in order to shield himself from the blood arrows. And seeing this did catch Yuji a little bit off guard. After all, he never saw Gojo actually use Limitless on other things other than himself. Before Gojo then pointed behind Yuji, as another blue orb appeared behind him. And Yuji suddenly felt the suction force of the blue orb pulling him into it, as well as pulling in that large slab of stone that Gojo had just used in order to shield himself. But instead of Yuji trying to resist against the pull force, he decided to use that to his advantage, as he clamped his hands together, firing out a piercing blood right towards the wave of rocks, destroying it in that move, while at the same time he quickly saw himself flying towards the blue orb, and he redirected his momentum, using it to circle around it and slingshot himself off, creating 2 supernovas just to add an additional boost in order to escape the pull of the blue. And Gojo couldn't help but smirk a bit. It had been a while since someone actually managed to escape the pull of his blue. The last person who managed to do that was Toji. Granted, Gojo did know he could have increased it, but still, it was rather impressive. As Yuji then opened up both of his hands, creating 2 slicing exorcism discs, each of them with a high amount of steam coming off of them, before he threw both of them right towards Gojo's direction and chased right after them. Gojo, seeing both attacks coming, chose instead to jump towards them, as he spun in between them, using a small space in between in order to move through it, before he attempted to land a hard palm strike right onto Yuji's chest. However, Yuji was just barely able to deflect it and push it out the way, as Yuji then used his other finger to move it back slightly, causing both of the slicing exorcism discs that he had launched out earlier to fly right back towards Gojo's back. But Gojo was able to sense what was coming, as he quickly moved out of the way of the slicing exorcism discs, but even though he moved out of the way of it, he did feel a slight burn land on his body. Those discs were dangerous, even getting near it would end up causing burn damage towards an opponent. As well, the slicing exorcism returned back to normal blood, going straight into Yuji's wings that increased for a moment before they compressed back down to its original size. And as Gojo landed, he suddenly felt something fly past his neck, a nail that he narrowly dodged. And when Gojo tried to look around to see where Nobara was, he was able to see she was incredibly far away, about 300 feet or so away from him. But more importantly, there were also several nails floating all across the area, and several of them were rocketing right towards Gojo. And Gojo was starting to rapidly move, repeatedly dodging each and every single one of the nails that were coming right towards him. But Yuji also wasn't done yet either, as Yuji clamped his hands together, firing out a piercing blood right towards Gojo's direction, following that up with tens of blood arrows as well. While the blood arrows weren't anywhere near as fast in comparison to piercing blood, it was still additional damage. And with Gojo seeing this massive wave of attacks coming right towards him, he had another idea, as a blue orb appeared right beside him, and he waved his hand in a circular motion. All the attacks at once were pulled right towards the blue orb, as well as parts of the ground itself, making a large rip and circle in the ground itself, creating a massive wave of dust that Gojo was currently standing inside. And Yuji rushed right into that wave of dust, opening his hand and creating a blood edge, while at the same time he scattered some of his blood around the area inside of the dust cloud. As Yuji began to attempt to land a barrage of slices right on Gojo, but Gojo was able to dodge each one of them rather casually, before he landed a hard punch right on Yuji's stomach. But Yuji felt something rather odd with that punch. It didn't just feel like a normal punch, no, it felt like his body was being pulled into that punch alongside it rushing towards him, winding Yuji in that blow. As Yuji blinked, he had never felt a blow land this hard on him before, with the only exception being the blow that Sukuna landed on him when he took over his body. However, pain wasn't going to stop Yuji Itadori, mainly because it set Gojo up exactly where he wanted him to be, as he grabbed onto Gojo's hands before his blood wings changed shape once more, wrapping around Gojo's arms in order to hold him down. And Yuji said a new chant, one that none of the others recognized other than Choso: Blood, Nebula, Compression. As several supernovas rose up around Gojo, each one of them about the same size as a fingertip, showing their level of compression, being amped up by the chant that Yuji just performed, one for supernova. As each rapidly exploded around both Yuji and Gojo, Yuji was expending his own body in order to make sure Gojo got hit, leading to both Yuji and Gojo being pushed away from each other, as Gojo dusted himself off. He had reinforced his body with curse energy in order to take the blow. He had to admit, though, he was surprised that Yuji managed to pull this off. As a smirk rose onto Gojo and he said, "I think I've been on the defensive for a little bit too long now. Time to swap some things up." As Gojo suddenly vanished, appearing right in front of Yuji, using blue in order to move at full speed right towards him. However, to Gojo's surprise, Yuji was actually able to track his movements. Yuji had purposely increased his reaction time while using Flowing Red Scale Burst. Now, this was originally to combat against Sukuna, since he did know there was a likely chance Sukuna was still going to be severely faster than him, but it definitely was going to work well against someone like Satoru Gojo as well, leading to Yuji just narrowly moving out of the way of a punch from Gojo. But now it was Yuji's turn to be forced on the defensive, as Gojo and Yuji exchanged several blows. Each blow was being blocked by Yuji, but even though Yuji was able to block each of the blows, it felt like a shockwave was ringing through his body. Even though he was blocking each of the hits, they hit rather hard, as Gojo used one of his arms to pull Yuji's arm down, while he lifted his other arm and palm struck Yuji hard in the gut. As Gojo then leaned closer and told him, "You left yourself open," before palm striking Yuji again and again and again. However, on the third palm strike, he hit something rather hard. Yuji managed to activate blood armor at that last moment, and Gojo had to admit it was quite an impressive defense. And Yuji then clapped his hands together right in front of Gojo's face. He had taken this time to start mumbling some chants. Now, of course, Gojo was more than aware of what Yuji was doing, but he chose not to interfere. He was curious to see what Yuji's plan was, as a red steam emitted from Yuji's hand, while at the same time he fired a piercing blood at close range right at Gojo. This blood steam was rather hot. It was the same one that was around the slicing exorcisms from earlier. Just by existing inside of the steam, it was burning at Gojo. But Gojo was able to move out of the way, quickly using blue in order to warp himself out of the way. You could see that was definitely a rather potent attack, and against someone like Sukuna it would be incredibly advantageous. But then suddenly around Gojo, a total of 3 small blood orbs rose out, while at the same time 3 nails rocketed right towards his back. as Nobara and Yuji both attempted to land an attack on him. Nobara tried to land Crucifix while Yuji was trying to land Supernova. But Gojo vanished, crossing his fingers and disappearing right before they could land. But that was when Yuji got another idea, one that Nobara was nearly immediately able to pick up on. As Yuji began to increase his heartbeat even more, this was going to be their finishing move, and he was going to do a full power flowing red scale burst. As at the same time Nobara threw one of her nails right towards Yuji, as Yuji began to focus a large amount of cursed energy around his fist. And once Gojo saw that, he had to admit he was intrigued, as he thought to himself, did they find a way to combine each other's strengths? And a proud smile rose onto him, as Yuji rushed right towards Gojo, and attempted to land a punch right on him, Nobara's nail right in between his fingers. Gojo remembered hearing the flowing red scale burst all the way back in Goodwill, and he was proud to see just how far Yuji had mastered it. Furthermore, Nobara's refinement and curse energy had also reached brand new heights. As at the same time Yuji attempted to land that punch, Nobara activated Hairpin, with curse energy erupting from the nail and launching right towards Gojo's direction, and Gojo was pushed quite a few feet backwards, even surprisingly taking a little bit of damage from that attack. Damage he was rather quick to heal off, as he smiled a bit and gave them both a proud smile, before clapping and teleporting Nobara right back over to them. As he told him this was a good sparring match, he was proud to see how far both his students had gotten. And both Yuji and Nobara smiled to each other. They were proud to see how far they had gotten as well, to have their progress acknowledged by their mentor. And this was only just the start. Who knew how strong they were going to get through this month? About a day or two after the sparring match, Gojo decided to take Yuji aside. After all, he did want to talk to Yuji about some things, and he did also want to experience some more training with him, leading to Gojo making a recommendation for Yuji who his final swap should be with. The main thing that Yuji was missing right now was a domain expansion, and while Kusakabe would definitely offer some help with that with barrier experience, he did have one other person he wanted Yuji to swap with to get even more experience. While at first he was thinking Yuta Akotsu, he decided against that, mainly because he felt Yuta Akotsu might have some better swaps with other people. But he ultimately decided on one of their best domain users here, Hikari Kinji, someone who has amazing skill in domains, especially when it comes to clashing, and if they were going to go up against Sukuna, that would definitely be necessary. However, that led to Yuji deciding to ask Gojo a question of, why not just swap with him? Wouldn't Gojo have just as much, if not even more, domain experience and skill in comparison to Hikari? And Gojo said that while that was most certainly true, he did want Yuji to swap with Hikari for another reason, as he then said, see, I want you guys to all become the strongest, to surpass me in your own different types of ways. But I want at least one of you to do it in different steps from me. I want one of you guys to develop strength completely different from my own. And hearing that, Yuji understood. Those did also partially lead into the conversation of how Gojo did want the world to move on from him, for this new generation to completely replace him and for him to be forgotten if he did end up dying in this battle, leading to Yuji telling him that none of them would ever forget Gojo. After all, Gojo was their loved ally. And Gojo was honestly quite happy to hear that. And then about a week or two would pass. Gojo had just finished executing the higher-ups. Everyone had finished their first round of switch training and was preparing to move on to the second round. And while Yuta Akotsu was having his discussion on how he should become the next monster if Gojo died and he should take on Gojo's body, Yuji was in another room. In this room were each of Yuji's siblings, including Aoi Todo. Alongside those siblings there was Nobara, Kamo, and Nanako, people who had gotten somewhat close to those siblings, in specific Nobara and Nanako in particular. Though Kamo had also gotten pretty close to Tanzo by this point. Maki would have been here, but she was a little bit busy in the moment. By this point in time, they had figured out how to separate the soul from the body, and now it's time for Yuji's siblings to be free from their vessels. And it's said for them to have a brand new vessel, Yuji Itadori. Now some of them were a little bit more hesitant than others, but that was more because they had a final goodbye to say. Shouoso, Naranzo, and Sanzo were each ready to go into Yuji's body already, and Yuji immediately consumed them. Eso and Kechizu told Choso they'd be seeing him soon, and they would make a sea for him in the mental space while they waited, before they joined their brothers being consumed as well. Up next was Shoso the Gargoyle, as he went over to Nobara and told him that he had a lot of fun with her entering into Hikari's place, fighting a bunch of people, and while he was going to live on through Yuji, it was going to be a little bit sad that he wouldn't be able to interact with her that much anymore. Shoso and Nobara shared a fist bump. They had to admit they had some fun with each other and some fun times. While they didn't know each other for too long, they didn't regret their time. Tanzo though had a little bit more of a personal experience with Kamo, as he told Kamo they had a lot of fun fighting against Cursed Naoya. And if you ever fight someone like Cursed Naoya again personality-wise, make sure to land a punch on them for him. But Tanzo did also tell Kamo one more thing. He tried his best in order to help guide Kamo through how to use their combination technique on their own. After all, Kamo was also a blood manipulator, and he had the ability to naturally heat up his own blood. Sure, it wasn't to the same degree Tanzo could, but he felt it could be possible. Kamo just needed to learn some reverse curse technique from the switch training which he was already doing, and bam, he'd be able to do it. So they gave each other a fist bump that led into a hug. Before Tanzo did one final action, he took off his cloak and he gave it to Kamo, something to remember Tanzo by, before he separated from his vessel and became one with Yuji. And finally there was Kotsuzo, who Kotsuzo had a very personal experience with Todo. After all, him and Todo are the same type. And something that all the siblings were realizing in that moment was they all had the exact same type. as Kotsuke thought to herself, is this genetic? Granted, she also didn't really know what her type was and she needed to think about that one more, but that was beside the point. She could definitely figure that one out later. As Kotsuke told Todo that he was trusting Todo to look after his younger brother. Todo gave him a thumbs up and told him that he'd be the best brother he can be. And with that, Yuji consumed his final sibling. He consumed Kotsuke, leaving a total of 8 vessels who were each taken back to the hospital while they were still knocked out. After all, they were still alive and just had a life to return to. They had no idea what their lives were before this, but they had a life to return to now. As Yuji closed his eyes, and he could feel it. He could feel the presence of all 8 of his brothers within him. But he also felt something else that he hadn't noticed before. Now that he was a lot more in tune with his body and more importantly the dreamscape, he could feel the dreamscape was a lot lighter in comparison. And while at first he had no idea why, he was starting to realize something else. Sukuna beforehand had access to the dreamscape, but he doesn't have access to it anymore, which that was most definitely going to be helpful. To be honest, it wasn't even something he had thought about beforehand, but knowing that he didn't was definitely going to be helpful for them. But Yuji could also feel it. He could feel the experience of his brothers, the power of them flowing through him. While the power buff itself wasn't that much for Yuji, what was significantly more important was the experience buff. He didn't have access to all of the experience of his brothers yet, but he could feel it flowing through him. He could feel it becoming one with his own body. Furthermore, he could also feel the rot technique flowing through him. He could tell that he was going to become a lot stronger, as he made a promise to himself. He wasn't going to let his brother's sacrifice be in vain. As Kotsuke, Jin, Kyoto, Todo, and Choso each approached Yuji, with Kotsuke asking if Yuji could feel his siblings in there and Yuji nodding. He can feel their presence, he can hear their thoughts. They're each quite comfortable, but still, they all had a long way to go. Both Nobara and Nanako smiled to themselves as well. They were happy to see that the brothers were comfortable in there. After all, they did get to know some of them quite well, especially considering they had an entire week or 2 to spend with them when they were trying to fight off cursed spirits. Kamo also told him that he was going to do whatever he could to try and help out his former student. Though if he was being honest, Yuji probably didn't really need his guidance anymore. By this point, Yuji had far since surpassed him. And Yuji shook his head, as he told Kamo that while he might be stronger than him now, he felt that Kamo's insight still might be able to help. After all, he did get quite a bit more details from the Kamo clan. He saw what he was capable of in that battle, especially with the usage of those 2 extra arms. And that was something that would definitely be of assistance for him if he could learn how to do that. And all of them vowed together that they were going to get stronger together. They were going to make sure that their sibling's sacrifice, their friend's sacrifice, wasn't going to be in vain. And that no matter what, they were going to bring Megami back. Though the brothers currently inside of Yuji's soul were starting to notice something a little bit weird. There was something off about Yuji's body, something they didn't recognize before, but now that they were actually directly inside, they could see it. As we now pass a couple more days. During this time, Yuji got more and more experience, more and more training with his siblings, as well as some training with Hikari's domain. He just finished doing his swap training with Hikari in order to get more and more experience with his domain expansion. Hikari's domain had some weird properties, one that made it much easier to train his domain in comparison to others, mainly because his domain allowed him to refresh himself after each jackpot, making it significantly easier for it to be trained even in comparison to other domains through switch training. And right now is about a day after that. Currently, Yuji, Jin, Kyoto, Kotsuke, as well as Nobara were kind of chilling in a room. In a lounge right now, just sitting down and taking a break from their training. And while they were chilling, a thought had occurred for Kyoto.
So, I just kind of realized something. Now that Yuji has 8 people living inside of him, doesn't that make dating other people really awkward?
And hearing that question caught everybody completely off guard, especially Yuji. Though, the others did think about it a little bit more, other than Nobara, who didn't really care if she was being honest, but she also was starting to think about it a little bit more. As Kotsuke then said, well, dating anyone is kinda awkward for being a Jujutsu sorcerer. I mean, our world is kinda crazy. We have to fight against negative embodiments of emotions. So unless someone's already aware of a sorcery world, it's gonna be awkward no matter what. And before they could continue the conversation, somebody else walked in. Or well, a couple people walked in. Those people being Yuta and Meimei. Yuji was a bit thankful they walked in. After all, this was not something that he really wanted to think about or even had thought about till now, so he would prefer not to think about it and continue not thinking about it. At the same time, Todo and Kamo also both walked in, carrying some food each. It was their turn to get food while everybody else was taking a break from training. But seeing that both Yuta and Meimei had entered, they realized they had walked in on something serious as they left the food on the table for everybody to eat while they were talking. And it was most definitely a rather serious topic because Yuta had some news for all of them. Gojo Satoru had recently confirmed something. Within Yuji's body was the engravement of Shrine. Ryomen Sukuna's curse technique had been engraved onto Yuji, and while they did have one of Sukuna's final fingers left, they did have another plan. Rather than having Yuta consume that finger, they wanted to consume one of Yuji's fingers instead. That way they'd be able to use Shrine against Sukuna. And while most of them thought this was good news, Yuji was actually not that happy to hear that. Not because he'd be losing a finger, but because of something else. After all, hearing that he had the potential to awaken Shrine immediately worried him because that meant something else was possible. Which slowly the other people began to realize, starting with Todo realizing it, and then Kamo, and then Yuta. As Yuji then said, if I have the potential to awaken Shrine because Sukuna's technique was engraved onto my body, that means the same should be said the other way around. Ryoma Sukuna has the potential to awaken blood manipulation, and that was something that none of them had thought about. After all, there was no reason to assume it wouldn't work the same the other way around. But Kamo told them that they shouldn't be as worried about it as they think. After all, there is one advantage that Yuji has that can't be replicated on Sukuna. Producing more blood will cost a lot more for Sukuna in comparison to Yuji. He would have to do it for using reverse curse technique rather than just using curse energy. In other words, he'd have to do it like a normal blood manipulation user rather than how he's used to doing it, since Sukuna still has a human body and Megami. And while that was definitely quite hopeful for them, it still wasn't enough. After all, that was a terrifying thought. But that told them they were going to need to be careful and take out Sukuna as fast as possible. After all, if he awakened blood manipulation while he was at full power with nothing to hold him back, they knew for a fact that nothing on this planet would be able to stop him. 10 shadows, blood manipulation, and the technique and skill of Ryoma and Sukuna all together. Still, they knew they needed to have confidence. They needed to be able to do their best. They couldn't let this deter them. No matter what, they would win. December 23rd, 2018. One day before the fateful battle would come, Ryoma Sukuna was currently sitting down on top of a roof, taking in the scenery of the area they'd be fighting in. He had already consumed the remaining fingers that Urame could find, with one of them missing, a finger that he felt was likely that Gojo had hidden on him. Still, he was able to substitute by consuming the remnants of his body. But he hadn't been slacking off during this time. He had been doing some training himself. After all, Gojo Satoru wasn't going to be the only challenge he would face off against. After Gojo was the 3 people he put as heavy hitters. Yuji Itadori, thanks to his masterful blood manipulation he had access to, he was near certain that Yuji had gotten much stronger over this time. And considering the levels he had grown from that battle with him alone, he was quite curious to see how strong he would be right now. Up next was of course Yuta Akotsu. He had a feeling he would be leading the group. With his immense amount of curse energy that was almost half of his own, as well as the massive amount of curse things he likely had access to through his copy ability since he had already shown off 2 of them, he knew that Yuta Akotsu would be a threat. And finally among those heavy hitters was Maki, someone who couldn't be sensed whatsoever through curse energy means, and had left behind curse energy completely, reaching the absolute maximum physical capability. In particular, Sukuna was actually rather excited to fight Maki, mainly because he never fought a heavenly restriction user like that in the past. Up next was Akari, which he had never seen Akari directly, but the fact he was even comparable to Yuta showed him that he might potentially be a threat. Or Akari might also be put with the next group of people that he had in mind. In that group were people he felt were notably strong, but nowhere near as strong as the heavy hitters. Mainly just with Jin and Kyoto, though he also knew thanks to Kenjaku that Kotsuke had been joining up with their group. And based on Kenjaku's words, Kotsuke was more than likely stronger than the 2 of them, so he put her in that same category. The third category was people Sukuna felt it was necessary to feel a bit cautious about. They wouldn't normally be threats to him, but if he let his guard down for even a second, they might be able to find an exploit to beat him, or at least be very annoying for him to have to deal with. In that category, there were only 4 main people, those 4 of course being Aoi Todo, Higuruma, Nobara, and finally Nanako. Aoi Todo would make fighting sorcerers significantly more difficult, especially with even more of them on the field and with his ability to near instantly sync up with Yuji. Pair that up with Higuruma's Executioner Blade and it would make things certainly much more interesting. With Nobara still being around, he was going to have to make sure that any part of his body that did end up falling off would have to be immediately destroyed. He couldn't risk that getting in her hand. And while Nanako was certainly the weakest of them, she still had one capability that would make her much more annoying: her photos. Considering the tactic they both used against Kenjaku as well as against Jogo to make sure the domains were mistimed, it would be very bad against him. Granted, he did also know that the more powerful the opponent was, the more taxing it was on Nanako's body, so there was a pretty good chance that Nanako wouldn't even be able to do it on him, but he still needed to be cautious nonetheless. And then finally, there was Group 4, the Worthless Fodder. While they were strong, they weren't anywhere near strong enough to be even remotely considered a challenge for him, or something for him to actually look out for, so much so they didn't even feel like listing off their names. But then he sensed something as he looked behind him to see Urame approaching him. As Urame asked Sukuna what exactly was Yuji Itadori. Now of course Urame already knew about the fact that they had all the death paintings infused into his body. That's what allowed him to use all of their abilities. But there was also something else wrong about Yuji. After all, there was no way he should have gotten that much stronger just from Sukuna leaving his body. There was something in Yuji that felt a lot more like Sukuna, which led to Sukuna explaining that Yuji had some blood connection to one of his reincarnations, or well, not his reincarnation, but rather the reincarnation of his twin brother that he ate so long ago, created by Kenjaku in order to become the perfect player for the Culling Games. Jin, Kyoto, as well as Kotsuke were proof that such an experiment was possible, and Yuji was the final result. But that made a terrifying thought enter into Urame, as now they had to question something. Could it be possible that Yuji Itadori has more latent potential than Sukuna due to having the other parts mixed into him? Or maybe those death paintings being mixed in ended up making the mixture impure. Either way, this was something they were going to have to be cautious about. But Sukuna told Urame there was no need to worry about it. After all, they weren't going to be the one to fight Yuji. that would be him. If he doesn't draw into the field, he doesn't want Urame to interrupt. He was now curious to see how far exactly Yuji would be willing to go. December 24th, the day of the Shinjuku Showdown had arrived, the day to decide everything. Ryoma and Sukuna had just finished executing Satoru Gojo, as Hajime Kashimo prepared to face off against the heavily injured Ryoma and Sukuna. And right when Urame dropped down Kamutoke for Sukuna, two people dropped down into the field, Jin and Akari. A sorcerer with fire capabilities as well as Akari Kinji would be perfect to take on someone like Urame, and Sukuna couldn't help but smirk a little bit to himself as he saw Jin. But then Sukuna's focus returned back to Hajime Kashimo. After all, that was his current opponent, as Akari Kinji opened up his domain, taking himself as well as Urame and Jin inside. And while Urame was caught off guard by the massive burst of information entering into their head, Jin was not. One of the big parts of their training they did, since they knew they would be working together in order to deal with Urame, was Hikari spamming his domain usage on him to make sure that he would be prepared for that information overload. And right as Urame was about to try and launch out an attack at Hikari, suddenly they felt a massive wave of fire rush right towards them. Urame just at the last moment was able to create a wall out of ice. But they were able to tell this fire was certainly much stronger in comparison to the last time they saw it back when Sukuna had taken over Megami's body. Sure, they had never directly felt it, but they could sense it. Not to mention its color. The fact it was a blue flame showed its heat, but Urame wasn't out of the clear yet. As out from that blue fire, Urame looked up and saw Jin rushing right down towards them. A massive amount of blue fire now surrounding their fist. Before they punched down, releasing that massive wave of fire right towards Urame at close range. Urame just narrowly on time managed to completely coat their body in ice, quickly chanting as well to amplify said ice. They wanted to make sure they could take little unnecessary damage as possible. But still, Urame was then skidding backwards, as a confident air filled Jin. Jin had one role in this and one role alone, and that was to make sure Urame was going to be defeated. But he was able to see that his training most certainly had paid off. But things were getting even worse for Urame, as suddenly both Jin and Urame began to hear music playing. And Jin smirked a bit as he knew exactly what that music was, before Hikari's domain completely shattered. Hikari had now activated Jackpot, as Hikari's domain completely broke, allowing Hikari, Jin, and Urame to begin to fall to the ground. In front of them was also two other people who were suddenly teleported in, Higuruma Hiromi as well as Yuji Itadori. And that was both Jin and Akari's first chance to get a glance on the King of Curses. And suddenly the both of them were really thankful that their job was taking out Urame and not Sukuna. As Yuji and Jin exchanged a nod with each other, and Jin wished Yuji the best of luck, as Akari and Jin both landed a punch right on Urame, sending Urame flying towards another part of the city as both Jin and Akari chased after them. At the same time that Urame was launched away, Yuji immediately sprouted a pair of blood wings, followed by a secondary pair, immediately activating all four of them right off the bat. While at the same time the faint sound of a heartbeat could be heard. Yuji was now using the upgraded version of Flowing Red Scale that he had created, the in-between bursts of Flowing Red Scale Stack and Flowing Red Scale Burst. And now he was using it so much more proficiently in comparison to before. And Sukuna couldn't help but remember when Yuji had used that back when they had battled a month ago, and also when he had used that against Mahito in Shibuya. And Sukuna's eyes also darted over to Higuruma. He was rather curious to see what he was going to be capable of, especially considering he was the first on the field. As Yuji then immediately flapped all four of his wings, releasing a cascade of blood arrows right towards Sukuna. But Sukuna then pointed Kamutoke down, as a massive thunderbolt landed right on the arrows, evaporating each of them without a second thought. But then he sent several large curse energy signatures from behind him. But they weren't from Yuji, no, they were from Meimei. Meimei was trying to use Bird Strike in order to catch them off guard, using the blood arrows as a distraction, but that also didn't work, as Sukuna then waved Kamutoke behind him, using it to launch another massive lightning bolt right down towards all of the crows at once. And while Meimei was slightly disappointed they couldn't land Bird Strike on them, they weren't too surprised. After all, that move wasn't too effective on monsters. But then suddenly Sukuna had sensed that Yuji had now closed the distance, as he immediately started out by trying to land a hard punch right on Sukuna's chest. But a moment before impact, Sukuna suddenly heard the heartbeat increase even further, the true version of Flowing Red Scale Burst, as Yuji's speed and power increased rapidly. Just narrowly at the last moment, Sukuna was able to block it with his hands. But even with that block, Sukuna ended up feeling a shake through his soul. But that also told Sukuna what Yuji was planning to do. Sukuna knew better than anyone that maintaining the full power of Flowing Red Scale Burst was absolutely impossible. Maintaining at full cost would drain the user of RCT, making them die of a heart attack even with someone like Yuji. So now he was using it at the last moment of attack in order to amplify his speed and power to catch someone off guard. And to think it nearly worked on him. But even more than that, he was now rather confused at what that effect was on his soul. But he didn't have time to focus on that as Yuji began to release a flurry of blows right on Sukuna. With each blow at the last second he activated Flowing Red Scale Burst. He had gotten the hang of it in the 1 month time skip. And Sukuna had to admit he was impressed, as each of the blows were slightly pushing him back. Not by much, of course, but it still was pushing him back a little bit. Though he was still holding back right now because he did want to test this power. before Yuji then jumped backwards as all 4 of his blood wings attempted to stab Sukuna at once. But just narrowly at the last moment, Sukuna was able to jump backwards and avoid it. But as he jumped backwards, several blood orbs began to rise around Sukuna, each of them being a supernova with steam coming off, causing a large amount of burn damage to land on Sukuna, before they each began to rapidly explode all around him. But Sukuna did a simple wave of his hands, making a cyclone of slashes land right around his body, dispersing all the steam at once while also slashing away at the blood. But then suddenly Sukuna felt a rope wrap around his arm, as Higuruma reactivated his domain expansion, declaring that they were going to have a retrial. And Sukuna couldn't help but smirk even more widely. Now he was excited. He was excited to see where this was going to go, and more importantly, what type of sorcerer would sprout from Higuruma's potential. A judgment declared that this court case would be about Itadori Yuji's mass amounts of murder they had committed in Shibuya, with Higuruma declaring that he had evidence that the one who was responsible was Sukuna. And before Higuruma could go on with the rest of this case, Sukuna actually chose to spoke. Don't be so long-winded. I already had heard the rules of the domain, and truth be told, I could care less for this little court case of yours. What I'm more interested in is the sword you wield. A blade with the capability to end anything that gets stabbed by said blade. So, let's hurry this up. I'm guilty. As judgment declared that the punishment that Sukuna would be wielding was confiscation and the death penalty. As all 3 of them returned back to the normal area, Higuruma now wielding the executioner's sword. Alongside them, a total of 7 sorcerers had landed on the field. Kusakabe, Ino, Panda in his gorilla form, Choso, Kotsuke, Kyoto, and finally Hazunoki, all of them landing at the same time. But only Higuruma and Sukuna had realized something. What was confiscated was not Ryomen Sukuna's technique, but rather the tool that Sukuna was wielding, Kamutoke, as slashes were launched out towards each of the sorcerers coming towards him. As Kusakabe just narrowly managed to stand in front of Higuruma, activating Simple Domain, using it in order to shield Higuruma from some of the slashes, but not all of them. And Sukuna looked around. He had to admit he was rather impressed to see all of their reinforcements increase. Everybody here had taken significantly less damage than he expected, though not just did their reinforcement increase, he also sensed something else. All of them, other than Kyoto, was wearing some type of blood armor that Yuji had produced. They were each wearing it underneath their clothes. And it was at that moment Sukuna had realized something, as he looked towards Yuji and smirked. So you've absorbed your other brothers in order to make you stronger. Well, I'll have to admit that is definitely a good move. After all, they were trashed as combatants. Though a shame you didn't absorb that one, he said as he looked over at Choso, as Kyoto's body repaired itself from the slashes. A rage boiled in Yuji, Choso, Kyoto, and Kotsuke. After all, he was now insulting their siblings, which caused Sukuna to smirk even wider, as he said, "At the very least, you've all upped your defenses. Good, good. I'm going to go for your legs next." As the steam emanated from Choso's hands, while he focused his hands together, preparing to fire off a piercing blood, quickly getting a chant off as well in order to amplify a piercing blood to its maximum. As Sukuna smirked and he said, "Actually, let's have a little bit of a race, brat." And the moment Choso fired off that piercing blood, Sukuna vanished from sight. Though as Sukuna was moving towards Choso, he had to admit he was impressed by the speed the piercing blood was moving at. It was nothing too impressive in comparison to him, but it was certainly more impressive than what he was expecting from Choso. Still, he didn't have much interest in Choso. After all, he was just an inferior version of Yuji, as he impaled both of his hands right through Choso's gut. And right when Sukuna tried to throw Choso away, Yuji appeared right on Sukuna's side and attempted to land a hard punch right on his face. At the same time, Kotsuke clapped her hands together and fired a potent and strong water arrow right towards his side. Finally, Kyoto quickly moved to catch Choso, skidding back a couple of feet, as he then said,
"Choso, for now you should heal it off and offer some range support as well as set up some traps. We'll handle Stone Sukuna."
With Kyoto moving back in the battle and Choso moving in order to go heal himself properly, as Sukuna lifted up one of his hands in order to block Yuji's blow, while lifting up the other in order to block Kotoke's water. But even with that, the combined blow managed to push Sukuna back by a couple of feet. He was caught off guard and surprised by that sudden burst of power from the both of them. Sure, he could already tell that those two were the strongest currently on the field, but at the same time he could tell their rage was also amplifying them even further. And once he looked over to Kotsuke, he could see something interesting. 2 more water arms began to manifest from her back. And Sukuna tilted his head, as he thought to himself, "There's no way they figured out a way to replicate my arms." And he was slightly impressed. After all, he knew better than anybody that having 2 arms and a stomach mouth would give the best advantage towards a sorcerer. Now sure, there was no way they'd be able to figure out a way to make a stomach mouth, but making 2 additional arms was insanely impressive. But then he sensed a curse energy coming down from the sky, that being Ino, wielding the cursed tool of Nanami. Nanami himself was far too injured to continue being a sorcerer, but he decided to give this tool to Ino, considering it a tool of retirement. As Sukuna was able to block the blade, but at the last moment Ratio was activated right on his body. The curse technique of Nanami infused into it after Nanami had so much experience with the blade. But still, Sukuna was able to block it rather casually. But right as Sukuna was about to try and kick Ino, a shadow hand moved up in order to block the blow. Now while it didn't fully stop the blow, it did cushion it a bit in order to prevent some damage on Ino. as 4 more shadow hands rose up and wrapped around Sukuna's arms, trying to hold him down, as Panda rushed right towards him in order to use unblockable drumming beats. The curse energy erupted off of Sukuna as he forcefully moved those shadow hands right off of his body, before dodging the unblockable drumming beat and cutting off both of Panda's arms. As Sukuna then grabbed Panda by the back of the head, while looking right over to Ino, as he said, "You and the brat wielding the 7 free curse tool are by far the weakest links here," before throwing Panda right towards Ino, launching them several, no, tens of feet backwards and through one of the buildings. But right as Sukuna was done doing that, 2 shadow hands rose up from the shadows and grabbed onto Sukuna's arms, while at the same time 2 water hands rose around Sukuna's other side, trying to hold him down and still. As Yuji and Kusakabe both rushed for Sukuna's front, aiming to land an attack right on his body. And at the same time, Higuruma came from behind, aiming to try and stab right through Sukuna. But Sukuna's stomach mouth quickly chanted, as he pointed upwards, and a massive wave of slashes was launched all around him, while at the same time Sukuna jumped in the air, before jumping on air again in order to send himself even higher, as all 5 of the fighters were launched backwards and pushed away from each other. But Yuji then clamped his hands together, firing out a piercing blood right towards Sukuna's direction, quickly chanting and changing the shape of his blood wings into arms in order to make hand signs, as it was sent rocketing right towards Sukuna, surpassing even Choso's speed by a significant amount. But Sukuna pointed his hand down, launching a large slash right towards Yuji, the 2 attacks cancelling each other out, and then Sukuna jumped off air again, landing right in front of Higuruma, as he pointed all 4 of his arms backwards, launching slashes right towards all 4 of the other fighters in order to launch them even further away, while at the same time he kicked Higuruma hard in the face. He decided he was going to fight Higuruma one-on-one, but in order to do that for a little bit, he needed to make some space proper. Fortunately, 3 of the 4 of them were wearing the blood armor that Yuji had made for them. Kyoto just barely at the last moment was able to dodge it by going into the shadows. But that little distraction was more than enough for Sukuna to start making distance on Higuruma, as all 4 of them went full speed to try and catch up. However, Yuji was making distance on all of them. After all, he was still the fastest out of the 4 of them, which led to Kusakabe stopping both Kotsuke and Kyoto, as he told the both of them they were going to do some setup for some more plans to back up Yuji. Yuji was a bit too fast for them, but if Yuji could catch up first, he would be able to at least hold off Sukuna for a little bit with Higuruma. The 2 of them nodded as Yuji chased right after Sukuna. Higuruma quickly caught himself as he was thrown right into a building, landing on his hand. He near instantly realized he was separated from the others in the group. This wasn't going anywhere near how they planned it at all, but Higuruma had to adjust. He had to hold Sukuna in one place. As Sukuna then jumped inside of the building, staring right towards Higuruma, but right before he could rush at him, suddenly he heard the sound of a slicing exorcism coming right towards him, one of a massive amount of steam coming off of it, as Sukuna lifted up both of his hands in order to catch the disc. At the same time, the sound of a potent heartbeat could be heard, as Yuji jumped into the building landing next to Higuruma. While Sukuna threw away the slicing exorcism, Yuji lifted up his own hands. Higuruma was happy that he wasn't going to be alone for this battle, and Yuji knew what his role was going to be, make an opening for Higuruma to land. Yuji then heard a voice in his head call, a familiar one, Tanzo. As Tanzo then said, focus blood to different parts of your body before opening them up. Increase the heat of the blood as well. Allow the steam to fill the room. Imagine yourself like a kettle boiling water, one with so much water it couldn't contain it. And the room suddenly began to fill with a mist, as Sukuna recognized exactly what this technique was. It was an extension technique that worked around the premise of heating up one's own blood. It made it near impossible to sense where the caster was, not because they were cloaking their own curse energy, but because there was so much of their curse energy all across the area that it was impossible to sense their direct location. Unfortunately for Higuruma, he did not have that same protection. But still, Yuji knew that so long as he continued to fight on the field, he could make some openings for him. All they needed was for Higuruma to land it once and they would win. But that caused a smirk to rise on Sukuna, as he then said, "You know, this technique only works well when it's a one-on-one matchup, mainly because of one thing, brat. You're not going to let Higuruma die." As without even trying to search for where Yuji might be, Sukuna instead chose to lift up his hand and launch a massive slash right towards Higuruma's direction. Higuruma had nowhere near enough time to dodge. Yuji did have enough time to get in the way of the attack though, and that was exactly what Sukuna had wanted. As Yuji quickly activated Flowing Red Scale Burst to its full potential, using it instead as a speed boost in order to move in front of the attack and block it for Higuruma. This time it was Kotsuzo's turn in order to guide Yuji on how to make a blood armor as powerful as possible, but as a result that it was strong enough to block most of the damage from the slash, though Yuji did still take some damage he ended up healing off. But that was enough time for Sukuna to approach Yuji and immediately punch him in the stomach and the face at the same time with 2 of his arms, before grabbing him by the hair and throwing him right out of the building. As Higuruma saw this as his chance, he apologized for not being able to help Yuji, but this was his only chance to do it, as he attempted to rush right past Yuji and try and stab the Executioner blade right into Sukuna. But at the same time, Sukuna opened up both of his hands, as he launched out a wave of slashes right towards both Yuji and Higuruma. though these wave slashes weren't too powerful, as it did end up causing some damage on Yuji that he was rather quick to heal off. But Yuji was more worried about Higuruma than anything else, but instead out from the dust they saw something else that they weren't expecting. Higuruma Hiromi had now awakened Domain Amplification, using it to lessen the potency of all the slashes that had landed on his body, and making sure that Domain Amplification did not target his hand, that way the Executioner's sword wouldn't have faded. On display now was a man who had equal talent to Satoru Gojo, and Yuji was completely shocked by this. He wasn't expecting Higuruma to awaken Domain Amplification, but since he did awaken it, he knew he could at least rely a bit more on Higuruma to be able to take some blows. But then Sukuna began to speak as a massive curse energy could be felt from him rumbling. Sukuna's interest had now been piqued, as he said, "Higuruma Hiromi, was it?" Before omnidirectional slashes were launched out, completely destroying the entire city block they were in, as parts of the building began to fall to the ground with Yuji, Higuruma, and Sukuna on top of the rubble. Sukuna decided he was going to make this matchup even more interesting, by giving them mobile footing as well as an unstable ground. Higuruma was the first to begin the charge, as he rushed right towards Sukuna, attempting to land a stab right with the Executioner blade onto him. But Sukuna was able to flip in the air, as he was about to try and land a punch right on Higuruma's head, until suddenly Yuji intercepted it by punching Sukuna right in the face. And as Sukuna was being launched backwards, 3 supernovas rose up around Sukuna and immediately started to explode. But before the blood could make contact with them, they were suddenly all sliced right apart. However, that was followed up by another attack, as several water bullets began to launch right towards Sukuna from all directions. And Sukuna sent something that caught him off guard. Kosuke's curse energy signature was in 4 separate directions, but Sukuna was able to realize quite fast what that meant. Kosuke was able to create Shikigami that had her capabilities, though to lesser extents, which must have been what Kosuke was doing while Yuji and Higuruma were fighting against Sukuna. As Sukuna then hopped high off of the air several times, using it in order to avoid each of the water bullets coming towards him, before he launched down 4 slashes in each direction, towards each of the Shikigami that were firing at him. And while 3 of the 4 Shikigami were completely destroyed, one of them was just narrowly able to move their core out the way, using it in order to just barely save themselves on time. And that was when Sukuna landed, as suddenly he felt 2 chains wrap around his arms, both completely made out of shadows. When he looked at the distance, he could see Kyoto currently standing there with his hands inside of the shadows, standing on a rooftop nearby saying several chants, trying his best to make sure this would be as strong as possible to give Higuruma one opening. As Higuruma was sent rocketing right towards Sukuna, moving like a torpedo after Yuji launched him right towards him, with Yuji following right behind Higuruma. The goal of this was quite simple, to try and land this final blow. Sadly, there were still some cards Sukuna had kept rather close to his chest, as his stomach mouth started to chant as well, before Sukuna sliced apart all of the chains that were wrapped around his body. Sukuna then jumped backwards, avoiding the blow of that slash coming right towards him, as his smirk continued to increase. He was getting quite a few good memories right now. If he was being honest, he wished Kenjaku made more hybrids, or at least more of the hybrids succeeded in surviving. That would be a lot more fun. Now, he was still having fun right now, but that could be the potential of having even more fun. As Sukuna then rushed right past Higuruma, heading for Yuji's direction. And Yuji attempted to land a punch right on Sukuna's face once more, but Sukuna used one of his arms in order to grab Yuji's hand, while putting the other right onto Yuji's side, as he launched out a massive amount of slashes right towards his gut. He could already see that Yuji's RCT was beginning to work in order to heal that off, but he wasn't going to give Yuji that much time, as he quickly threw Yuji right towards the direction of Kyoto in order to make him leave that fight. As Sukuna then slowly turned his head right towards Higuruma. He saw Higuruma rush right towards him, trying to use this as an opening to land a final attack. Scale of the Dragon, Recoil, Twin Meteors. All before Higuruma could reach him, Sukuna had created the immense hand sign and done the world-cutting slash, launching it right for Higuruma's right side of his body. Higuruma at the last moment was able to hear those chants, as just barely on time was able to move himself slightly out the way, and while he was able to avoid some of the damage, his arm was completely obliterated, as he felt the blood leak out from his arm. On the other arm, he was trying his best to hold up the Executioner's sword. And Sukuna slowly began to approach him as he launched out another slice right towards Higuruma's body, aimed for his arm, before launching one right for his leg, as Sukuna then said, "Heal yourself. Go on and try. Is this as far as you can go? Next is your head. You'll need reverse curse technique, you know that, don't you? So give it your best shot. Learn how to heal yourself now, or else this will be the end for you." And as Sukuna was approaching him, suddenly on both sides, a water arrow that was heavily compressed down, as well as a piercing blood that was amplified by chance, were both launched towards Sukuna. One from Yuji and one from Kosuke. But Sukuna's stomach mouth then finished another chant, as a powerful slash was launched out at both of the attacks, cancelling them out. But that was when Higuruma attempted to make his final rush, his final attempt to try and stab at Sukuna, trying to stab right into Sukuna's hand that was currently raised. But once the stab landed, that hand was cut off, as Sukuna then opened up his hand with a soft smirk rising. while at the same time the hand that he had cut off was beginning to heal. "I think I've gotten enough entertainment from you." And as Yuji was flying back right at max speed in order to try and save Higuruma, he arrived a little bit too late. But Higuruma still had one final thing that he could do, as he threw up the Executioner Blade right towards Yuji, telling Yuji that he entrusts everything to him. As Yuji caught the Executioner Blade and began to fly at full speed right down towards Sukuna. But Sukuna then jumped backwards, just narrowly avoiding the stab, as the Executioner Blade faded, while Yuji raised up his hands, preparing to face off against the King of Curses. Even though that attempt didn't work, even though the plan of Higuruma didn't work, they still did get some advantages from this. Yuji was able to land several hits on Sukuna, weakening the connection between Megami and his own soul. But more than that, now Kamutoke was gone as well. He'd no longer be able to shoot lightning down at them, which meant all that he had to do now was find a way in order to free Megami. However, that was going to be much easier said than done, as Yuji then began to create a massive amount of blood steam. Now that it was a one-on-one matchup, he was going to take advantage of that, but more importantly, he was doing this for another reason: to give Uyui and Kirara another opening in order to get Higuruma out of here. As Yuji rushed right towards Sukuna, starting to release a flurry of blows, as Sukuna then caught one of Yuji's fists before using that fist to pull him into a smack right on his face. But as Yuji was being launched backwards, he was quick to readjust himself and land on his feet, raising up his arms once more. And when Sukuna looked back towards where Higuruma was, he could see that he was no longer there. He had sent 2 Curse Energy Signatures teleport in order to teleport him out the way, and he realized that Yuji was just a distraction, as around Sukuna 5 supernovas rose out. But Sukuna was quick to hop on air, allowing himself to dodge out of the way of all the supernovas. And as Sukuna was midair, he saw several blood vector lines rushing right towards him, SO now guiding Yuji on how to control each of them. A small ring of blood forming right behind Yuji's back. But Sukuna was quick and nimble even in the air, able to dodge each of the blood vectors coming right towards him as he landed on his feet. However, once Sukuna landed, Yuji noticed something else a little bit different about Sukuna that he wasn't expecting. Sukuna appeared to now be spacing out, as he was remembering back to the words he said towards Kashimo when he had killed him, how he lived his life. And he himself hadn't been changed. He knew he was still the exact same person that he was before, so he was trying to figure out what that feeling was that was bothering him. And Sukuna was now wondering if he had changed over the past 1,000 years. Of course, he had fought people in the past that had the same ideal to kill him, that same desire to kill him, who were willing to die as martyrs, but they never affected him in the same way that Yuji did. But he knew exactly what it was. Yuji did have some level of interest to him. Sure, yes, his blood manipulation capabilities were interesting, but there was something he had grown curious about back in Shibuya. He knew Yuji had an unbreakable soul, but at the same time he also felt rage. He felt anger. It was that same anger and rage that had led to the circumstances of today. After all, if Yuji just gave Mahito a fast death rather than the slow death he was aiming to give him, none of this would have happened. But in spite of all of that, he was able to keep his ideals. What bothered Sukuna about Yuji was the fact that he was able to hold on to his ideals, and use nothing but the strength of will and those ideals in order to get stronger. Sukuna believed that his own strength allowed him to no longer be bound by ideals, so seeing someone get stronger through those ideals sickened him. In truth, the main thing that Sukuna had actually wanted was to turn Yuji into another him, to see if Yuji could go down that same path, but it seemed he failed. He somehow managed to hold on to his ideals. As Sukuna then said, "I've decided to take your ideals and mince them to bits." As a star came down from the sky, as it was then a rule had now been added to the culling games. Rule 15, authority to begin the great merger between Tengen and humanity has been transferred to Fushiguro Megami. And that made a worry enter into Yuji's stomach, as he now had to question where exactly was Yuta Akotsu, and where was Aoi Todo. As Sukuna then declared, "I'll start by killing you all. After that, the remaining players in the culling games. Then, I'll complete the merger, and have some fun with the new Tengen." As Kusakabe, Kotsuke, and Kyoto all arrived on the field, each of them prepared in order to fight against Sukuna. Ino was lagging a little bit behind, with Panda being behind even them. Though Panda was now notably in a different form, one that looked like a Triceratops. And Yuji told them they were just going to need to hold off for a little bit longer for Yuta Akotsu to arrive. So long as they did, they would have a much better chance of defeating Ryoma and Sukuna. Which, speaking of, what was delaying the Cursed Prodigy so heavily? We now head over to the Lake Gosho colony where Kenjaku was currently present. He just had the battle and humorous experience of his life against Takaba. But thanks to some quick planning and maneuvers from a three-way team of Nanako, Todo, and Yuta, they were able to cut off Kenjaku's head. Through Kenjaku's battle against Yuki, they were able to figure out that in order for Kenjaku to cast anti-gravity, it was necessary for him to make a hand sign. Something that Nanako prevented him from doing, and even if she wasn't, there was still Todo and Yuta on the field as well, who was able to help with preventing that ability. But even though Kenjaku's head had now been cut off, he was surprisingly still alive and talking. But the real ace in the hole was Takaba. Takaba made it impossible for Kenjaku to sense the others. He wanted no one to interrupt this performance. And Nanako was taking out a knife. She wanted to be the one to finish off Kenjaku. Kenjaku had killed her sister and taken the body of her father, disgracing his legacy even more. As Kenjaku then said, "It's a shame to bow out before I finish, but my will be passed on. Though I will say this, Nanako, I wasn't the one who killed your sister. Well, technically it was my control, but I wasn't the one who landed the blow. Though I was hoping I could see my children before I died." As Todo then told him that he barely mattered to his children. Sure, you might have been the one to create them, but they had much more important things to fight against in Sukuna. You were merely an afterthought in their brain. But then suddenly all three of them were caught off guard, as Kenjaku's entire body began to shake, and now that Kenjaku's head was disconnected from his body, all of the cursed spirits that he had consumed began to erupt from his body and go on a rampage, distracting Todo, Nanako, and Yuta from Kenjaku and forcing them to have to deal with that rampage, with Yuta releasing Rika in preparation to help him. With the four of them there was no chance that they were going to be able to escape them, but this was still going to be a temporary distraction. However, this wasn't the only part of Kenjaku's plan that he had left, as he said, "I had one more binding vow left in store in case I died. Nanako, you're now going to get a chance proper to get revenge. Once the life leaves my head, Jogo will get all of my curse energy." As he quickly declared the next rule as well, all before they had a chance to react or do something about it, and Nanako quickly threw the blade right towards Kenjaku's head, while at the same time Yuta did the same, the two of them killing Kenjaku. But while Rika was dealing with the massive swarm of cursed spirits, one of them landed in front of Todo, Nanako, and Yuta, one with a large amount of curse energy coming off their body, and one that had a grudge with both Todo and Nanako, this one being Jogo. Sure, if it was just normal Jogo, Yuta would have been able to handle them with no problem, especially with Todo being on the field to help them. But this was now an amplified Jogo, as the three of them prepared to face off against Kenjaku's final curse. Yuta, Nanako, and Todo were all preparing to face off against this now amplified Jogo, Kenjaku's final distraction to give Sukuna a bit more of an advantage. Yuta contemplated for a moment on if he wanted to kill this cursed spirit using reverse curse technique. But there was some disadvantage with doing that. If he were to use reverse curse technique on Jogo, it would drain him of quite a bit of curse energy. He couldn't currently use Rika to restore his curse energy. After all, he needed the full manifestation of Rika in order for his backup plan of taking Gojo's body to work. But would the curse energy cost be worth it in comparison to just fighting Jogo normally? Would fighting and killing Jogo himself have a better result than using reverse curse technique to instantly kill it? Fortunately, Yuta did have an advantage when it came to knowledge against Jogo and his abilities. With Nanako, Todo, Choso, and Yuji all having fought against Jogo in the past, they were able to give Yuta some information, including telling him that Jogo wasn't that durable as a cursed spirit. It was mainly going to be its speed that would be an issue. Both Todo and Nanako on his side, two people who did well against speed-based fighters, he felt he had a pretty good advantage. Especially considering Rika would likely be able to join them pretty soon. As Yuta then said to himself, "I hope you can hold out for a little bit longer, Yuji." As Yuta lifted up his blade while Todo lifted up his hands, preparing to face off against his cursed spirit. Nanako also quickly moved in order to get a picture of Jogo right off the bat. But Jogo started this battle off by immediately starting to rush right at Nanako. Before she trained with the others, Nanako would not have been able to see Jogo's movements. However, thanks to all the training she had done in order to increase her curse energy reinforcements, she could at least react to Jogo now. But Yuta met the charge halfway, with Todo clapping at the same time. Todo's clap made Nanako swap place with a dying cursed spirit, using it in order to make Nanako be at an even further distance from Jogo. Jogo's fist clashed against Yuta's blade for a couple of seconds, until two of them were pushed away from each other. As Todo then clapped his hands again, an advantage they had with how much cursed spirits Ageto spawned was there was a lot of things for Todo to be able to swap with, which made Todo one of the worst possible counters to go up against cursed spirit manipulation, as Todo focused curse energy towards his own foot and attempted to land a hard blow right onto Jogo's back. But Jogo was able to sense Todo appearing, as he quickly turned himself around midair and attempted to fire a large burst of lava right towards Todo's direction. The sound of another clap echoed throughout the air, as Todo swapped places again with one of the stronger cursed spirits, before Todo clapped once more, appearing nearby where Yuta and Nanako were. Jogo then landed, skidding backwards on his feet a little bit as he stared towards his opponents. Yuta and Todo were both known for being relentless, not giving their opponent a moment to breathe, as they both rushed right towards Jogo not having a speed advantage on either of them. However, Jogo did have some other things he could do, as he launched out several ember insects right towards the both of them, each of them with a blazing amount of curse energy coming off of it as well in an attempt to make sure they could hit. But as they were approaching, Yuta quickly jumped high into the air, while at the same time Todo jumped right into the ember insects, before clapping his hands again, swapping places with Jogo and forcing Jogo to get hit by his own technique. While the damage done on Jogo from his own attack was minor, especially considering it was his own cursed energy, it still did some damage nonetheless, especially with his lacking durability already. But once the smoke and ashes began to go away, Yuta was rushing right down towards Jogo, his own blade blazing in cursed energy. As Jogo then lifted up his hands, he was about to try and launch out a large burst of lava towards Yuta, but when he did launch it out, it missed him completely. Even though Yuta didn't dodge, in fact his arm was completely off its own trajectory, before he then remembered. Nanako had moved his arm slightly off course in order to make sure the lava wouldn't hit and Yuta would have a clear shot at stabbing at him. During this month, Nanako had mainly been training in order to use her curse technique on the likes of Kenjaku and Sukuna. Even with Jogo being in this amp state, she was certainly prepared to be able to use it on him. As Jogo attempted to move backwards in order to try and stab the blade, which led to Joe getting a deep slash on his chest. However, this was much better than him getting stabbed completely through. But then Todo rushed right towards Yuta, before clapping his hands and swapping Yuta and Jogo's places as Todo landed a kick right on Jogo's face, and Yuta landed a punch right on Jogo's stomach, sending Jogo rocketing through several of the cursed spirits. Nanako smirked a slight bit. She was proud of her own improvements. After all, she remembered how hard it was for her to do that on Jogo originally, and now she could really see just how much she'd improved. But their fight wasn't done yet, as the entire ground began to heat up. Before out from it, large swaths of lava began to shoot up, several geysers of lava opening, as Todo and Yuta quickly moved right towards Nanako as well, just in case to make sure they were nearby her and they were as a group right now. As another large geyser of lava began to rise underneath them, but at the last moment all three of them were suddenly picked up by Rika, before all three of them were placed down gently. All of the cursed spirits that Kenjaku had summoned onto the field had now been executed by Rika Orimoto, as the Queen of Curse was staring down the final curse of Kenjaku. Jogo then clapped both of his hands together, causing several ember insects to form around him. The battle damage he had taken from both Todo and Yuta was starting to heal itself, however it did do some notable damage to him. Even with the ample durability from Kenjaku, Jogo still was lacking a little bit in durability. As Jogo then launched out each of the ember insects right towards the group of them, while at the same time he jumped into the air and started to rapid-fire bursts of magma towards them. In particular, he was aiming for Nanako and Todo. He wanted those two to be dead in particular since those two were the main supports, leading to Rika flying high up into the air in order to begin a rush right on Jogo. At the same time, Yuta focused a large amount of curse energy right towards his fist and punched the ground, causing a large amount of the ground to crack and shatter. Using that in order to make rubble clash with several of the ember insects and have them activate beforehand, before grabbing Nanako and moving them out the way. Todo though was able to evade several of the lava attacks pretty easily on his own, and even the ones that did get close to him he ended up clapping and swapping places with. Even swapping places with some of the remnants of the geysers that were made earlier. And Jogo then looked up as he was about to attempt to fire out another lava attack right towards Rika, but his arms were suddenly forced down, forcing him instead to fire at the floor. Nanako had forcefully changed his position again, leading to Rika slamming their massive fists right into Jogo's face and slamming them in the ground. Or at least they were about to make contact with the ground until suddenly they felt something else against their back. Another kick from Aoi Todo landing right on them. As Todo then smirked before he then said, "You know, a cursed spirit like you should have learned this by now. I'm your worst possible opponent. Because all you're really doing with all your attacks is giving me more and more things to swap with." As Todo began to rapidly clap his hands, Yuta, Todo, Rika, they were also in place with lava attacks that were scattered all across the area. As suddenly Jogo felt a large fist land right on his back again, this one being from Rika. But then he saw Yuta appear right in front of him and land a punch right on his face, before Todo appeared as well, landing a kick right on Jogo's side. Todo was now left in a combo between the three of them. While it wasn't as effective when Todo used it with Yuji, they still did have some time to practice. To make it even more annoying, every time Jogo attempted to launch out a counter-attack, his hands were slightly moved out the way, making it so his attacks were missing constantly. But even for Nanako, moving Jogo repeatedly like that was starting to have a toll on her stamina, and Yuta could sense that as well. So it was time for their final rush, their final attack to try and kill Jogo, as he, Aoi Todo, and Rika all rushed right towards Jogo while he was trying to heal. As Jogo then lifted up both of his hands, aiming them right towards Yuta and Todo, while at the same time he lowered his head, preparing to fire off a massive burst of magma towards Rika. Nanako was not going to be able to deflect all three of those attacks, however she also knew that Rika was incredibly durable. So she moved Jogo's arms out of the way, causing him to miss those lava bursts, while Rika had to take the full-on head burst from Jogo. But for the Queen of Curses, this was nothing, as Yuta stabbed his katana right into Jogo's side, while at the same time Todo punched Jogo in the side as well, before they both jumped back, as out from the lava Rika clasped both of her hands together, and slammed them down hard on Jogo, putting the cursed spirit down once and for all. Nanako sat down, panting a little bit. She was completely exhausted, but a smile rose onto her. She did it. She finally avenged her sister. The memories of Suguru, her father, and the memories of Mimiko, her sibling, could finally lay at rest. But she knew they weren't done yet. They all still had work to do. There was still one final foe left. We now return to several abandoned rubble buildings in Shinjuku. A wave of blue fire was clashing against a wall of ice. Both of them were big enough to encompass entire buildings. Urame, the only sorcerer that was able to gain the favor of Sukuna, was currently battling against an experiment from the most evil man alive, that being Jin, a human cursed spirit hybrid who was rebelling against his parents' desires. As out from that large wave of fire, someone came rocketing through, breaking right through the ice and punching Urame hard in the face. This person was Akari, one of the students entrusted with the dream of Satoru Gojo, knows and picked for his potential by the strongest of the modern era. Thanks to his Cursing and Domain expansion, Akari was able to wield an infinite amount of curse energy. As a result of that, he had reverse Cursing activating constantly, being able to heal at a faster rate than even the strongest of the modern era or the strongest of history. But Akari didn't let Urame go that fast, as he quickly picked up Urame and threw them right towards Jin's direction. And before Urame could get a chance to react, they were suddenly met with a massive torrent of flame coming right towards them, as they began to use reverse cursing in order to heal themselves off, but even with that was still stamina draining on them. If it was just Akari, they'd be able to stall with no problem, but Jin had the firepower to wear Urame down and eventually kill them, resulting in Urame being forced to create a pillar of ice underneath themselves in order to launch themselves out of the fire. As Urame was trying to get a slight break for themselves to think, but they didn't get one, as Akari came rocketing right for them and uppercutted them in the jaw. Akari was absolutely having the time of their life right now. After all, during this month of practice, he had gotten quite a lot of time to practice with Jin. And sure, the burns were stinging a bit, but he was having a lot more fun. After all, he always wanted to go through a mountain of fire to punch somebody. It kinda reminded him of a movie he watched a while back. But he had no time to think on that, as he saw several bursts of fire be launched right towards Urame after. Urame was just narrowly able to activate Icefall in time in order to counter, but even then, the fire was slightly overpowering it. But it made a delay enough for Urame to jump out of the way, or at least try to, until Akari was right by their side and punched them in the stomach, before throwing them right back into the ground. As a look of rage began to fill Urame, before they put their hand onto the ground and sent a massive ice spike right towards Akari's direction. Urame was completely done with having to do this 2v1 right now. But then they heard a voice saying, "You should have launched that at me, not Akari." And when Urame tried to look in the direction where the voice came from, they were met by a large stream of fire right to the face. But this time Urame was a bit more prepared by coating themselves completely in ice, as Urame then jumped out from the stream of fire, making a bit more of a distance from themselves from their opponents. But Jin then launched fire out from his feet, using it to launch himself right towards Urame's direction, as he focused a large amount of fire right towards his hands, but at the same time Akari landed right next to Urame. As he activated his domain expansion, Jackpot had run out, but now it was time for a second run at Jackpot, leading to Jin and Urame being filled with the information from the domain. And while it did stagger Urame, it didn't stagger Jin anywhere near as much, as Jin punched Urame right in the face, releasing the wave of fire right towards them on close quarters, melting right through Urame's sheet of ice as well as doing some burn damage on their body, as Urame activated a reverse curse sneak in order to heal this off, all the while Akari's domain had just finished working, landing another jackpot for him. Urame was really not sure how much more of this they could take, however they weren't going to go down that easy, as the domain began to shatter around them while they stared at the two opponents. Urame had to admit to themselves they underestimated their two opponents. If they wanted any chance to be able to assist Lord Sukuna, they were going to need to go all out from here, as they could see several of the ice spears they had created earlier begin to fly back towards Urame and start to combine, before they started to compact, spinning around rather fast, creating a small yet compact planetoid out of ice next to Urame, about twice their height. Consider this a little bit of respect. After all, I heard what your group was capable of, and while I had originally made this in mind of Yuji Itadori, using this on you should be more than applicable. Jin had to admit he was getting slightly annoyed. He wanted to go already to support his brother, and yet this person was still staying alive so stubbornly. But Jin knew better than to lose his cool. After all, that was exactly what Urame wanted. As Jin then said, "It won't matter how many of those ice orbs you create, I'm going to burn them all down and burn you till there's nothing left." And Akari lifted up both of his arms as well. He was curious to see what that orb would have done, but he was also rather cautious about it as well. There was also something interesting happening on the ground. Even with the ice orb being close to the ground, it was causing parts of it to freeze, as it began to twirl rapidly around Urame. With each of its movements, the ground underneath it was freezing rapidly. The level of cold that this ice orb was at was on another level, immediately telling both Jin and Akari they were going to have to be cautious of this ice orb. Still, the both of them felt rather ready for it. In particular Akari, after all, he was completely immortal. Jin, though, had a different plan. He had no intention whatsoever to interact with the ice orb. Instead, he was planning to kill Urame. That way, if Urame was dead, that wouldn't be a problem. An extension technique doesn't matter if the original user of it was dead. Of course, unless it was a post-death technique, but at the same time, Jin doubted that was the purpose of this technique, or at least he was hoping it wasn't, as Jin then clapped both his hands together, beginning to rapid-fire bursts of blue flame right towards Urame. But the orb of ice quickly moved in front of each of those bursts, countering them and chilling them out, dispersing each of the flames upon making contact. A smirk began to rise on Urame, as they were happy to see that this worked, though that smirk was quickly interrupted as they suddenly felt a punch land right on their face, causing Urame's eyes to slightly twitch as they looked towards Akari, before they sent the ice ball right towards Akari's direction, slamming into Akari and starting to push him through several buildings. Due to making contact with Akari, it was immediately starting to freeze over his entire body. Before Urame looked back over to Jin, as he told him that from here on out it was going to be a one-on-one. They were done with these games. Jin then punched both of his fists together as a fire erupted off of his body. Bring it on! He had faith in Akari to be able to handle this for a little bit longer. Best case scenario, he'd managed to kill Urame before Akari could even get back. As Urame then lifted up their hand, causing tens of ice shards to form high in the air. Each of these ice shards were around the same size as a human body. This was the Icefall attack, but it had so much more effort put into it this time. As the fire erupting off of Jin began to get hotter and hotter, bigger and bigger before it started to compact, surrounding his entire body at once. As Jin then said, "I developed this technique after sparring so many times with Aoi Todo." You'd be surprised just how difficult it actually is to properly counter that curse technique. As Urame then launched a massive amount of ice spears right down towards Jin's direction, but Jin then clapped both of his hands together, resulting in a huge burst of blue flame being launched all across the area, forcing Urame to have to hop back in order to avoid this attack. As they saw several of the ice shards they made be completely melted through, turn to water, and then the water be evaporated, as well as large apartment buildings around them turn to dust. And while the fire was loud, Urame was able to hear something. As Urame thought to themselves, "They're chanting?" The fire beginning to focus back to being around their hands. Not just were they compacting all the power they had just released towards their fists, they were also amplifying it with chants. Nova, Phoenix, Eclipse. As they rocketed right towards Urame, using their own fire in order to propel them at max speed. Their fist was glowing a bright blue. Urame on near instinct called that massive ice ball they had launched out earlier back towards themselves, but that gave somebody else the perfect chance to begin their own assault. Hikari Kinji had now re-entered into the fight, forcing the ice off of their body and healing themselves after, as he focused curse energy towards his own fist. But more than that, Urame was able to send something off in the air. As before the ice ball could intercept against Jin, Hikari punched it, landing a black flash on it and shattering the ice ball completely, causing a wide smile to rise on Hikari, as Jin spun around him and launched right towards Urame. And they punched Urame in the gut hard, full force, releasing that massive torrent of flames right into them, making a massive ball of fire, and turning Urame completely into ashes. Hikari and Jin had won this battle, but it cost them quite a bit of stamina. Still, they had more than enough stamina to continue going, and Hikari was pretty fine thanks to his domain expansion and effectively refueled him. I looked over to where everybody was battling Sukuna, and seeing that Yuta and Kotsu hadn't arrived slightly worried them, but more importantly, seeing the defeat of Higuruma, they needed to rush over there and now. Yuji and Sukuna were now facing off against each other. Kenjaku had added a rule to give full authority of the merger over to Sukuna. Kosuke, Kyoto, Kusakabe, Ino, and Panda were each on the field. Haruta had just finished setting up some traps as well. As Yuji thought to himself, "Where the hell are you, Yuta?" Yuta was a pretty big part of their plan, and he could tell they were still being delayed, or else they would have been here by now, so what was delaying them? It didn't matter, they were going to have to figure something out, they were going to have to adapt. Maki had also set herself up by this point as well, waiting for a perfect opportunity and opening. But without Yuta present, by extension without her soul split katana, she saw no reason to join into the battle. Yuji knew they were just going to have to hold them off for a lot longer. But he felt he had enough stamina to do it, as the focus began to enter into his eyes. And a thought leaked into his head, what if they managed to beat Sukuna before Yuta shows up? He shouldn't just think about stalling Sukuna for Yuta to show up. No, he should be thinking about this as a potential chance to beat Sukuna before Yuta shows up. And with that slight alteration to his mindset, he was ready to go. And that was when Sukuna spoke. "Among you all, there are several here that hold my interest. Not to mention the two that are fighting against Urame that will likely be done with them soon. But while there are multiple of you that do, some of you just simply don't belong. And if you can't survive this next attack, you weren't worthy to be here to begin with." As in a quick succession of hand signs and chants, Sukuna released a massive slash in all directions. Once opponent was able to turn entire buildings into nothing but pebbles. Yuji focused blood around himself and made a makeshift shield, shielding himself from that slash. Kyoto returned to the shadows, dodging the attack. Kotsuke made a massive water geyser underneath herself, using that in order to dodge and move out of the way of the range of the attack, though making this geyser did drain her of some curse energy. Kusakabe just narrowly was able to activate Simple Domain, using that to deflect some of the slashes away from himself, but even then, some of them did still land on him nonetheless. Still, the cuts that landed were made minor thanks to Simple Domain. Ino and Panda weren't so lucky. Ino did try to activate his Simple Domain in order to lessen the blow, and while he did succeed in that, he was nowhere near as proficient as Kusakabe, leading to his Simple Domain shattering and him taking quite a few heavy cuts. Still, he was standing, but just barely. Panda though was not so lucky. While he had learned Simple Domain similar to the others, he was the least proficient of them by far. So his Simple Domain took even less time to be cut down, and Panda followed quickly after that, being cut down and obliterated. And as the dust faded from his attack, Sukuna was no longer standing where he was. Instead, he was right above Ino. As he said, "I'm surprised you didn't die from that, though I know that's not because of your strength. That is because of how much the brat has annoyingly weakened me to this point. But even with that in mind, you still took such heavy cuts. So you're the weakest of this entire group, aren't you? Allow me to send you to your friend." But a moment before Sukuna could launch out a slash towards Ino, suddenly a massive amount of water bullets began to rain towards Sukuna's direction, forcing him away from Ino. Sukuna then surrounded his hands in slashes before starting to rapidly spin around, using that to cut through each of the water bullets that were coming towards him. However, this was only made to be a distraction, as when Sukuna looked back to where Ino was, he could see Ino was now gone. And while it was slightly annoying for Sukuna that pest was still somewhere alive, he could deal with that later, as he slowly turned to look back to where Yuji was, the only one who was currently close to him on the field. As he then said, "Shall we continue where we left off, brat?" And without even giving him a moment to respond, he lifted up his hands, launching a massive amount of slashes right towards Yuji's direction. Slashes so big in size they'd be able to decimate cars of relative ease. But Yuji, through the physical amp that was offered by flowing red scale stack, moved out of the way, being able to dodge each of the slashes before they could reach him. However, mid-movement, Sukuna closed the distance, his hand completely surrounded by slashes to make it into a blade before he slashed down at Yuji. Yuji opened up his hand and hardened the blood, creating a blood blade of his own and countering Sukuna's own slash. But even with that counter, he was quickly overpowered by Sukuna's reinforced might, as Yuji was sent backwards. But Sukuna didn't let him get away that easy, as he opened up one of his hands and launched out another slash towards him. Yuji focused his blood wings down in order to protect himself from the slash. As Sukuna then said, "In order to weaken my output, you need to land physical blows for your punches on me. Your blood manipulation doesn't weaken my curse energy output. Even me blocking your blows still ends up weakening me. So long as I don't make true physical contact with you, brat, I won't get any weaker." Sukuna had deciphered Yuji's ability like that, not to mention how to counter it. Still, this just meant there were going to be more parameters. It wasn't impossible. Yuji couldn't allow himself to think for a second that it was going to be impossible. But now that Yuji was alone on the field, he could do something else, as a massive amount of blood steam began to exit from his body. As Sukuna said earlier, Yuji's weakness with this technique was that it only cloaked him. But now that Yuji was forced to be alone on this battlefield, he could take full advantage of that. As Sukuna felt small burns begin to form on his body, burns from just being inside of the blood mist alone. Still, these burns were minor at best. At least minor at best for someone like Sukuna, as he then saw a massive cascade of blood arrows being launched right towards his direction. As Sukuna immediately moved to the side, starting to move out of the way of the blood arrows, before suddenly from the back of his eye he saw another blood arrow come towards him. This one was actually much larger than the standard blood arrows, being closer to that of a spear in terms of size. But in spite of that, it was actually moving much faster in comparison to the other blood arrows. Sukuna just narrowly moved his head out of the way before catching the spear. And he also noticed the massive barrage of blood arrows from before had stopped, until from behind him, 2 slicing exorcism discs were launched towards his back. Both of them having a high amount of steam coming off of them. Just getting near them was going to burn Sukuna. So Sukuna began to hop off air repeatedly, doing that in order to avoid the blow. Hopping so high off air, he managed to escape the massive wave of blood steam. But when he did, he saw a total of 12 supernovas around him. 9 of them belonged to Yuji Itadori, and 3 of them belonged to Choso, as Sukuna realized in that moment that Choso was still alive. Before all of them exploded at once, launching Sukuna even deeper into the city. And once Sukuna got up, he realized something else. He could no longer sense Urame's curse energy. Urame had now been killed. but he didn't have much time to focus on it as suddenly a hard punch landed right on his back. This one was from Yuji, as it pushed Sukuna forward by a couple of feet before he turned around and launched a couple of slashes right out towards his direction. But Yuji was now getting better at predicting Sukuna's slashes, as he began to move around each of the slashes coming towards him while he was chasing for Sukuna. And Sukuna then surrounded one of his hands in slashes, making a blade out of his hand, before he slashed down right at Yuji, Yuji blocking it with a blood edge. Before the two of them began to rapidly exchange slashes against each other. Each time they did, they caused a small shockwave, but Yuji knew this was not a good thing. This was giving Sukuna more and more time to recover. Yuji needed to keep pushing forward. He needed to keep the pressure up constantly with his fists. But so long as Sukuna could counter, he couldn't do that. Before a water tentacle grabbed onto two of Sukuna's arms, while at the same time two shadow hands attempted to push Sukuna forward. But Sukuna was now getting accustomed to their attacks, as he released another wave of slashes, slashing apart the water going for his arms as well as pushing the shadow hands away from himself. But this was the advantage Yuji needed, as he pressed forward and landed another punch on Sukuna's side. Sukuna then focused curse energy to two of his fists, about to try and land another punch onto Yuji before he suddenly felt shadows wrap around his arms. As Kyoto focused, delaying him for a couple more seconds to allow Yuji to land another punch right onto Sukuna's gut. As Kyoto felt the shadows wrapping around Sukuna's body get completely destroyed by Sukuna's slashes, before Sukuna landed both of his fists, punching Yuji both in the face and stomach with those fists. And as Yuji was launched backward, he saw a compressed water arrow be launched right towards Sukuna's face, with a sonic boom echoing right behind it. But Sukuna saw it coming as he lifted up his hands, while same time his other two hands finished making a hand sign, before he launched out an incredibly powerful slash. Not just destroying a water arrow, but destroying an entire line of buildings. Kosuke at the last moment sensed the spark of curse energy, using that to just narrowly move out on time. And as Sukuna looked back to Yuji, he saw a swarm of blood arrows starting to fly right towards his direction. And Sukuna started to repeatedly jump, moving out of the way of them and starting to move towards the direction of one of the buildings. In specific, the direction where he launched that massive slash towards. But as Sukuna was dodging the blood arrows, he saw a piercing blade being launched right for his head. Choso had fired one from a nearby building, not to mention this one was much more charged up, but even that was slow in comparison to Sukuna's speed as he weaved out of the way. He had to admit though, he was impressed that Choso was still standing. But as he was weaving out of the way, he suddenly felt a fist crash right into his face. That fist was from Yuji Itadori, weakening the connection even further and launching him right into one of the buildings. But when he arrived to that building, he felt something odd inside of it. Cursed energy signatures all across the place, and when he looked around, he saw something that confused him. What looked like several teeth, as well as some fingers. But he didn't have much time to focus on that as Yuji rocketed right into the building after him. But the second the two of them entered, the cursed energy signature coming from each of the body parts began to increase, before a rapid amount of explosions began to surface throughout the entire room. They were planning to collapse the entire building on both Sukuna and Yuji. This was all made to add additional pressure just so Yuji would have better shots at landing hits. At that same time, Yuji's blood arms finished making hand signs, using that in order to amplify flowing red scale burst to its physical limit. And both Sukuna and Yuji rapidly sped up, starting to exchange blows throughout the explosions, using the collapsing building as a platform as they continued to move up and up the building. Yuji just narrowly dodging slashes while at the same time clashing fists against Sukuna. Sukuna was the first to exit the building, with Yuji being the second, as both of them were getting higher and higher into the sky. As Yuji could see several blue lights start to form in the sky, while Sukuna sent several blue signatures, and both of them immediately realized who this was. Kamo Noritoshi was now here, offering long-range support for a massive amount of arrows that he could direct. As they each were flying down towards Sukuna, he started to air hop, moving out of the way of each and every single one of them while launching out slashes to destroy some of them. Before he saw another piercing blood launch right towards him. This one was from Kamo as well. And he was surprised. This one was similar to the ones that Yuji and Choso were doing, but he thought that only death paintings would be capable of something like that. But here Kamo was proving that he could as a normal human. How intriguing. Because he could feel the immense amount of heat coming from it, as well as see the wave of steam. He hopped off air immediately, moving out of the way of the attack, before he pointed a finger in the direction of the piercing blood, immediately launching several slashes right towards Kamo's direction. Kamo quickly summoned up both of his Shikigami in order to block the blow, and while he did lessen the damage, it still did some damage to Kamo, though he was able to heal it off using reverse curse technique. But both of his buddies was still a bit damaged. They were going to be able to heal though, as Kamo smirked a bit to himself and thought, "You shouldn't have been paying attention to me, Sukuna." because during that entire time, Yuji was now right behind Sukuna, focusing a large amount of curse energy right towards his fist. And Sukuna remembered what this feeling was. It was a familiar one, but he had never been on the receiving end of this feeling. It was the same one Mahito was going through when Yuji had battled against him. As Yuji landed a black flash right onto Sukuna's back, sending him crashing down through one of the buildings and making that entire building collapse. But more importantly, doing much more damage to weakening Sukuna's soul in connection with Megami. And a confidence began to fill everybody here. As a smirk rose onto Kamo, he was proud of how far his student had gotten. Choso, Kyoto, and Kosuke were all now feeling even more motivated in comparison to before. But more than that, there was an even more noticeable shift in the air. Rings formed in Yuji's eyes. Within sparks of black, Yuji Itadori has now awakened, as the blood wings he was using earlier went back into Yuji's back, forming a small platform behind himself before he launched himself right towards Sukuna, being even faster in comparison to before. Through the sparks of black, Yuji could feel it, his efficiency in each of his techniques growing. But he could also feel a faint connection. He was almost there. He just needed to land a few more blows and he'd be able to connect right with Megami. But this also granted Sukuna the answer to something. When Sukuna battled against Satoru Gojo, he used the Black Flash in order to restore his output in Reverse Curse technique. So what if Sukuna could do the same thing for his domain expansion? And fortunately, he had someone coming right towards him that he could test this on. Of course, he could sense the difference in Yuji as well, the fact he was even stronger now, but that just made him more excited. As he jumped after Yuji, meeting him right at the middle. As curse energy surrounded both Sukuna and Yuji's hands, the intention was clear from both of them. And they both landed a Black Flash, clashing sparks of black against each other. The moment they did, a massive shockwave rippled throughout the entire area, causing several buildings around them to collapse before the both of them landed on the ground. But then something caught both of their attention. They heard the sound of what sounded like music, as well as a massive curse energy approach them, as Sukuna's arms were held from behind just for a moment. Hikari Kinji had entered onto the field. But more importantly, this was the signal for all 5 of the siblings to do their next move. Kyoto was the first to act, chanting the words, Shadow, Lunar, Night, as Hikari was forcibly pushed away from Sukuna, before it looked like a dragon made out of shadows rose out and grabbed Sukuna, pushing them higher and higher into the air. Next was Kosuke, who was creating by far the largest water arrow she had ever created, as she chanted, Hydro, Ocean, Moon. Before it compressed heavily and launched right towards Sukuna. Sukuna launched out a massive slash in order to force the dragon off of him, before he lifted up his hands and blocked the water arrow. Even though he managed to block it, it did do some damage to his body. But as Sukuna was sent flying, he saw Jin right above him, as Jin had finished up his own chant, Nova, Phoenix, Eclipse, before he punched Sukuna hard in the face, releasing a massive wave of blue fire in the process and sending him rocketing right back into the ground. But as Sukuna got up, he saw several supernovas around him, with all of them rapidly exploding around Sukuna's body at once, doing even more damage onto him. Though he was able to counter some of the damage by releasing some slashes, but still, he was a little bit more stunned from all the attacks previously. And all of this was just for Yuji to rush in. Blood, vein, body. The chant in order to amplify flowing red scale burst, taught to him by Kamo. And he landed a hard punch right onto Sukuna's stomach, releasing another black flash right in that moment. But before Sukuna could make too far of a distance, one of the blood eels slams right back into Sukuna's back, forcing him right back into another black flash from Yuji. Yuji was thankful for everybody around him, all of the comrades he had made. All of them had allowed him to reach this point, as he could hear the voices of all of his brothers cheering on him at once. As he landed a 5th black flash right onto Sukuna's chest. But this time the result of the black flash was a bit different, as he had finally broken the connection enough for him to actually talk with Megami. And so far, the plan had been a success. If it wasn't for one factor that not a single soul could predict, then all of them would have succeeded right here and now. Within Fushiguro Megami's soul, any will to live had been extinguished, as Yuji saw a curled up Megami on the ground. And that distraction was exactly what Sukuna needed. Scale of the Dragon. Recoil, Twin Meteor, World Cutting Slash. He pointed his finger right towards Yuji's stomach. Fortunately, Yuji did have some people looking out for him. A shadow hand wrapped around the finger that Sukuna was using to point at Yuji, one from Kyoto in order to try and divert the blow away. At a similar time, Nanako had returned as well, activating her curse technique and moving Sukuna's hand out the way just slightly. but even doing a minor movement on Sukuna like that caused her to cough up some blood. But these two things alone would not have been enough to save him. But at the last moment, somebody else pushed Yuji out of the way. Choso just narrowly was able to push Yuji out of the way in order to dodge. However, he wasn't so lucky, as Choso was sliced completely in half. All while Sukuna released an AoE wave of slashes, hitting Yuji, Choso, Jin, and Akari in the process, knocking all of them away from himself. Fortunately for everybody else, they were out of Sukuna's range. As Yuji slowly looked back down to Choso, that attack was for him, and yet Choso had moved to save him. Choso had a clear smile on his face, happy to be able to protect his brother one last time. Despite all the power his brother had gained, he still was able to help him in the end. This was not something that Choso would be able to regenerate from. The world almost went silent around Yuji for a second. Tears wanted to come down, but he couldn't let them. Not yet. He couldn't grieve yet. As a pant came out from Sukuna, he was pushed. If it wasn't for how much he had broken Megami, that would have been the end. But seeing Yuji was currently focused on Choso, he lifted up his hand, as he was about to release a wave of slashes right towards their direction. But two people came in and attacked. One was Hikari Kinji, about to land a punch right on Sukuna's face, but the other was Yuta Akotsu, as he clashed his blade against Sukuna's hand, completely surrounded in slashes. At the same time, Todo landed nearby Yuji and Choso, as he told Yuji, "Don't give up hope yet, brother. You still have one way you can save Choso." And that was what Yuji needed to hear, as he moved a hand down onto Choso's chest. Any signs of him using blood manipulation faded for a moment. Yuji did apologize to the vessel for this. The vessel was going to die, and there was nothing Yuji could do to help that. But Choso was going to live, as scissor lines appeared on a part of Choso's body. The scissor lines of Cleave, as he separated Choso from his vessel, before finally consuming him, adding Choso to his body. As Todo then said, "I apologize for being late, brother. Kenjaku had one final plan that ended up stalling us for a bit longer than we intended." And Yuji slowly got up as he looked down to the now dead body, the one that used to belong to Choso, before he heard the voice of Choso inside of his head, causing a small smile to form on him for a second. As Yuji then said, "Don't worry, it's not over yet." As especially with Yuta now on the field as well as Akari, and how close they were already able to get Sukuna without them, they felt they had a good chance. Yuta and Akari were currently putting quite a bit of pressure on Sukuna, but Akari could feel his time in Jackpot was running out. Yuta at the same time knew that he was getting nowhere right now, so now it was time to move on to their original plan. As Kyoto and Kotsuke hopped down onto the field as well, and Akari quickly took a jump backwards, jumping away as Yuta activated his domain expansion, bringing himself, the 4 experiments of Kenjaku and Aoi Todo into his domain expansion, alongside Sukuna. And Yuji reactivated Flowing Red Scale Stack, before going right to the in-between state of Flowing Red Scale Stack and Flowing Red Scale Burst. But now with Choso absorbed into him, he was starting to see things a little bit different. He could sense the blood of everybody around him. His blood manipulation had been enhanced to such a point that his sensory ability had increased, as his focus went to Sukuna. And he could sense the slight shifts in his body, as he rushed right towards Sukuna, being the first to attempt to attack. He was trying to prevent whatever Sukuna was about to do, as Sukuna activated Hauler Wicker Basket in order to avoid the sure hit of the domain. And while he did activate it on time, he wasn't on time to block a punch from Yuji, as Yuji landed a hard black flash right onto his face. At the same time, Kotsuke scattered several water pellets all around them, while sending a nod over to Aoi Todo. At the same time, Yuta picked up one of the katanas from the domain, and all 7 fighters immediately got to work, starting with Jin releasing a massive wave of fire right towards Sukuna's direction, as Sukuna hopped high into the air in order to avoid it, followed by Yuta landing a slash right on his body, the slash release technique, Thin Ice Breaker. As Sukuna was being launched to the ground, but before he could hit it, his leg suddenly had a shadow wrap around it, before he was thrown right into the mass amount of water pellets that were being held up by Kotsuke. And Sukuna landed on his feet, before he heard the sound of a clap, immediately seeing Yuji right in front of him as he landed another punch right onto his stomach. This one was yet again another black flash, as Yuji could sense Sukuna about to open his hand to try and launch out a cleave. Before he could even get the attempt, Yuji was able to move out of the way, and Sukuna's eyes widened. It was similar to when he fought against Maki, but no, it felt less efficient. And Sukuna then realized what Yuji was doing. He was sensing his blood flow and using that in order to track his movements. That must have been why he ate Choso earlier. Yuji might have gotten a minor speed buff, but more importantly, he could now sense the movements of other people. as he moved out of the way of that slash, before a clap could be heard while Yuji clapped his own hands, with Yuji firing a piercing blood right at Sukuna's face, while at the same time Kotsuke fired a water arrow right towards Sukuna's back. And finally, he felt the slash from Yuta land on his back as well, and while he tried to move out of the way, he couldn't. He failed to match the movements of Yuta Okotsu, as he had used projection sorcery through that blade, leading to Sukuna being knocked back even further and some blood being drawn. And as Sukuna was being launched, he heard 2 more claps, as 2 of the blades were swapped with Jin and Yuji, while 4 shadow hands rose out, wrapping around both of Sukuna's hands in order to prevent him from firing out dismantles, or at least to attempt to limit them, as Jin released a massive wave of fire right onto Sukuna's front, while at the same time Yuji landed a punch right onto his back, being his 10th Black Flash before he jumped high into the air in order to avoid the wave of fire hitting him, as Sukuna released a wave of dismantles away from himself, using that in order to push both the shadows and the fire off of his hands, but he could feel himself starting to get weaker and weaker. That took quite a bit more effort than he liked, before he felt a massive hand crush down on him, that being the hand of the cursed spirit Rika. He had to use both of his hands in order to block, while using the other 2 hands in order to continue holding up the hollow wicker basket. All of his foes were now incredibly strong, in particular Yuji, Yuta, and Rika. Yuta Okotsu would have been strong enough to put up a good fight against Kenjaku. It would have been 50-50 on who could have won between them. But Yuji Itadori had now reached the same level that Sukuna was at in Shibuya. Sukuna needed some space. He was in a very bad spot right now, and he was going to need to prepare the world-cutting slash. He needed to kill some of them in order to give himself some room to breathe, as Yuji opened up one of his hands, creating a blood edge, before looking towards Yuta as the both of them nodded towards each other. And Todo clapped twice, Yuta and then Yuji appearing, before slicing off one of Sukuna's hands each. Thanks to all the blows and black flashes that Yuji had landed by this point, using reverse curse sneak for Sukuna was impossible. To make it even worse, Yuta then said the word stop. Curse speech was the next technique, as Yuji reached into his stomach mouth and grabbed it by the tongue, while at the same time Kyoto made a shadow hand rise up in order to assist, as both of them pulled his tongue right out from the stomach mouth. As right after, a water arrow landed right on Sukuna's chest, launching him even further. But as he was being launched, Yuji rushed right after him. Memories of both Gojo and Choso entered into his head, one person he had lost to the world-cutting slash, and Choso who had almost died from the world-cutting slash. He wasn't going to let Sukuna have another moment. He wasn't going to let him think. He was going to finish this right here and now, as he began to release a rapid flurry of blows right onto Sukuna's body, blows that he was forced to do nothing but block, but each time he did, he just felt his soul get weaker and weaker, as several water droplets rose up around Sukuna and Todo started to rapidly clap, leading it to look like Yuji was making after images right now as he swapped between each position, landing flurries of blows all across his entire body. While at the same time Yuta saw his chance as he made a hole in his domain for somebody else to enter. Todo also clapped, teleporting Rika right next to Yuji, as Yuji and Rika then released a massive punch right onto Sukuna, sending Sukuna flying, or almost, but he felt blood wrap around his hands as he was pulled right back in. But at the last moment, somebody else cut off those 2 remaining hands, someone who Sukuna didn't even sense enter into this barrier. That person was Maki Zenin, wielding the Soul Split Katana, and with those 2 hands cut off, the sure hit of the domain could hit Sukuna. And at that same time as well, back at the base, a hammer struck down against one of Sukuna's fingers. That was the hammer from Nobara Kugisaki, doing even further damage to the soul connection while Jacob's ladder struck down onto Sukuna. This was about to be the end. This was about to be it for him. But Yuji just had one last blow to land, as he rushed towards Sukuna and closed the distance, before landing a full power and full curse energy black flash onto Sukuna. Not just with his own strength, but with the strength of all of his brothers together. And Yuji reconnected with Megami's soul, as he heard Megami's desires. One where he could have a normal life with his sister, or at least as normal as possible, where he wanted to get the strength to preserve that normality, but Sukuna had taken that away. And Yuji sharing his own pain, about how he wanted his grandfather to take treatment for his cancer, and how he was now able to empathize with his grandfather, and how while he can't tell Megami to keep on living, he'd also miss Megami. And that was the final push Megami needed, as Sukuna was removed from his body. Yuta's domain had completely broken. The battle had now been won. The strongest sorcerer in history, the man who was so vile and evil he might as well be a curse, had now been killed. But after everything, Yuji finally passed out. He had used so much curse energy and been fighting for so long. At the last moment, Aoi Todo caught him. Todo did wonder how things would have gone if he didn't arrive, but he was still pretty confident his brother would have found a way. After all, he could sense something. His brother was on the verge of awakening one more thing. They just needed one final push. And Kyoto picked up Megami as they all began to head back. Yuji would then reawaken about 5 hours later, back at Tokyo Jujutsu High. Currently inside of the room was Todo, Kyoto, Jin, and Kotake. Jin was sitting down here in order to keep the room relatively warm. Kotake was teaching Todo a better method on how to make tea, while Kyoto was keeping an eye on Yuji as he noticed that he was awake. And Kyoto then called their attention as he said, "Seems he's back." And the other three looked over to Yuji as they moved over, mainly just to check how he was doing. Yuji told them that he was doing fine, as he asked them, "Did we win?" All four of them nodded at once. Ryomen, Sukuna, and Kenjaku were both now dead. It felt like a massive weight lifted off of his shoulders. Yuji then heard the voice of Choso say, "Congratulations, little brother. You earned your rest." They had done it. They had ultimately won the battle. Yuji's next question, of course, was how was Megami doing, and they told him that Megami was still currently sleeping. Which made sense. Due to Yuji being a vessel of 9 separate death paintings, he had a much faster healing speed than others. And now came another question for them. What were they all going to do next? They were each ready to put their lives on the line in order to sacrifice themselves against Sukuna, but they had all managed to survive. And now they were each about to enter into a brand new world. The higher-ups and Gojo Satoru were both dead. The Kamo clan was disbanded. The Zenin clan was completely massacred. However, that was when Kotsuke told them, "We can figure that out later. After all, we took out the King of Curses. Today is a day to celebrate. We all deserve a break for at least one day." Later on, they were all called to reunite with the others. Yuji at first had thought that Higuruma might have been killed, but he was happy to see that Higuruma was right there, still standing. He was also thankful that Kamo had helped him in the end. He was actually expecting Kamo to have not joined in this fight, to decide to go to his family. But Kamo told him what type of mentor would he be if he didn't help him out. Besides, they clearly had it in the bag. Overall, despite the sacrifice of several of their allies, they were ultimately able to win. Though they were able to notice that a couple people were actually missing. During the time that everybody was recovering, Reggie and Hazunoki managed to slip away. Knowing that they were probably going to be targeted in order for their souls to be separated, they did not want to be here for that. They were enjoying their lives far too much for that. They did feel kinda bad for their body, but is what it is. Still, that was going to be a problem for them to have to deal with tomorrow. After all, they deserve at least one night of rest after everything they had to deal with today. And after this rest, everyone began to go their own separate ways. Nanako stopped by the graves of both Suguru Geto as well as Mimiko. However, both of the bodies had been turned to ashes by this point, as she sent a prayer for them before leaving, deciding that she was going to stay with the remnants of Geto's family. After all, that was her family as well. Though she did give her contact information to Yuji and Todo, just in case they needed her for something, though she doubted they would. Those two were true freaks of nature, after all, in terms of potential and power. Aoi Todo decided that he was going to continue Yuki's legacy. However, he was going to come by pretty often in order to visit his siblings. Kyoto, Kotsuke, and Jin each decided they were going to join the staff at Tokyo High. While they were definitely too old to become proper students there, they were going to be there in order to help. Besides, with each of them being as strong as they were, they'd definitely be good sparring partners for people here. Ino was in a similar boat as well, although he didn't fully heal off the slashes that Sukuna had landed on him, mainly just to make sure he'd remind himself of the weakness he showed in that battle, letting the scars form on him as a reminder that he still needed to get stronger. Though they each still had some duties. After all, he did have to help out to return the people who were affected by the culling gibbs and had their body taken over. Those people's lives needed to return back to normal, and then after that they could continue on their lives being proper jujutsu sorcerers. As one day during training, Yuji was remembering back to the conversation he had with Gojo during their training session, and he could see now what Gojo wanted for him. As he remembered the words Gojo said, "I'm expecting great things from you. Got that, Yuji?" While at the same time he heard the voices of all 9 of his siblings cheering him on in that moment, before he finally activated his domain expansion, using the combined skills of Akari Kinji, Kusakabe, and himself, as well as all his jutsu experience. He was finally able to pull it off. And his domain took on a very similar appearance, his childhood home. However, there was a river nearby, a river completely made out of blood. And seeing this peaceful landscape that he had created, he couldn't help but smile, sending one final thanks to everybody who had influenced his life so far for allowing him to get this far, and promising them he was only going to continue from here on out. And with that, we close the story of what if Yuji awakened blood manipulation early, or what if Yuji was born as a death painting.